In the huge skyscraper of a large company, the day was just beginning, but it was as gray and dreary as the sky with clouds. Despite the dullness in the company, there were employees who were even in the mood for work, and one of these girls, having come to the office, greeted the director as she passed by his office, noting that he had arrived quite early today. Director Song Jin-hyuk sat at his desk deep in thought as he looked at the information on his computer screen. Instead of working, Jin calculated that if he sold his apartments and added shares and deposits to them, it would be about 6 billion won, and considering that he was soon going to live on his own land, he left the plan in his thoughts for now. Jin was distracted from his dreams by an employee who came up to him and told him that the executive director had arrived, and he replied that he would go see her now. Before meeting with the executive director, Jin looked at the monitor again and thought that he would definitely need to buy a car soon, because if he lived outside the city, it would be difficult without one. The dream presented for a moment that house that he would never see again, no matter how much he didn't want it. But at the same time, the young man resigned himself to the fact that life in the village would be enough for him, because it would at least remind him a little of his family, which he missed very much. The strict and reserved director's face spread into a gentle smile as he remembered his family. The assistant announced Director Sun's arrival to Ms. Hong, and she asked him to come into the office. The girl felt awkward and, clearing her throat, tried to explain about yesterday's incident, but Jin, as if nothing had happened, interrupted her, saying that the business report that manager Min Young-rak had compiled was supposed to come to her by email. Hong was initially taken aback by such a reaction and tried to shift the focus more to work by explaining that she had a meeting with senior management today. The feeling of guilt washed over the girl again, and she tried to apologize, justifying that it was all because of her father, but Jin interrupted her again, saying that she didn't have to worry. Hong realized that it was really better to stop now so as not to say even more unnecessary things. The director was glad that she could change the topic, remembering that Sun was visiting his parents today, and asked him to take care of himself on the way, to which he bowed, thanked her, and said that in that case he would go. Hong wanted to say something else to Jin and jumped up from the table, reaching her hand forward, but he had already left. The senior employees were standing at the entrance to the company building waiting for the chairman to arrive, and one of the junior employees decided to ask Jin, as if he were a friend, how things were going with Ms. Hong and how far they had gone. The guy couldn't even understand the question, it was so outrageous, but the employee jokingly nudged him with his elbow, saying that there was nothing to be embarrassed about because he heard how the executive director got drunk again yesterday. The young man's chatter was interrupted by the appearance of the chairman, who immediately addressed Director Sun. The chairman got out of the car with a wide smile, happy to see the guy and loudly calling him their hidden trump card. Putting his hand on Jin's back, the chairman asked him to go inside, and behind him the employees had already begun to whisper about the man recognizing Sun as his son-in-law, which meant that the company might be passed on to him. The chairman, walking next to Jin, quietly asked if he was busy today after the meeting, to which he replied that he was not particularly busy, so the man asked to give him some time. Sun understood that there was nowhere to go, and without showing it agreed to what the top leader asked. After the meeting, the men were riding in a car, and it was pouring heavily outside, so the chairman asked manager Kim to take the long way. Mr. Hong himself spoke to Jin, asking him that he was Soo-young's mentor when he worked at the local branch of Seek Heavy Industries. The monologue continued with Mr. Hong remembering how the young man left with Soo-young to another company, to which Jin said that it was because the director took him with her. The head noted that Soo-young seemed to rely heavily on Mr. Sun, but he did not react to this in any way. The chairman's next question did not surprise the guy at all, but it made him think, because Mr. Hong asked what he dreamed about. Yesterday, Soo-young asked the guy the same thing, even though she was terribly drunk, but even then he didn't pay any attention to it and simply came to pick her up. The answer appeared immediately, but not in words, but in the picture of how the young man was taken by the hand, and again a feeling of ordinary life arose that he so lacked. Along with the vivid picture, a painful memory came flooding back, that my parents had died in childhood, and that ordinary life had been buried with them. Jin felt like he was being stabbed with 1,000 needles when he returned to the moment of his uncle's cruelty, which gave him the impetus to study for days on end. Back then, the guy didn't study to dream again, but to keep himself busy with something, which eventually led to a story called The Successful Life of a Contract Worker Who Dropped Out of College. But even after achieving success, Jin always wanted to be the main character in a story about an ordinary life with his loved ones, and now that this dream has not come true, it's as if a hole was gaping inside, leaving no room for other dreams. Song still answered Mr. Hong that he wanted to live an ordinary life, and no matter how it sounded, this was his true dream. The old man first looked at the guy in surprise, but then smiled with understanding towards him, because everyone has something that makes them happy. Mr. Hong suddenly moved towards the young man and took his hand, which made Jin shocked but did not take it. The old man told Sun that he had already spoken with Soo-young's mother and wanted to say that and then the guy's thoughts began to flow that now was the time to ask an important question. While Mr. Hong was asking about whether Song and Soo-young would like to be together, the young man was already looking out the rearview window where a truck was driving towards them. The pain, noise, and darkness were replaced by other sensations that the guy could not understand, because he felt as if his wounds were being treated with something wet and rough, but the smell was not like medicine, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a dog's face in front of him. The dog sat next to the guy with his head held high because he was able to wake him up and waited for praise from him. The young man sat down looking at the dog, not fully understanding whether it was Zangin in front of him or not. But when Jean called the dog's name, he immediately barked, confirming his owner's guess. It was very difficult for Sun to believe that it was Jangun in front of him because he clearly remembered how the poor guy died protecting him from his uncle who had dragged him out of the house by the scruff of the neck. To dispel all doubts, the guy decided to pet his furry friend and understand whether he was real or not. But instead of being convinced of the dog's existence, the guy was more surprised by how his hand looked, after which he began to touch his entire body in a panic, not understanding what had happened to him. It was as if the answer was in front of Jean on a newspaper, and he realized that this was the moment of truth to understand where he was and what happened to him. The newspaper, which had many columns and the latest news, had the date October 1987 written on it. Sun felt hysteria rolling over him, so he let out a nervous laugh and looked at the dog from his childhood, and then at the old newspaper, understanding one thing for sure, that he had died, and immediately thought of Chairman Hong Ji-jun. The presence of a beloved friend, even in paradise, became more pleasant than thoughts of death. So the guy, without thinking twice, instead of sadness and fear, hugged Zangin, saying that he was very glad to see him. The guy's eyes widened even more than when he first saw the dog, because behind him he heard a painfully familiar voice calling him by name. Jean put the dog down and turned around, unable to believe that he saw in front of him the one for whom he had been sad and crying for so long. The boy's mother was walking towards him, and he held his breath, afraid to frighten away such an exciting moment. Mom, in her usual manner, simply reminded her son that he shouldn't sit in the autumn sun for too long because he could get sunburned. Jean sat like a statue and word by word pulled himself to ask whether it was really his mother in front of him. The woman reached out to the baby, not understanding why he was crying, and the only thing she suggested was that he was having a nightmare. The poor man looked at his mother, feeling the warmth of her hands, and was unable to stop the tears that flowed out of so much pain that he reproached throughout his life, hiding it from others. Mom wiped away her son's tears, saying that everything was fine and she was nearby, and in order to understand for sure that he was home, Jean closed his eyes and smelled that very smell of smoke. The boy grabbed his mother's clothes and wrapped himself in her arms like a blanket, remembering how she cooked rice in a pot, which is why she smelled so bad. Jean was unable to let go of his mother, afraid that all this would disappear, so he continued to hug her and mentally tell her that he was a good person. Sun thought that maybe it was because he lived a good life that he met his mother and Zangin in heaven. Having hugged himself to his heart's content, Jean went to wash himself because there were a lot of tears, and his mother told him to come back into the house when he was done. Looking at his face in the water, Sun wondered where his dad was, if his mom and Zangin were here, and the first thing that came to mind was that his dad was in hell, but the boy knew that his father was a good man. Jean looked at the house he loved so much, on the roof of which the wind played with the autumn leaves and the sun warmed it. In the evening, loud laughter from the father was heard from the house because his son had a nightmare and it amused him. Dad stroked the baby's head while he was eating and was touched by how his son was still growing up. The dream in turn was thinking that the father had not gone to hell, and at that moment the mother asked to eat the beans that the father had picked in the morning. The boy glanced at the plate of rice and beans as his father loudly declared that he had picked them in the blazing morning sun. The woman asked her husband to eat too instead of teasing his son, and he obeyed without question. Jean missed the home-cooked food from his garden, so he devoured it with both cheeks, which his mother couldn't help but notice, so she asked if it was really that delicious. The boy even licked the spoon clean and, smiling broadly, replied that it really was very tasty. When it was time to sleep, the boy was wide awake and kept thinking about how long his family had waited for him while his mom and dad were already asleep. Jean took his mother's hand again, worrying that this could be a dream, and if he fell asleep and woke up, everything would disappear, and it would be painful to go through again. The guy looked around the room and noticed a cobweb in the corner, and the thought flashed through his mind that paradise was probably created from the happiest memories. The eyelids became heavy, and falling asleep, Sun thought that the house could have been made better, and there were cobwebs hanging on the ceiling. Having fallen asleep, the young man plunged into the water, where he heard a strange voice that told him that he had lived a worthy life, so he would be sent back, and if he succeeded he would save 3 people. When the stranger expressed his hopes that the boy would live a happy life, he heard his mother trying to wake him up, because it was time to have breakfast and get ready for school. Mom called her son from the kitchen again, asking him to go wash up and eat because he would be late then, but Jean was still stuck at that moment of information where the word school was, and now he was already doubting that he had ended up in heaven, because how could there be a school here? The boy thought that he was most likely in hell if he had to go to school again, and when he came to his class and looked in, he suddenly felt more cheerful because he remembered that he had not been here for a very long time. Nothing had changed in the class, and he was part of everything that was familiar to Sun's memories of his wonderful childhood. The boy moved deeper into the classroom to find his seat, hoping that everything was still in its place, and how happy he was to see a sticker with his name on his desk. Sitting down at his desk, Jean hissed discontentedly, still not wanting to believe that he would go to school in heaven. Sun stared towards the doors because he first heard footsteps and shouts, and then the doors themselves opened loudly. The boy's classmates were racing to argue about who would be first in the class, and one of them didn't have time to see Jean, so he shouted loudly that he was first. Poor Song froze in horror while the guys shouted that Jin Hyuk came first, which ruined the whole argument and competition. After some time, the class filled up with students and it became very noisy as everyone was discussing something with each other. For some reason, Hyuk felt sad for his friends considering the fact that the time spent at school was the happiest for them. And after thinking about his friends, the guy put his hand to his head because it became too heavy due to the realization that he was neither in heaven nor in hell. Writing down questions for himself in a notebook, the boy realized that he had definitely gone back in time. Looking again at his classmate's son, decided that there was an explanation for everything because it would be strange to constantly think about the guys as dead people. The second thing Gene realized while watching his friends was that they couldn't act so stupid if they had the mind of an adult like him. The third realization was that it was clear why Sun's parents didn't ask him how he lived, because even when he himself started talking about whether they wanted to know how he was doing without them, his mother interpreted this as the fact that the baby had not yet woken up. While writing down his thoughts and questions in his notebook, Sun thought that his dream of living with his parents had come true and he was very happy about it. But with joy came the problem that the guy not only does not remember his childhood, but also many memories in general, such as the date of death of his parents or the cause of their death. The boy was distracted from his whirlwind of thoughts by a classmate who appeared out of nowhere and loudly asked whether he remembered today. Of course, Hyuk didn't remember either today or who was standing in front of him, so his face gave it away in this regard. Still straining his brain, Gene remembered that in front of him was Lee Hae-won, who was now tearfully reminding him that a friend had promised to come visit today. And with this, he also remembered that the girl lived deep in the village and her parents owned the only store. Sun was able to dive even deeper into memory, where he and Lee were collecting stones on the shore and catching crabs near her house. And as luck would have it, the most unpleasant moment flared up when Lee brought the old crab to show to her friend, and he screamed in fear. The guy then lost his balance and fell into the water, causing a stain to appear on his pants. Of course, there was a joke from a friend about the boy peeing his pants from fear. That's why now Gene still has a dissatisfied face, because in front of him stood a little brat about whom he remembers everything and remembers how she loved to joke about him. Sun was glad that his memories were gradually returning to him, but he decided that for now, he would refuse Lee's offer and, smiling, began to hesitantly make excuses. He pulled her friend by the hand, persuading him to come visit her anyway since this was already a tradition for them. While the girl was reminding the guy of his promise that he would play with her on the beach today, it was as if someone had doused Gina with cold water. The boy pulled his hand out of Lee's hands without saying anything to her, which turned out to be a rather abrupt gesture. The girl was upset and said that Gene was mean, but there was no time to figure it out because the teacher came and asked everyone to take their seats. Lee pouted and went to her place, but Sun remained sitting motionless, trying to grab hold of the important memory that had rushed past him like a thread. Hyuk sat behind his notebook but didn't hear what the teacher was saying because the memory was spinning around in his head, and it was very difficult to catch it. In Sun's mind, Lee's words about promising her to go to the beach today were repeated, and this word was the key one. The guy felt that something extremely important had happened on the beach, but he couldn't remember what it was. Gene felt uneasy because he felt it was important for him to do what he promised, but he needed to remember why it was so important. The bell rang to notify the students that the lesson was over, and while the other students were getting ready and leaving the classroom, Hyuk remained sitting at his desk. The boy was sad because during the entire lesson he couldn't remember what was so important that was supposed to happen today, so he thought he should go home and look for clues. Just when Song was thinking about returning home, someone called him, but it was no longer Lee's voice. The guy looked at those who approached him, and it turned out that he also remembered the guys well. In front of Sun stood Kang Jin-soo and Yuk Sung-chan, who were known as gluttons among their classmates. Soo suggested that his friend go to the mountain behind the school because a lot of acorns were falling from the tree, and Yuk made a remark to him that squirrels and chipmunks also need to eat something because they will die of hunger if they collect all the fruits, and again Gene felt a hint. The boy clearly felt déjà vu, and the words of an unknown person about returning back and saving 3 lives sounded in his head. The poor guy jumped up because the words about 3 people and death were pulsating in his head along with the blood. Gene rushed in the opposite direction from the guys and flew up to the board where the calendar was hanging. Friends, the behavior of their friend was of course incomprehensible because they did not know what was happening to him at the moment. But Sun, pointing his finger at today's date, was horrified by what all the signs and clues were pointing to. The guy quietly said only the word today, and a tear ran down his cheek from the mere thought of what could happen. Gene froze in horror in front of the calendar where there was a fatal number that influenced his entire past life. The boy was shaking all over and his head was spinning because he remembered that his parents would die that very evening. An ordinary windy day did not foretell trouble for any of the villagers except Gene. The boy's parents were already dressed in special uniforms and were collecting the rest of the necessary things for the trip. In order to go to the beach, the father and mother took with them the necessary tools that they would need to get food. The woman asked her opponent if he found their son's behavior suspicious since yesterday, to which he agreed, perceiving it as the boy growing up even overnight. So the answer calmed the child's mother down, switching her thoughts from anxious ones to the fact that they had once been told that children grow up quickly, and now they were convinced of it themselves. Appa stood up and, looking at his beloved, He also mentioned to her that they were living in an era of rapid maturation. The man pointed to a bucket where everything needed for a trip to the beach was collected, and with that the couple decided that they were ready. The woman was worried that this would be their first time collecting seafood and that something might go wrong, but her husband reassured her that they were going with the village elders so they could at least try first. The second alarm bell for the mother was that they did not have lunch with their son before leaving, as if she felt something. Appa agreed with his beloved, explaining that in this case they need to leave and return as soon as possible because even if Jean behaves like an adult, he is still a child. The husband, observing his woman's distress, took her hand gently and suggested that she finish the work as quickly as possible in order to return in time for dinner. The anxious moment was interrupted by the elders, who told the boys that if they were ready they should leave before it got dark. The confused young couple headed to the car with the elders, who had already discussed how these doves loved to coo. While his parents went to the beach unsuspecting, Hyuk ran home, remembering that in his past life he lost his family on that very day when they went to collect seafood. Jean ran past the water and anxiety and adrenaline went through the roof in his little body. The boy remembered that during the full moon or new moon the water recedes and it is convenient to walk along the rocky parts of the coast, and at this time the locals collect food, but there have already been many cases of sudden tides and with them the risk of dying. Mixed with the understanding of his parents' inexperience in collecting seafood and therefore the danger to them, a defense mechanism was triggered in Jin's head in the form of self-reassurance that there was still time before night. The guy was ready to throw a tantrum or cry. The main thing was that it would help keep his parents from going to the beach. Hyuk ran home with hope from the doorway, calling his parents, but unfortunately no one was there. The boy walked around the rooms, losing bit by bit his faith that his family might be in at least some part of the house. But there was silence in the house and no one responded to the baby's call, which only frightened him more. Jean, barely able to move from fatigue and fear, tried to go into the kitchen again, but that didn't help either. The kid ran up to the table with a plate of wrapped food and saw on it a note from his parents about where they were going, with whom and why, as well as a request for their son to eat well, after which they would return with a pile of food and buy him a notebook for school. Gina was gripped by a wild fear that he would lose his family again and that loneliness would be his daily companion. In addition to the nagging pain in his chest, the guy immediately had before his eyes a terrible picture of how he later lost another friend who bravely defended him. At that moment, the boy was pulled out of the quagmire of dark thoughts by that same brave four-legged friend. Hyuk woke up and looked questioningly at the window from where the dog's barking was coming to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Having moved part of the window aside, the kid saw that, as always, his faithful furry friend greeted him briskly. Jin's head was already a complete mess of memories from his past life and what was happening again now, so he was ready to burst into tears from stress again. Zangin continued to bark, which gradually brought his owner to his senses, and Hyuk really understood that now was not the time to fall apart. So he looked around and began to think about what he could do and manage to do before dark. Jean decided to try to look into one of the rooms in the house where he would definitely find something useful for himself. His attention was drawn to something that could act as a lever to prevent a catastrophe. The kid opened the doors to the room where many different things were stored, both for everyday life and for holidays, so he instantly found a solution. Armed with salvation for his parents, the boy rushed to the exit with a burn and called his faithful friend with him. The boys ran at full speed, and it was already dark and cold, so much so that steam was coming out of their mouths. The anxiety subsided a little but did not go away, so even after running to the beach, the boy turned his head in all directions but did not see his parents. The child and the dog's attention was drawn to loud voices, which became a landmark. The elders couldn't tell in the darkness whether Jin Hyuk had run or not, so they shouted just in case, and the boy also immediately recognized that in front of him was the head of the village, Cho Il Hong, and the president of the youth association, Park Dae Soon. In addition to the fact that the boy remembered who the people in front of him were, he also recognized them as those who were the first to tell him in his past life about the death of his parents. Only now, having become an adult, did Jean realize that men were tormented by guilt over the death of his parents. Now the children's hatred was replaced by an understanding of what the elders were experiencing back then, but so far nothing had happened. The head asked the kid what he was doing here so late, to which the president explained that the boy had clearly come for his parents. Jean remembered how the elders did everything possible to find his mom and dad before the water rose, and now when he asked where his parents were, they answered that they should have returned by now because the tide would soon be in. Hyuk looked at the water that merged with the dark sky into one black canvas, but the elders still said that they saw their parents. The boy held his breath so that if he couldn't see, he could hear the call of his family, but the darkness was louder. As soon as a small light appeared on the horizon, Jin's heart began to flutter, but now not from fear but from joy that he would be able to save the people dear to him. The guy ran forward and didn't pay attention to what the elders called him because there was not a second to lose. Hyuk took a deep breath and shouted as loudly as he could and managed to reach his parents. The mother immediately recognized her son's voice, and the father was surprised that the boy found this place, although he should have been waiting for them at home. The husband admitted that it was already so dark that he didn't even know where they were, and now they would be able to return. But then the woman said that she didn't understand where the sound was coming from. The couple stood up and, looking around, realized that the situation was really difficult because it was dark everywhere. Hyuk also realized that shouting alone wouldn't do the trick, so he cursed but wasn't going to give up. The kid gave a command to Zangan, and he immediately brought the necessary thing in his mouth, which resembled a lantern with holes where coals lay. The head was worried that the boy would cause a stir in the village, and the president of the association even thought that Jean was lighting firecrackers. It became so bright that the men could not even look, but Hyuk did not stop and swung the bucket of coals so that they would burn properly. The wife asked the man to look in the direction she was looking because it was very difficult to believe. Jean thought about not letting the tragedy happen again, so he swung the bucket as fast as he could. Thanks to the fact that the coals were ignited by the wind, the guy created a bright landmark so that his family could return. The parents clearly saw the beacon that their son made for them, but they couldn't believe that their child had thought of this. The kid took it upon himself to change his destiny with his own hands, both literally and figuratively so. In addition to spinning the bucket, he also screamed. Everything went well, and this time the elders said goodbye to the young couple in words, and not with tears, and while the family was leaving for home, Zangan followed them happily with a load in his teeth, and his mother said that now they were indebted to their son for saving them. The father also picked up on the mother's statement, realizing that they really almost got into trouble, and also thanked the baby. Hyuk declared that his parents should no longer go out to collect seafood, and even if they did, they should take him with them. The boy began to toss and turn on his dad's back and say that he could actually go on his own. But the father did not let his son go, reminding him that he still had to go to school tomorrow, and he was already exhausted, so he could take a nap right on his back, but Hyuk still resisted, saying he was not tired. Jean was thinking about how his parents continued to treat him like a child, even though he was in fact the older of the two, and then his father, as if reading his mind, told the boy that he was incredible, and his mother giggled and agreed with this. The guy instantly changed from a grumbler and an adult uncle to that same boy, and smiling happily watched his parents. Hyuk was happy that he was able to save his family, and the feeling of a heavy role fell from his shoulders. Measuring fate with his own hands is very tiring, so Jean was finally able to relax, causing him to yawn sweetly. The kid leaned on his father's back and, falling asleep, thought about how he no longer had to be strong, but before he could finish telling himself why being a child was so great, he passed out. Dad became curious about how his son came up with the idea of looking for him and his mother on the beach, and was even able to bring a jar of coals, but there was no answer. Just in case, the father turned around and called the baby again to understand why he was not answering. Mom pointed her finger at her lips, indicating that her son had fallen asleep, so he needed to speak more quietly. Hyuk fell into a deep sleep after such a nervous day and snored sweetly, which his parents were ready to watch forever. The spouses also looked at each other and smiled, showing that they were glad to have each other. Mom and Dad wished their little one sweet dreams in the yard and behind the hill, after which Mom stroked his back and Zangan followed the owners home. Jean was resting in his usual place in the yard under a tree and looked at his hands in the rays of the sun, still not believing that he had saved his parents with them. While the boy was dreaming, his faithful four-legged friend expressed his dissatisfaction that his bowl was empty. Hyuk felt so good that he even closed his eyes, thinking only about how his future would turn out now. The guy's flight of fancy was interrupted by Zangan, who loudly declared that he was unhappy with the empty bowl. Instead of pouring water for the fluffy one, Jean simply grabbed him by the muzzle and started squeezing him, saying that his friend would also like a normal life. The kid sincerely thanked Zangan for saving him, saying that if it weren't for him, his life would have gone down the drain. Zangan barely escaped from his master's grip and went for his bowl, while the boy froze with his hands, but without the dog's muzzle, because he remembered that the strange voice spoke about saving 3 lives. The dog placed the bowl right at Hyuk's feet so that he would finally notice him, and the guy really did notice, but only that the 3rd life was Zangan. The thoughts continued, and finally the little boy noticed out of the corner of his eye that his friend was asking him for something. Hyuk said so loudly that he had something for the dog that he jumped up in surprise, and from the fact that he would finally be fed. The boy had 2 acorns in his hand, and he brought them from a food festival at school where his friends had given them to him. Jean threw acorns into the dog's bowl with an invitation to Zangan to be a family, but he no longer listened and was anticipating how he would eat something tasty. Literally in a moment, the dog's mood changed like the weather at sea, and he became very angry with his owner because he probably didn't know that dogs can't eat such things. With a sense of accomplishment, the boy sat and continued to think about how CX World would only appear in 10 years, when the efficiency of services in the public and private sectors would increase through discussions of ways to improve the customer experience. This time, the guy jumped from the unexpected turn of events when the disgruntled and indignant Zangan barked at him. But Hyuk's breakfast with his family was far from acorn-based, which was good news. As always, Mom called her son so that he could eat and asked at the same time if he had been able to change his clothes while he stood shyly at the threshold. The parents heard their little boy enter the kitchen, so they both turned around wishing him good morning and were instantly touched by his clothes. While Mom and Dad were melting from how cute their son was, Jean felt uneasy because the feeling that he was still a grown man had not gone away, but now they dressed him in what they dressed him in. Dad immediately noticed that his son was in the blue room for competitions and remembered how he was always in the white one. Mom noted that dolphins suit the boy very well. The mother noticed that something was wrong with the baby and immediately asked if he was feeling unwell, or if something was hurting. But the boy replied that he looked very childish in this uniform, which made him very embarrassed. The parents could barely restrain themselves from squealing at how big their little son was already. The father tried to support his son by saying that Jin Hyuk as a real man should not be constrained by his outfit, and the guy at that moment was thinking that any 40-year-old man like him would be embarrassed. The elementary school where Hyuk studied was holding an autumn sports competition. While the parents were laying out the blanket, Jin was already looking closely at what kind of competitions awaited them. In addition to assessing the situation, the boy remembered how in the past he sat far away from everyone and hated such events. At those moments, Hyuk was always lonely, which is why he didn't want to go to school at all, nor did he want to live either. Now something was happening that sometimes still seems like a dream to the boy, because he heard his mother calling him again, and his father asking him to try his mother's homemade kimbap, which made his face dirty. It was so delicious. The mother was happy that the baby would now try her signature dish, and the son was happy that he was no longer alone. Hyuk's eyes lit up when he tasted his mother's deliciousness, and his cheeks turned red. The boy, impressed by the incredibly delicious food, asked his mother if she had thought about opening her own restaurant and selling kimbap there, which made her laugh because she had heard the best compliment. The host announced the next competition in the form of a tug of war and asked the older men, namely fathers, uncles, or brothers, to come to the site. And at that moment some people were discussing the fact that Hyuk's father came from Seoul. When the man rolled up his sleeves and took hold of the rope, some parents wondered how a man who had only just studied in Seoul could be so strong. The women shouted that Jin Hyuk's father was so good, but as soon as the host said get ready, and everyone became quiet so as not to interfere. The team scores sometimes went ahead, sometimes were tied, but despite the victory of the blue or white team, the students and their parents had a good time together. Mama Gina also took part in the last competition in the race among other mothers, and her beloved men cheered for her loudest of all, but unfortunately she tripped halfway. The woman sat upset by her shameful defeat, and besides her forehead, which she had hit, hurt. Appa asked if his beloved was okay, to which she hid even more in her knees, explaining that she was terribly ashamed of her fall, and that she came last, and all she wanted was to show her son how fast she was. The host told the second graders to get ready for a long-distance race, and Hyuk asked his mother not to be upset. The boy tied the ribbon tightly on his head and told his mother that he would take first place in the race for her sake. All participants, including Jin, dropped to a low start, and the host asked them to prepare for the signal. The presenter raised his hand up, and when the shot rang out, the students jumped up and Hyuk was in front. The parents supported their son by shouting his name, even though there were plenty of other parents around, and perhaps the boy didn't even hear his mom and dad. The boy ran like never before and felt his body overcome the speed, and the wind whistled in his ears. The announcer announced to everyone that the blue team had pulled ahead, and the crowd began to roar when they saw how fast the boy with the blue ribbon was. The audience no longer even doubted that Jin would win, but the parents fell silent, not believing that their son was really that fast. Hyuk seemed not to feel any obstacles, and the warmth of adrenaline pleasantly spread throughout his body, and his flexible feet touched the ground and made it possible to move faster. Despite the fact that the boy was wet from how hot he was, the wind pleasantly ruffled his hair, cooling his whole body, and the movement of muscles throughout his body was clearly felt. The schoolboy felt heat in his throat, and with another breath, he remembered how he ran in his past life, feeling the contrast of the wind in his nose and mouth. The guy liked to run in the evenings with a view of the city, which was illuminated by many bright lights. Along with his second wind, Jin for the first time had such a vivid feeling that he was truly alive, as if his life had acquired not only colors but also taste. Song Jin Hyuk won first place in the competition and received a reward in the form of a hand seal. The parents were always happy with any achievements of their son, but this time their hearts fluttered in unison. Hyuk responded with the same sincere joy to his parents' smiles when he looked in their direction. The father got down on one knee to hug his son tightly, who was already running towards them as fast as he could. But the father not only hugged his son but also lifted him up in his arms, saying what an incredible boy he and his mother had, and immediately offered anything as a reward for first place. But Hyuk, first of all wriggling like an eel on a frying pan, asked to let him go down. Suddenly Mom felt a sharp and strange feeling on the side of her body and automatically grabbed it with her hand. The son and father did not yet notice how the woman drooped, feeling discomfort in her body. Only when the boys realized that it had become suspiciously quiet on their mother's side, Hyuk immediately asked what hurt his mother and how she felt, but she answered with a smile that there was nothing to worry about. On a fine day, the boy was looking for something in the yard, and his father noticed it and asked what exactly he needed. Armed with a fishing rod and a basket, the boy told his dad that they were going to catch mudskippers together. The father was a little embarrassed that they were going to catch exactly this kind of creature, but he could not refuse his son the opportunity to spend time together. The boys walked around the area to the fishing spot in silence until Jin looked at his hand. The father noticed his son's interest in the watch on his hand and asked if he was happy with the gift for first place. Hyuk said that the watch looked really cool, to which dad mentioned how he asked the store to bring him the best of the best. The baby was very happy with how his father treated the gift, and that in this way he was showing his love and care. When the family was returning home from the competition and the father was again carrying carrying his son on his back, Jean finally said that he would really like a watch with a stopwatch as a gift. The father asked if the boy meant a digital watch, and he nodded, to which he said that he would buy one when he was in town and would even try to find a glowing one. The boys were again happy with the team they had, but their mother was worried that her son would ruin his eyesight, so the father asked the little one not to make his mother worry. When Hyuk received the watch, he was pleased and immediately told his mother that he remembered her request and promised that he would not ruin his eyesight. Jean was thinking about how he didn't need to look at his watch for long periods of time, and when he remembered about smartphones, he thought that his parents would faint if they saw them. The boys finally reached the water, and Dad asked his son if he knew how to fish, to which Hyuk said that there was definitely nothing difficult about it. Jean knew that Dad didn't fish, but he still asked him for the sake of appearances if he had done anything similar, to which he muttered under his breath that Mom was better at it, and then the kid realized that Dad was about to have his first experience. Hyuk didn't cast his line, which surprised his father, and when he asked why they were in a place where there was no water or fish, the boy said that they needed bait first. When his dad asked what other bait was in the ground, Hyuk dug up a worm from the ground, and a rather large one at that. The genie picked up the worm and showed it to his father, asking if it wasn't beautiful, which is why the poor guy instantly found himself 10 steps away from the child, screaming, "What a nightmare." The boy was a little confused by his father's reaction, but he no longer approached him with the insect. The man immediately remembered his wife, who was not embarrassed to take something smelly or dirty in her hands, and could not even imagine that his son would be so similar to his mother. Jean deftly showed his dad how to put a worm on a hook, and he even decided to risk trying to do it himself. After the bait was ready, Hyuk also explained to his father that the hook is not simply lowered into the water but lightly thrown in. The boys stood with fishing rods on the shore, waiting for a bite and enjoying the beautiful view and fresh air. Jean periodically glanced at his father, glad that he would never know some things about his past life. Hyuk wouldn't want his dad to know that his son started going fishing just to spend time with him, at least in his mind. But sometimes, no matter how hard the grown-up Uncle Jean tried, he felt terribly lonely sitting like that on the shore with a fishing rod. The father suddenly felt how heavy his fishing rod had become and began to shout that he had caught a fish, to which Hyuk told him to lift it as quickly as possible so that the fish would not escape. As it turned out, getting the catch was not an easy task, but the man made an effort and a fish flew over them on a fishing line. There were also some reciprocal glances between the predator and his victim, who was flying straight at his face. When the catch landed right on the father's face, both he and the boy froze in place, and only the funny splashing of the fish could be heard. Hyuk didn't know what to do, considering his dad's dislike for such creatures, so he just stood there thinking that maybe his dad would figure it out himself. Dad finally figured it out, screaming in fear and falling to the ground, and his son immediately ran up to him and asked if everything was okay. The man had to take off his glasses to wipe the fish slime from his eyes, and Jean was barely holding back his laughter at that moment because Dad looked like a bandit in a mask. Having fallen to the ground opposite his father, the son nevertheless gave free rein to laughter, continuing to hold the fishing rod in his hands. The guys ended up catching a whole bowl of fish, which meant at least a tasty dinner. While the mother was dealing with the fish and her son was helping her, everyone behind her heard Zangan growling, to which she asked if the friends had quarreled by chance, but Hyuk himself did not know what had happened, having missed the moment when he put the acorns in the dog's bowl. Jean tried to take all the work on himself, asking his mother to rest because in his opinion she looked tired, but she said that such a fish could seriously injure. But Hyuk already knew that mudskippers are not difficult to deal with and showed his mother that first you need to scrape off the scales and cut off the fins with scissors. Afterwards, the fish needs to be turned over and the belly cut from the mouth to the stomach in order to remove any excess. The last thing that needed to be done was to remove the gills and entrails, and after these words the mother praised her son, who was doing well. The boy asked his mother to put the entrails aside, and when she asked why, he explained that he would give them to Zangan, but he himself was thinking about how he needed to appease the bastard so that he wouldn't do anything else. The fish, in delicious clean pieces, was dried on a stick in the rays of the evening sun. The boy came to his friend and put the bowl down, carefully moving it away with his foot and saying that it was a bribe. Stepping aside just in case, Jean wished the dog a pleasant appetite and asked him to behave appropriately after that, and he, wagging his tail, headed towards the bowl. Kvastik accepted the bribe and gobbled up the delicious food, while the owner thought that even after being a special agent and mastering martial arts, the dog's teeth were still scary to him. Mom distracted her son from his terrible thoughts about Zangan's teeth by asking him to help Dad. The furry friend licked his lips, contentedly satisfied with such a hearty bribe from his owner. It seemed like it was evening, but Jean was walking through the dense garden among the fruit trees in the sunlight. The boy did not understand whether it was a dream or not because everything looked very beautiful and realistic. Even in such a mysterious place, Hyuk recognized the voice calling him as his mother, so he turned around. Mom was even more beautiful than usual and in the same white clothes as her son, which added even more mystery. Jean approached his mother to find out what she was doing there, and she said that she came to pick some apples. Looking around questioningly, repeating the word apples, Hyuk glanced again at his mother, and she confirmed that she had indeed come for fruit because she was allowed to. Jean didn't understand what was going on, which is why he scratched the back of his head, and his mother couldn't choose which apple to pick for her and asked if her son could help her choose one. The boy became even more confused after such a request and asked again whether he really should choose an apple. Mom smiled and said that she was confident in her son's choice and thought that it would be wonderful if he did it. The woman waited while Hyuk looked around at all the trees in search of the best apple for his mother. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw exactly what he was looking for, and it was the biggest and brightest apple in the whole garden. Jean realized that this was the very thing he wanted to choose for his mother since she relied on him. The fruit was huge and juicy and barely fit in the boy's hands, but he still decided to pick it. Hyuk returned to his mother with what she asked him for and what she trusted him with and simply waited for him to give her the apple. The son handed his mother a fruit, touching it with his hands, feeling that there was some mysterious meaning in it. The woman still happily thanked the boy, and at that point her image and the apple orchard began to disappear. Jean continued to stare at the ceiling for some time, even after he had already opened his eyes, but he was glad that at least this time he didn't jump out of his sleep but woke up calmly. The guy stood up, scratching his head and yawning sweetly, and at some point he thought about the apple again. While eating warm buns, the boy confessed to his mother that he had a very strange but interesting dream that night, and his mother also became curious, so Hyuk told him that they were in an apple orchard and he chose a beautiful green apple for her. Mom suddenly covered her mouth with her hand while Hyuk continued to talk about how he might have had the dream because he wanted apples because they were in season, but there were no green ones left. In addition to covering her mouth with her hand, the mother also looked away without answering her son. Jean was afraid that he had said something wrong, or that his mother was feeling unwell again. It turned out that my mother was looking at the calendar where it was October, which meant that there were basically no apples left, and even if there were, they were definitely not green. The kid didn't know what was waiting for him, but the saying "what you least think about catches you by surprise" was more relevant than ever, so without suspecting anything he returned home. And when asked why he was late, he said that the boys didn't have enough players for football. The boy was surprised when he saw that in the yard besides his mother, there were also Choi Mi-kyung and her grandmother. The girl also asked like an adult why the boy was late home. Before answering, the naughty girl Hyuk remembered that after the death of his parents, he and Jang-gun lived with Mi-kyung's family for about a year until his aunt and uncle came. But even when the guys grew up and Jean moved to Seoul, he and Mi continued to meet periodically and have heart-to-heart talks. Friends might simply meet for dinner, or Hyuk himself would drop by to visit Mi and her parents to say hello. Besides the fact that this pest Mi started coming to visit often, she was also seated next to Jean at school. The boy came closer to everyone, not understanding why the guests had come, to which the grandmother, anticipating everything, said with a smile that the boy was probably happy. And when Hyuk asked what exactly he should be happy about, his mother told him that he would soon become an older brother for his sister or little brother, and a moment of stupor was inevitable. Jean screamed so loudly that Dad covered Mom's ears just in case, and Mi even said that she was going to go deaf. Using his adult knowledge, the guy realized that he had a so-called prenatal dream that warns of pregnancy. Jean lowered his head, and the grandmother took it as the boy being glad that there would soon be one more of them, and Mi also joined in the congratulations. Mom was a little confused by her son's reaction, so just in case, she also asked if he was happy with the news. Hyuk clenched his fists, answering quietly and truthfully that he was happy, but no one knew what he realized at that moment and how much it hurt. The boy understood what 3 lives were spoken of in the dream, and he felt a strong pang inside from the understanding that not only his parents had died then, but also the little life inside his mother. Finally, the guy was able to look at everyone with a sense of relief, realizing that now everything was behind him. The son met the gaze of his father, who knew how to embrace him, even with his eyes, which gave him a feeling of calm and warmth. Grandma asked Mom if Jean Hyuk really had that dream, to which she replied that it was true, because it's not for nothing that they say that children find out about pregnancy before their parents, and after that Mi asked the guy if it was true, to which he nodded. Mi-kyung became curious about what exactly was in her friend's dream, and when he said an apple, it sounded strange because the girl thought that Jin's mother would give birth to an apple, while in the background her grandmother asked about the timing and her mother said next summer. Granny smiled at this news, saying that in that case the summer would be even hotter, and immediately asked if the girl was going to give birth again at home, to which Jean had already paid attention. The boy immediately asked if his mother had given birth to him at home, to which she replied yes, adding that his grandmother had also helped then. I couldn't mention to my friend that if he didn't know, many people are in debt to her granny. Grandma told Hyuk how his father was nervous that something bad might happen during the birth, and it looked like he was giving birth, so she asked him to get out and not interfere. Mom also confirmed that Dad was worried, unlike her, and because she was calm, the birth went smoothly. Having been in an adult body and having learned a lot at a conscious age, Hyuk was a little embarrassed by the fact that his mother wanted to give birth at home and not in a hospital where they would react immediately, and he imagined how the hearts of the people of Seoul would stop from this. Jean watched his mother with concern, knowing from hearsay that childbirth is a test of endurance. Suddenly Mom noticed that Hyuk moved closer to her, but she didn't understand what was happening. And the son simply handed his mother a slice of apple, saying that now she needed to eat even better than before. The woman agreed with the baby's opinion and happily accepted his care for herself and the future child. Grandma happily clarified that thanks to Jin Hyuk's care for his parents, they don't even have to worry about their youngest child. Having stroked the boy's head, the grandmother said that he had grown up very handsome and he didn't mind. With the new watch, Jin's runs became much more interesting, and the excitement was added by the fact that he was racing with Zangan. Feeling that he no longer had the strength to run, the guy stopped and, breathing heavily, called out to his friend, who obediently turned around. When the dog ran up to his owner, he admitted that Zangan was fast, but in his mind he thought that this bastard even liked to overtake him. It wasn't without a morning treat in the form of a goby fish, which the dog gobbled up with gusto. Hyuk suddenly pointed his finger at Jangun and suggested changing his name to Kalyuyasa, although he didn't understand anything. The boy explained to the fluffy one that he would be named after Carl Lewis, the track and field athlete who won first place in the 100-meter dash at the 1988 Paralympic Games, and he would only understand this in about 2 months. The guy didn't forget about himself either, looking at his watch and realizing that the result was worse than before, but this was most likely due to his short legs, although it was not bad for an elementary school student. Hyuk announced to Zangan that he should race to the house, and if he got there first, he would get the goby fish again. The guys got into a low start, and Jean, instead of the judge announced attention, got ready and started. The guys took off, and this time Jean really wanted not so much to overtake the dog as to improve his result. Hyuk ran so confidently and purposefully that at first he didn't even notice the catch in his and Zangan's race. The boy didn't even have the words to shout anything at first when he saw what his cunning friend had done. All the boy could shout after the fast dog was that he was not just a bastard but also a crook. Breathing heavily and sweating, Jean appeared on the threshold, unable to even say that he was home. Mom was also busy with her own affairs while rejoicing at the return of her son, and a contented Zangan was already lying next to her. The dog, with just his appearance, showed his owner how insignificant he was with his 2 human legs. The boy asked his mother if she made gochujang and was told that she did because it was needed for meat and it could also be used to make tteokbokki. Hyuk instantly felt awkward because his mother was moving so much while also carrying a child, so he decided to fix the situation. The guy had an idea how to make the process of hard work a little easier for his mother. Even though the jug was the size of Genie himself, he still told his mother that he would help wash it, which made her very happy. Hyuk armed himself with a sponge and began to carefully rub the jug first from the outside and then left the internal work for later. The boy jumped around the jug as if in a dance, trying to somehow reach the bottom, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't. The adult's brain fought with the child's body, and Jean tried with all his might to reach the very bottom, but his little hands did not obey. When there was only a little bit left to wipe the bottom, the boy lost his footing and staggered along with the jug. At first, Mom didn't understand what happened and where the noise was coming from, but she looked in the right direction. Hyuk's legs were sticking out of the jug, and he was swinging them so vigorously that he was about to fly away. The mother ran up and quickly grabbed the child by the legs to pull him out, although the jug did not pose any threat to him. It's good that Jean hasn't grown much in height yet, because all Mom had to do was raise her hands above her, and he would completely climb out of the jug. With his knowledge, Hyuk looked at his mother upside down and saw in her at that moment the goddess Thetis, who once also pulled her son Achilles out of the water. The poor guy covered his face with his hands out of shame, and although his mother asked if everything was okay with him, he still didn't open his face, but quietly replied that everything was fine, thinking that in the future he would eat even better in order to grow, and that this would not happen again. In the middle of the night, some people couldn't sleep, so one of them joined his comrades. The men immediately turned around when they heard footsteps and silently responded to the appearance of the assistant. Jean's dad came to the other fathers with bags, and everything happened as quietly as possible and without unnecessary words. The man was asked if anyone had seen him on the way here, but he made it clear that he was indeed being extremely careful. Hyuk's father was a little nervous, but he didn't say anything unnecessary since he preferred to act. Other fathers said that now you can see what Papa Jean has in his bags and understand whether it suits them or not. Winter has come, but despite the cold, local residents met Hyuk on the road, who always ran with Zangan, and today the headman exchanged a few words with him, asking him to be careful because the road was slippery. Jean combined jogging with waiting for his dad at the bus stop because he was on winter break. The boy never parted with his watch, and now, as always, it came in handy to understand how long he had to wait for his father. The sound of a bus was heard, and the boy immediately looked ahead, realizing that his dad would definitely get out of the vehicle. The father was worried that his son had been waiting for him for a long time, but he assured him that he had gone out for a run again, and since Dad was returning from work at about that time, he and Zangan were waiting for him to go home together. Dad decided to immediately show Jean what kind of jacket he bought for him in the city and suggested that he put it on now and return home quickly so that Mom wouldn't worry. The father treated the boy to taiyaki, which made poor Zangan drool, and while the boys were walking, the father happily noted how quickly the boy was growing, and now buying him clothes had become even more interesting, so he suggested going to the city with him next time. After Jean happily agreed to his father's proposal, he heard him ask him how he felt knowing that a baby was coming soon. Hyuk didn't quite understand what his dad meant, so he explained that some children think their parents will love them less and feel sad about it. The guy almost finished the cookie, and before eating the tail, he broke into a smile. The boy surprised his father by saying that regarding jealousy and other feelings, such things had never bothered him. Jin finished the treat and confidently told his dad that he was only thinking about protecting and caring for the baby, so he asked his father not to worry because he would be a good appa. The word appa completely threw the man off guard because he realized that they were talking about a girl. Jin noticed his dad's reaction and explained that Grandma Mi Kyung told Mom that it would be a girl because her back was thin. The next moment, the father put his hand on his son's shoulder and said that he was already a wonderful appa. Leaning towards his son, the father assured him that even after the birth of his sister, he need not worry that his parents would stop loving him. Hyuk's cheeks turned red from such warm words, and from the fact that he remembered a moment from their past life. The guy caught himself thinking that he had already forgotten the last time he was called Appa, because if you think about it, it was back when he was carrying a drunk executive director on his back and she called him that. Hyuk suddenly felt uneasy at the memory, and he scratched the back of his head in embarrassment. To shift the focus of attention, the boy asked his dad when he was walking at night lately, which made the poor guy's hair stand on end, and he began to invent some kind of meetings about preparations for the new year. The father didn't know that in front of him was not just a child, but an adult from a past life who immediately realized that dad was up to something. This time dad decided to shift attention by remembering the tree and offered to go with him to cut it down tomorrow, but Hyuk asked what if he went to Mi Kyung and bought a tree from them that would grow. The next day, as the guys had agreed, they came to visit Mi Kyung's family with a bunch of fish and called Hyun from the doorway. Choi Jang-hwan was just at home, and Mi Kyung was making a snowman and was happy to see her friend. Besides the fact that the people knew each other and said hello, Zangan also had a furry friend of the family, whom he immediately turned to. Hyuk's father asked if they could take the tree, to which Mr. Hyun said with a smile that if Jin Hyuk asked, then of course they could, because how could they refuse him? Jin remembered Mr. Hwang as a kind-hearted person who was ready to help in any trouble, and so 9 years ago, he helped his parents settle in a new place after moving. Jin's father handed Hyun a bundle of fish, explaining that he wasn't going to take the tree for free, so he brought at least this. Hyun laughed, saying that the man was not like a relative, but he said that Hyuk himself wanted them to bring fish, so he couldn't refuse here either, and after ruffling the guy's hair, Hwang assured him that he would choose the best tree for them. While the men were digging, Hwang expressed his joy that the Song family was now living well, because at first he was very worried about the guy who came from Seoul with a pregnant girlfriend without having anything behind him. Hyun gave Jin's dad a friendly pat on the back, mentioning that he was good at farming and got along well with the residents, although you wouldn't say at first that a guy from Seoul would be able to improve his plot so much, for which he thanked Hyun. At some point, the men moved very close to each other, and Hyun asked in a whisper how the preparations were going, to which he said that there were some difficulties and there was little time left, but he hoped that everything would be done on time. While the grown-up uncles were whispering among themselves, Jin turned to his friend, who was making a little snowman. Hyuk asked me if her dad also goes somewhere at night, but the girl said that she doesn't know about that because he goes to bed early, and then Jin asked if maybe her father asks her about some wishes, but then Mi said that her mother asks such things. Mi Kyung admired her creation while continuing to explain to Jin that even though she was given the opportunity to choose something, she didn't know what she wanted. Jin smiled slyly and looked at the fathers, who were still standing and whispering, understanding what was going on. The men did not yet suspect that their plans had long since been declassified, so they stood by the tree and chatted. Mi told Hyuk that she would soon go to Jeju Island and asked if her friend wanted a souvenir from there, which surprised him greatly. Jin's eyes widened even more when he heard that the price for the souvenir was to do Mi's homework that they were assigned for the holidays. Hyuk was annoyed that the girl didn't stop dumping her homework on him, and even now she masterfully played the unfortunate one because they gave her difficult tasks, which made the guy's hand clench into a fist, and he almost gave her a chul su from martial arts. The young man was restrained by the fact that he closed his eyes and imagined how close his and Mi's families had been in the past. Looking at his father's, Hyuk remembered that his parents had been indebted to Mr. Hwang for a long time. And even Jang-gun was friends with Baekgu, the Mi Kyung family dog, who kindly shared a place in the kennel every time. The storm of emotions subsided in the guy's heart, and he decided that there was nothing difficult in helping his friend, but Jin changed his mind about his thoughts when he heard from me that she needed help with keeping a diary, which was an individual task. Hyuk seemed to be knocked out because he didn't understand how one could ask someone to do their individual work, but the girl smiled sweetly as if nothing had happened. Mi Kyung asked for a little more help to definitely persuade her friend, and Jin, through pain and suffering after a heavy sigh, agreed. The boy reassured himself that he was making such an unfair deal only for the sake of his family, and would not cry because real men do not cry, although this indicated that he still did not know much and that men were the ones who could cry. The boys managed to put the Mi Kyung family's Christmas tree in the pot that Jin had once fallen into before the snow started falling. While the mother mother was standing next to her son and rejoicing at what a beautiful Christmas tree they now had. The boy himself was still thinking about whether his father hadn't found out what story had happened with that pea. Hyuk was distracted from his shameful thoughts and joined his mother, confirming out loud that the tree was really beautiful and most importantly would live on, and next year they would be looking at the tree together as 5 of them. On Christmas Day, a mother and son watched A Christmas Carol on TV, and unlike his mother, the boy was not scared by the ghosts. Gene was lying on his mother's legs with a sour expression on his face, perfectly understanding that the film was based on the novel by Charles Dickens. Hyuk remembered how in his past life everyone watched popular films for cozy winter evenings, and he yawned out of boredom, and his mother immediately said that if he wanted he could sleep, but he argued that his dad hadn't come yet and it wasn't even 10 o'clock. The mother realized that she couldn't fool her son and looked at her watch, realizing that the plan had failed a little. Gene glanced at the window, realizing that his dad was most likely sitting outside and waiting for his son to fall asleep so he could go inside. Father was actually sitting on the threshold in a Santa suit, hugging Zangin to somehow warm up. The boy took on the mission of playing along with his dad so that he wouldn't get sick, so he pretended to be tired and yawned as he went to his room, and when his mother asked him if he was really tired, he said that it really was time to go to bed. Mom breathed a sigh of relief that Appa would now be able to enter the house and not freeze while waiting. Hyuk was wide awake, but he had already heard his dad quietly ask if his son was sleeping, to which his mom said maybe, and asked if her beloved was cold. Mom quietly asked Appa what he decided to give the boy since he had been choosing for so long, to which he replied about a bag, since the boy would soon have a new semester, and hoped that Hyuk would like it. Gene mentally thanked both the heavens and his father for such a gift, because he was already ashamed to go to school with his previous bag, and meanwhile his dad told him that children from other families wished for so many things, but their son seemed to want nothing. The parents sat down next to the boy, and the father agreed that greed was bad, but he was worried that something had happened to their child, to which the mother replied that he was still little. Looking at the baby, the woman affectionately said that when Hyuk grows up his world will become much bigger, and he will see many new things, as if she was predicting the future. Lightly stroking her son's hair, the mother added that when the world becomes bigger for the boy, his desires will also become bigger. The father also looked tenderly and dreamily at the future man, agreeing with the words of his beloved and thinking about how much Jin's world would expand. The men walked around the houses for some time, happily waving to each other, something they had once agreed upon, secretly meeting in the evening after work and discussing suits and gifts. Mi-kyung also already received her gift in a bag while she was really fast asleep and taking away her favorite toy. And there were also those guys who had gifts put in a sock that they deliberately hung on the wall. Even Zangin got a juicy bone, and imagine his surprise when he wakes up from the dream where he dreamed about it. Time flew by very quickly, and summer came, and at school there was a break during which everyone went to eat. Next to Jin hung his new briefcase, and Mi-kyung kept sharing that she couldn't believe that it was already June, and the semester seemed to have just started yesterday, and next year they would be high school students. The girl also couldn't calm down about the fact that Jin had become taller than the guys from the 4th grade, and Hyuk's friends also chimed in that the guy had gained weight during the winter holidays and asked him to tell a secret. Hyuk froze with chopsticks in his mouth and did not react to any of his friends, even though they had called him several times already. Only when Mi-kyung loudly called the guy's name and did it almost right into his ear did he unfreeze, but at the same time became scared. Mi angrily asked what was wrong with Jin, as if he was flying somewhere in the clouds all day. The boy didn't lose his head and asked if his friend had really sacrificed her holiday diary in order to learn to read minds, which is why Mi ate a spoon, asking what he was even talking about, hinting that he would get a punch in the forehead if he gave her away. The guys still supported me by asking their friend why he was acting strangely today, and if something had happened, and Hyuk hesitated a little before answering. The boy was worried from the very morning because his mother dropped a saucepan in the kitchen and grabbed her stomach, which made him very scared. Mom assured her son that she was okay, but Jin tried to say that maybe they should go to the hospital after all. After stroking the boy's head, the mother said that there was nothing to worry about, it was just the baby showing that she would soon be born. The guy got up from the table thinking that his mother had answered him very carelessly and had still decided to give birth at home, but it would have been better in the hospital if something suddenly went wrong. While his friends were still going over the options for why Hyuk was growing so quickly, and one of them was that he never left his plate empty, the young man himself was thinking about how life in the village sometimes felt limited. Mi-kyung thought about the option of eating the food to the end, but suggested that it could also be because Jin's mother adds something special to the food. Suddenly, after what Mi said, Hyuk sharply pointed his finger at her, as if confirming the words about special in the food. But the guys froze, not understanding what their friend wanted to show them with this sign. Jin came home and told his mother right from the door that it was terribly hot outside, so it would be nice to cut up a watermelon. Heavy breathing was heard from the room, so the boy immediately realized what was happening and ran towards the sound. When Hyuk ran into the room, he saw his mother sitting on the floor and realized that everything had already begun. Jin bombarded his mother with questions about whether she had started having contractions, whether it was painful, and where her dad was, to which she weakly replied that Mi-kyung had gone to get her grandmother. Hyuk carefully helped his mother lie on her back and asked when exactly Mi left, and his mother said that she literally just now. Jin pulled himself together, forbidding himself to panic now, and put a pillow under his mother's back to make it easier to breathe. The boy noticed his mother's face after he put the pillow under her and realized that she felt better. Hyuk did everything quickly but carefully, and even now he rushed to the exit with a bang but told his mother that he would be right back. Mom was very weak, and it was already getting dark before her eyes, so even though she called her son and even reached out to him with her hand, he no longer heard. The genie knew that the woman in labor needed to be kept warm no matter how hot it was outside, so he lit a fire in the stove and heated some water. Mom was breathing heavily and sweating, no longer saying anything or moving but simply lying there. The guy remembered that it was necessary to sterilize the scissors for cutting the umbilical cord, and so he came into the room with a bowl of hot water and a towel, asking if Mom was feeling better. The poor guy froze in fear when he looked at his mother, and his nerves began to give way no matter how hard he tried to control himself. The son turned to his mother again, but it was clear that she was losing consciousness and her body was weakening. Hyuk rushed to his mother and began to shake her, trying to bring her to her senses, and called her, asking her to stay with him and not fall asleep. The word no was beating in the boy's head, pulsating louder and louder, and the fear of losing two loved ones again was taking over more and more. Mom looked at the bright light of the full moon, which was halfway below the horizon. The woman walked along the beach holding her stomach and was worried that she could not feel the baby, although she had been actively kicking before. Mom didn't understand what she was doing before she got to such a beautiful place, and looking around she tried to remember but thought that it was probably not that important. The woman approached the water, and the first wave had already touched her leg, but he continued to enter it. Being knee-deep in water, Mom thought that the water was calming and cool, which beckoned her to go deeper. When the woman walked further, she felt a barely perceptible touch on her hand and the distant voice of her son. Such a familiar feeling was stronger than the beckoning water, and Mom turned around to look at the one who called her. Instead of an empty sandy beach, there was a garden behind, and it was much more beautiful than the moon and water. The woman changed her mind about going into the water just as it was reaching out to her and didn't want to let go. Walking among the trees, the woman did not know where she was going but intuitively continued to move. In the distance, the mother saw her son calling her and waving his hand at her, inviting her to join him. The woman in labor looked at the light ahead, and the darkness gradually faded behind her. A larger figure appeared next to the son's silhouette and spoke in the voice of his opponent, who was also calling his beloved. The closer the woman got to the silhouettes, the heavier it became for her, but she was drawn to them more than to the water. Mom reached out with her hands to the hands that were reaching out to meet her and recognized her family in them and in their voices. After touching the hands, the woman opened her eyes and heard cries that she had finally woken up. Mom looked at her beloved men who were washing their faces with tears, so scared for her, and Grandma also immediately asked if everything was okay with her. The woman realized what had happened to her and how far she had almost gone, causing her eyes to widen. Mom started breathing heavily again and sat down because the labor was still going on, and Grandma yelled at the guys to get away because they were just making her head spin. The woman screamed loudly that it hurt, and the granny asked her to push and strain a little, but the guys stood and could only wait. Hyuk clenched his fists to hold on, but at the same time he anxiously asked his father if everything would be okay with his mother. Dad put his hand on his son's shoulder and said that his mother was a very strong woman and could handle it. All that the father asked was to simply continue to believe in her and wait, to which Jean courageously agreed. Hyuk began to repeat the word of prayer over and over again, a request to heaven and to any gods for his mother so that everything would be okay with her. Meanwhile, the mother, armed with a rag, clenched her teeth and did everything possible to ensure that neither she nor the baby would be sucked into any more water. Zangin's tail became a pistol when he heard a completely new cry in the evening from the owner's house. The dog immediately wagged his tail, realizing that he would now have to lick one more person. When the boys were able to go inside, the mother asked them to meet the baby and greet her. The girl didn't like something anymore, and she started to spin around, but Hyuk wasn't embarrassed at all, and he barely restrained himself from bursting into tears again. The father, seeing his granny off, bowed low to her and thanked her, saying that they were in her debt again, to which she laughed, not understanding what he was talking about. Granny told Dad that Jin Hyuk himself had prepared everything as she had taught him, so all that was left was a small matter, but Dad didn't quite understand what the midwife had just told him. Granny explained that one day Hyuk ran up to her with me after school, which was very unexpected. The boy asked to teach him what the most important thing is to do when his mother starts giving birth. And now, entering the room of the woman in labor, the grandmother continued to tell how she showed the boy step by step what to do, and when she arrived, everything was ready. The grandmother entered the room saying that she always knew how smart the boy was, but she didn't think he was that smart. Not only was the father shocked by what the grandmother said, and he was filled with pride for the kind of person he and his mother had raised, but he was also looking at his newborn daughter. Mom was resting, and next to her lay a wrapped-up baby next to whom sat Hyuk, and he turned around when he heard that someone entered the room and was glad to see Dad. Appa was also ready to cry from all those warm feelings that filled him while he was watching the people. Dad leaned over to his son and praised him for how well he had done adding to this basement from Grandma, to which Hyuk said that he had done nothing wrong and immediately asked if he and his mother had chosen a name for the baby. The father said that the girl will be called Eugene because they took one syllable from both the mother's name and Jin's name, so now the baby is Song Eugene. Hyuk softly repeated his little sister's name and raised his hand over her. The brother blocked the light that was too bright for his sister, after which she stopped wincing and calmed down, and Jean wished her to grow up strong and healthy. Jean imagined himself walking with the baby, and for now he promised to become a refuge for her like a calm tree that would protect her from life's hardships, and he hoped that Eugene would stand firmly on the ground, clinging to it with her roots so that no waves could sweep her away. Jin's father stood across from the field and listened to his friend discuss how crops and people have more in common than it seems, since both have an incubation period during an epidemic, so they were thinking about starting disinfection earlier. The man sighed heavily because of the heat and told Hyuk's dad that it wasn't that hot this year, but the water temperature should still be monitored, after which he mentioned an incident about 10 years ago. The cute guy who decided to water the rice with cold water in the heat was referring to Jin's dad, thinking that he was helping the crops because the rainy season was over. As a result, the rice developed blast which infected neighboring fields and almost destroyed the entire crop, which left the head of the company horrified. Hyun added that he still gets goosebumps every time he remembers that horrible story, which is why his friend asked him to stop because he realized his mistake back then. It didn't go without Hyun praising himself, clarifying that one kind person arrived in time and reduced the damage to a minimum, so no one ever found out who was guilty of spoiling the product, and the guy from Seoul was saved. Hyuk's father once again thanked Hyun for saving him, and he laughed, saying that he was joking, and said that it was time for them to go home, and just at that moment Jean called him. The boy was carrying a basket of berries, which made poor Jangun drool again, and Hyuk asked if the men had been to the rice fields. Dad confirmed his son's guess, and in response also asked how he spent his time on the mountain, to which he said that he and Mi Kyung picked berries, although she ate more than she picked. The father found it funny how cunningly his son's friend acted, and he asked that now they could go home, to which Hyuk happily agreed. The guys smiled at each other. Both of them were planning something, but they didn't reveal their plans. And indeed, the next moment Dad rushed forward like a bullet, and Jean didn't even have time to understand anything, so he froze in place. Jean shouted at his father that it was unfair, while he shouted back that he had summer vacation and could spend a lot of time with Eugene, and his dad was working, but the boy shouted again that he hadn't seen her today either since he was on the mountain. Hyun was left behind frozen with his index finger pointed towards the guys trying to say goodbye, but they ran away so that their heels sparkled, and only Zangin remained next to him. Little Eugene grew up very quickly, and she was already interested in everything, and she was especially amused by the way her brother communicated with her. Hyuk was fascinated by the little one and spent time with her at every opportunity. Jean was upset that he lost to his father because he was taller and ran faster, but at the same time he understood that Eugene would not become less cute from this, and his mother persuaded her son that now he would be able to be with her. The young man took his sister's little foot in his hand, surprised at how tiny she was, comparing her to a little fairy. Jean suddenly got the idea to ask his mom and dad if they had any ink to smear on his sister's feet and make prints. The brother and sister could not yet communicate, but their looks spoke of their great love for each other. Hyuk asked the little girl to grow up healthy, and he, as an older brother, would earn money for everything she wanted. The boy had a more cunning plan, where he jokingly thought that if he didn't earn money, he would quietly sell a piece of his father's land, and then he was overcome by the memory of that monster. The guy saw with horror before his eyes a picture of how that freak sold everything that his father could buy at a negligible price and spent the money on drinking and gambling. The scary thing was that during the explosion of development on the West Coast, land prices also skyrocketed, causing the bastard to take his anger out on the boy. The bastard, being out of his mind, even managed to accuse Hyuk of deliberately remaining silent and not talking about the rise in prices. Jean automatically tensed up like a taut string from the mere thought that he wouldn't just let go of the way his uncle was behaving. Even though Eugene was very little, she noticed that something was wrong with her brother and even stopped smiling. Hyuk immediately apologized to the little girl for letting her see his pathetic side that gives in to emotions. The boy heard the distant voices of his mom and dad and immediately switched to the fact that now he didn't need to rely on his uncle and aunt. Eugene took her brother's finger, which gave him a new feeling that besides his parents he now had another most important person in his life for whom he was ready to do anything. Jean was a little caught up with the fact that not all of his connections from his past life had carried over into this one, especially with Representative Hong and his daughter Hong Soo-young. Curiosity captured the guy's attention, and he began to calculate that Soo-young was 5 years younger than him, which meant that she was now 5 and lived in Seoul. Hyuk convinced himself that it wasn't so important whether he would find a girl this time, although he himself became sad because it was impossible to meet someone like the future executive director. The boy had a picture in his head of the statue in front of the Jaguar Sikh group where he worked, and he remembered the title that Hong Soo-young was given when she came to train to be the successor to the chairman. Jean also remembers how Soo conquered the business world with her ruthless efficiency, sharp mind, and relentless drive. Hyuk saw not just a woman but a person with a cold and calculating look who was rushing towards the finish line. line. The most interesting thing was that Jean knew Sue from another side that was known only to people close to her. The guy remembered how the poor thing would sit up late at night over papers almost exhausted, and by doing so she showed that she was alive. Jean waited faithfully for his colleague and helped her when necessary, observing the manifestation of her warmth and humanity. For Hyuk, the CEO was a truly outstanding person full of energy. Jean remembered now that he was surprised by how he saw Sue's charming side on that last night when she got drunk and called him Appa. The boy, having captured his last memory in the bar with Sue, realized that now no one would remember how they had once been partners. Just when Hyuk finished digging through his memory, his mother called him into the kitchen to eat some fruit, and he said that he would come right away. The kitchen was filled with fresh aromas that deliciously and sweetly intertwined with each other, because on the table there was a watermelon, peaches, and berries picked by the boy. Jean went into the kitchen with the baby, and Dad was about to take the treasure for himself, but the guy immediately asked if he had washed his hands, and he himself continued to think about whether the price for creating new connections and returning to the past was really giving up the old. The father sat and looked sadly at his hands because he could not touch his daughter, to which his beloved told him to eat and wash his hands and then hold the baby as much as he wanted. Hyuk enjoyed fresh fruits with his family, never regretting that his career and success now meant nothing. And yet the last faces the boy saw before his death haunted him. Jean imagined what would happen if he did meet someone from his past life and how it would be. But the most important thing that interested the boy was whether it was strange to admit that he would still like to see Sue again. Meanwhile, the young couple stopped at the shore to rest from the road, and the wife, returning, asked her husband, with whom he had already managed to talk, to which she heard about the secretary. The woman didn't like that the work conversation took place during her vacation, but the man assured her that he had asked his assistant to look at a plot of land for a corporate event and that he had already found a couple of good options on the West Coast. Still looking dissatisfied, his wife supported him by saying that a vacation by the sea sounds amazing because such an environment will increase productivity, and the husband was very happy about this because he and his mistress Yusei are on the same wavelength. The woman was surprised when she heard that it was time for them to leave and asked again just in case if it would be now. The husband twirled the car key on his finger, confirming that they were indeed leaving right this minute. Jean filled out his diary and mentally thanked his sister for the fact that at least he had something to write about because last winter was boring. The boy racked his brains over his diary in the winter and even wrote there about the importance of voting rights during the upcoming elections, which was not the best idea for a 10-year-old. Because of his partially adult brain, Hyuk got into trouble with his teacher because he thought his parents were writing instead of him, which is why Mi-kyung also got into trouble. Jean collapsed on a mattress outside, remembering how he filled out his friend's diary with his left hand so that the teacher wouldn't guess, but it was useless, and then he realized that pretending to be a carefree student was very difficult. The guy suddenly heard that someone drove up to their fence in a car, but no one told him anything about the guests. Hyuk was like someone had dipped him into an ice hole when he realized that at that time his uncle had come for him. Jan-gun was also not delighted with the sudden guests, so his fur stood on end and he growled. Jean stood next to his friend and had a pencil in his hands, but no one had yet gotten out of the imported car. The boy ran closer to see what kind of car it was, and from the badge he immediately realized that it wasn't his uncle. Meanwhile, the couple who were walking on the beach had already gotten out of the car and urgently went to look at the area. The stranger, without a twinge of conscience, entered the yard, greeting the boy as if they had known each other for ages, and asked if this was his house, to which poor Hyuk could not even really say anything. The man came close to the boy and asked directly if his father was at home, but Jean could not give an answer to this either. Hyuk was stunned by the fact that in front of him stood none other than Chairman Hong Ki-jun, only very young and without a mustache. The boy staggered back from such a meeting, and he finally stuttered and answered that his father was currently in the fields, and Mr. Hong immediately asked when he would return, to which Hyuk explained that such work lasted until sunset. At this point, Chairman Yusei intervened in the conversation, noting how the young man was already fluent in speech and didn't even have a dialect. While the woman was also approaching Jean, he immediately realized that if these two were here, then somewhere there must be the one he had recently been remembering, and the girl immediately appeared on the threshold in search of her mother. Hong Soo-jong had already noticed the dog and ran towards Jan-gun, screaming, wanting to hug the furry thing to death. Mr. Hong stopped in front of his daughter, asking if she wanted to play with the puppy, and Hyuk was still wondering what kind of wind had brought these people to the village. The guy would have continued to stand there like a statue if he hadn't heard from Mrs. Yu that the child couldn't be alone at home, and that his mother should clearly be there, after which she headed towards the entrance. Jean suddenly appeared in front of the woman like lightning and blocked her way, asking her not to rush in but to wait and listen. The boy explained how it was that entering the house was prohibited because his mother had just recently given birth and was still recovering. Mrs. Yu laughed with emotion at how smart the young man was, but this did not make him calmer. The woman met Hyuk's gaze, clarifying that she was not a bad aunt and just wanted to say hello to his mother, so she asked him to step aside. Ms. Yu and Jean were distracted by the younger one's scream for the dog to let her go, and they both turned to her at the same time. Zangin grabbed the girl's dress, and the mother was already rushing to her child, shouting if everything was okay with her. The furry friend immediately hid behind his owner, and while Soo-young was crying because she was scared, Hyuk understood why everything happened. Jean turned his attention to the plant, and then looked at Zangin, who felt terrible for having offended the child, but hoped for understanding from the owner, and this happened. Hyuk sat down by the grass and pointed his finger there, attracting the attention of both the adults and the girl. The boy even took one stem in his hand and showed the little girl up close what sharp thorns it had, explaining that the dog had pulled her by the dress so that she did not get hurt by the plant. The girl was still crying, but was already listening attentively to the boy, realizing that the dog wanted to protect her. While the parents stood in shock at how such a young guy resolved the situation, Jean tore off one of the little girl's stems, and she even asked if she could touch it, to which he agreed but asked to be careful. Because of the noise that was happening in the yard, the mother looked out herself, asking her son if someone had come to them. The woman saw the answer to her question, and without the help of her son, only now the next one followed. Who are these guests? Jean sat with baby Eugene in his arms, and Soo-jong couldn't stop admiring her and repeated over and over that she was a little child. The children stayed together in the room and even had snacks and drinks made for them, and Hyuk introduced Soo to his sister Song Eugene, and the girl said that she was very cute. Soo, due to her age, tried to draw the little girl into a conversation by repeating her name and the name of her sister Hyuk like a parrot. The next moment, Soo pointed her finger at Jean, indicating that she wanted to know his name as well. But when Hyuk said his name, the girl screamed, "What the hell is this song prison term?" And all because the name Jean Hyuk in Korean sounds similar to the phrase prison term. The guy felt uneasy, and the only thing that worried him now was what the hell was going on here. All that mom said when she brought a table with food and drink was that the adults needed to talk separately and asked them to wait in the room. So finding himself in his room with two little ones, the boy looked at the door and wondered what the guests and their mother would talk about. Judging by the silence, the conversation was going smoothly and calmly, but this did not help the guy calm down and understand why Chairman Hong needed his father. Remembering his past life, Jean never once caught a moment when his father and this man were somehow connected. Suddenly something cool pressed against Hyuk's cheek, and when he turned his attention, he saw that it was Soo poking a treat that his mother had made into his face. The girl called the boy Appa, asking him to look at the rabbit in his hand, and this cherished word made her heart flutter, since it was Soo who last called him that when she was drunk. The poor guy even got nervous and reached out for the treat very hesitantly. Hyuk thought that these rabbits were probably made from the apples that Yusei Ra brought, and he was even more surprised that the heiress of the owner of a large company had such carefree days. And if the guy had ever shown this girl to someone and said that the workers would tremble with fear, then hardly anyone would have believed him. Hyuk looked at the apple slice that Soo-young gave him with some tenderness and joy, and thought that he had just recently said goodbye to the possibility of meeting a familiar face from his past life, and here she was in front of him. Finally, the doors quietly opened, and the mother asked her son if he was bored here, to which the boy immediately made it clear by asking if the adults had finished talking, that he had really been waiting for a long time. Mom said that she and the guests had talked about everything and asked if he wanted to go to see Dad and Mr. Hong. Jean grabbed his sister and asked why him, to which his mother said that she needed to sit with the baby. Now Jean was riding with Soo in the back seat of a premium car, and they apologized to him for the trouble and also asked if they should turn on the air conditioner, to which he timidly agreed and thanked him. Chairman Hong once again asked the boy's full name and then thanked him for his sensitivity and for sitting with his daughter. Hyuk was more interested in whether the man had come to look at his father's plot, to which he said that this was indeed the case, since they were planning to build a recreation center nearby for their company. What Jean remembered about the resting place and what he was told now no longer matched, so he was alarmed by the situation. The boy remembered that the Sikh Heavy Industries Recreation Center was supposed to be near the beach, but in a different place. Hyuk remembered that the center was originally planned to be built on the west coast, and based on this, he asked the chairman if there were any better options. Mr. Hong briefly replied that at the moment the land here is cheap, and Jin's questions disappeared. The next thing that surprised the boy was that the chairman was driving personally, although as far as he remembered, the man rode behind and had a personal chauffeur. Hyuk immediately thought about the last incident and came to the conclusion that the accident was most likely serious, but he hoped that the man was not hurt. The guy remembered the moment when Mr. Hong took him by the hand and started saying something about his daughter, but it was impossible to hear what exactly. Jean looked at little Soo, who also couldn't take her eyes off him, and thought that perhaps he had wanted to say something to his father about marriage, and immediately decided that now he would never know, so it didn't matter anymore. Hong had the opportunity to observe the children and noticed how the boy behaved with his daughter, which spoke of the thoughts that were laid down for the future. Jean only just thought that it was no longer important. Jean's dad just straightened up to rest his back a little and wiped the sweat from his face, noticing the car in such a remote place. The chairman, getting out of the car, immediately told Hyuk's father that he thought he had died a long time ago in this village, since they had not seen each other for 100 years. For some reason, Jin's dad wanted to blurt out something like little shit, but Hong cut him off, noting that he wouldn't have thought that the guy would hide in such a place. Hyuk stood like a pillar, not understanding absolutely anything, but he had already put his hand up to protect little Soo, and she herself grabbed the guy's clothes, as if they had known each other for a long time and she trusted him. Jean began to worry that the atmosphere was very tense while remembering that Hong was going to look at the site. The boy was shocked by how angry his father was, because he had never seen him like this before, and because of this he didn't know whether to interfere or not. Hong moved towards Papa Hyuk just as he spoke to him, but it was too late. The chairman quickly made his way through the thick rice that rustled against his feet and grabbed Father Jean by the shoulders. Hugging the man, Hong shouted in a friendly manner that Song Guangyun was an asshole because it was clear that he would not disappear, and he began to shout how the asshole found this place, and the chairman, almost crying with happiness, explained that if a genius is not in the know, then there are many ways to find a person. For the poor guy, the situation was so confusing, and he wanted to protect Sue and find out what Dad and Hong had in common, but he couldn't protect the little girl because she had learned a new word for herself. Bastard, and the men weren't going to fight. Already in the evening, two families were sitting in the courtyard in front of the house chatting and eating delicious food, but at the same time Guan admitted that although the place was modest, he would be glad if guests stayed overnight, to which Hong laughingly replied that if necessary he would sleep outside. Guan didn't forget about Say-Ra either, mentioning that they hadn't seen each other for a long time either, and now it turns out that she needs to be called Su Young's mother, to which she didn't get flustered and replied that time had flown by so quickly that the guy already looked like an old man. Yun was shocked that he was called an old man, but Say laughed and explained to Hyuk's mother that he introduced her to Su Young's dad, and before that they grew up like brother and sister. The woman confirmed that she had indeed heard about this, and even more she knew from her opponent that he had close people who were more important to him than life. While Mom was saying that she never even thought that she would meet someone so important to Appa Hyuk was feeding baby Sue. Jean caught on and took note of the fact that his father turned out to be close friends with Chairman Ji-Jun, and Mrs. Say-Ra was like a sister to him. Watching the communication of adults who were happy like children, the boy decided that he was now much more interested in his father's past than in his own time travel. Father laughed like never before, and Jean remembered how no one else came to his funeral except the villagers, and no one came to the holidays either, including any relatives. Sitting in such a cheerful company, Jean rethought the fact that his parents had friends, and now perhaps he would even find out about some relatives, and it turns out that the future was changing before his eyes. Yong poured his friend some soju, asking him again if he understood correctly that he was planning to build a training center. Hong confirmed that everything was as his friend asked and explained that the company had grown and now they had many employees. Ji-Jun said that at the moment not many companies invest in improving personnel through training, but they want to start creating a training system now, and Yun praised the one who thought of this. Guang shared his opinion that the future will be shaped by young talents, which is the best way to ensure the company's prosperity, and Hong confirmed that Say-Ra advocated this idea to her father-in-law. The men looked at how the women were also animatedly discussing something, and Hong added on this basis that after Say-Ra studied abroad, her perception of the world had completely changed. Appa admitted that what kind of wife he now has is truly worthy of admiration, but in order not to spread vanilla, he switched to a joke about how funny it is that country bumpkins have such breakthrough thinking, and Yun reminded that he is one of those who gets tired of disputes about inheritance. Hyuk didn't pay attention to how much Sue was violating his personal boundaries because he was engrossed in the adults' conversation, and in addition he was surprised that his dad started talking about inheritance, which was unusual. The guy remembered how he was sorting through documents and found his dad's diploma, and as it turned out they studied for the same specialty at the Faculty of Business Administration, from which he concluded that his dad was probably disappointed in the Korean corporate structure. Su Zhong, without any embarrassment, fell on the boy like on a sofa, breathing heavily, from which he asked her if she was really full, and the girl plaintively said that she was not just full but overeaten. Jean decided to give the baby advice that if she falls asleep right after eating she will become a cow, but Sue was already falling asleep and was not against becoming a cute cow. No matter how serious Hyuk was, he only needed to look at Sue and he would immediately melt, even though he still called her a wretch in his thoughts. The girl was already fast asleep, but Jean still couldn't find any differences between her appearance now and when she was drunk. Yong told his friend that he would not sell the plot, and even if he did it would not be now, and this amused Ji-Jun, so he immediately said that he remembered very well how stubborn the guy was, so he would not even try to convince him. Hyuk tried again to connect what he remembered with what he was listening to now, and other than the fact that in his past life a talent development center was built near another city by the sea, nothing else came to mind yet. The only assumption the guy made was that if the chairman had come to this house the last time, then at that moment the house had already been abandoned. Jean watched as Hong tried to persuade his father to sell at least a piece of land, but he resisted. The men laughed again like little children, and Hyuk understood from their light conversation that the land was most likely just an excuse and nothing more. Besides, Soo-young, the boy, was also under pressure from his father not to cave in, so he mentally asked him not to sell the plot for any amount of money because in a couple of years its price would skyrocket to 500,000 won per penny. Ji-Jun decided to ask Yun what was so special about the plot, considering that you can't really plant anything on it, and he answered as is that it's cheap, and at that moment Hyuk saw the light of how boldly his father answered. Yong explained that people will do anything, even use government subsidies to have expensive farm equipment. And it would seem that people want convenience while working, but in fact greed was behind it. Yong added that it was enough to borrow from someone or share, to which Ji-Jun asked it turns out that his friend spent the money for equipment to buy land. Yong tried to explain it so that it would be understandable and said that if the harvest was collected a day or two later nothing would happen. Appa also added that in farming time is not the most important thing, but the harvest is more valuable, and Jun chimed in that growing something in short supply is a smart move, and Hyuk watched as the men threw ideas back and forth like they were in a good game of some kind. Young mentioned that people plant the same thing every year, and as a result the prices for vegetables fall and you can't sell what you put so much work into. June approved of the fact that the ability to predict market trends was more important than producing and selling goods. Hyuk stared at the chairman after his last words because he once said the same thing during a lecture in the marketing strategy department. The boy smiled, thinking that it was not for nothing that there was a saying that people were like birds of a feather, because both his father and Hong thought the same way even when it came to business. June wanted to take the treat again but didn't notice how he ate it all, and Young said that he would bring more, leaving his friend and son alone. Hyuk again heard the chairman ask him about his name, and now he also asked him about his age, to which he said that he was 10. June laughed that there was a 5-year difference between the guy and his daughter, and then asked if he was tired of competing with the little one all day, but he said that everything was fine. Hong looked at his sleeping daughter and thought out loud that she was usually very capricious, but today she was not herself, leaned against a stranger to her and fell asleep. The chairman was obviously already a little tipsy because he asked the guy if he wanted to take his daughter as his wife, to which Hyuk immediately replied no. Uncle Hong reached out to Jean and ruffled his hair, laughing so much that he didn't even have a second to doubt it. Suddenly June asked that very sharp question that cut the ear before Hyuk's death. Because the boy's gaze changed abruptly, Hong didn't quite understand the reaction to his question, and Jean hesitated to answer. Appa arrived in time, answering instead of his son that he was smart and would succeed in any endeavor, to which drunk Hong could not believe that a genius father thought that his son was also a genius, but Yun said that he was even sure that the boy was smarter than him. Hyuk felt that the chairman had caught him off guard because he had let his guard down when talking about Hong Soo-young. June looked at the plate with the snack and asked with displeasure if there was really no more octopus, to which he heard that the last one had been carried out of the house. Jean again played Hong's question about the dream in his head, and leaning on Sue's head, he began to think about the answer, but sleep turned out to be faster. Mom noticed that it was time for the children to go into the house, especially when she came up and saw that even Hyuk had already fallen asleep, while Sayara was holding the long-sleeping Eugene in her arms. Friends from a past life slept soundly together, and even in a dream Jean fell asleep in such a way as to protect his friend, which only made the adults feel touched. The fathers took the children in their arms and laughed along with the women at how funny they were, especially with Soo-young, who surprisingly quickly fell asleep, and everyone laughed even more when they joked that she had been busy all day running after Hyuk. In the morning, instead of a rooster, the whole village could hear Sue's roar, with 2 huge streams of tears flowing from her eyes. The girl sat down on the ground and cried, demanding that she didn't want to leave but wanted to stay with Jean, Hyuk, Appa. Mom suggested that the girl count to 10 together and leave, but this only made things worse. Hyuk sighed heavily and put his hand to his head, showing with his whole appearance that they couldn't cope without him again. Jean sat down next to the little girl and explained that Appa would still have to go to school every day, so he suggested coming when he had a vacation. The girl looked at the boy with huge tear-stained eyes and still agreed to his proposal. At the end, Sue grabbed Hyuk, trying to hug him, and Hong laughingly said that he would come often, to which she heard from her friend that it was in vain because farmers are busy people, which is why he completely exploded with laughter, calling his friend untouchable. Mom also shed a few tears when she gave Ra's pet Gojujang away with her, to which she asked her not to be upset because they would really be visiting them from time to time. The car drove away from the gate, and a tearful Sue immediately climbed out of the window, waving her hand to Appa, Hyuk, and shouting that they would see each other soon. The whole family waved back, smiling, either because they finally had a good time for the first time in a long time, or because they had sent the noisy family away. Suddenly, the boy heard his dad ask him what he wanted to be when he grew up, which left him stumped. Hyuk didn't understand the question, to which his father mentioned that sharp-tongued uncle had asked him the same thing yesterday, but his father was no less interested than Hong. Jean couldn't even get a couple of words out of himself any longer, but his father explained again that he had enough money, and that no matter what his son wanted to do, he would gladly support him if he just said so. The guy looked at his dad, realizing that he still needed to answer something, but for this he needed literally a little more time. Looking somewhere far ahead of him, Jean stood and waited for the answer to emerge, while various summer smells reached his nose and the wind ruffled his hair. In the end, Jean, without changing himself, gave an honest answer to his father, and at the same time to Hong with his question from yesterday about his dream that he would like to live an ordinary life. The father placed a friendly hand on his son's shoulder, noting that he had chosen the hardest path of all possible, but at the same time did not say anything against it. The parents enjoyed the fruits while Hyuk was getting a personal cheek massage that he didn't even order. The Hong family came to visit again, but this time they were already inside and chatting together, sitting in a circle, where Sayara was happy to hold baby Eugene in her arms while her mother shared red chili powder with her. Soo-young couldn't stop playing with Jin's cheeks, no matter how much he begged her not to pinch him, but for the girl, they were 2 soft toys. Hyuk was finally able to rest a little and thought that he had not expected the Hong family to arrive so soon. As it turned out, the guys were serious when they said that they would come often, so the gates that were previously silent now began to open actively. It was nice that the family came with fruit, but Young was shocked that they agreed to travel so far just to watch TV. Hyuk's mother excitedly asked Razuni if she was in pain, and she replied that her body was simply stiff from the long trip. Mom sympathized with the Hong family, understanding that it was clearly difficult for them to travel from Seoul itself since the roads here are not the best, which Ji Jun agreed with. Suddenly Soo-young shouted for everyone to look forward and pointed her finger where exactly, so everyone immediately turned around. Hyuk remembered that today was the opening of the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul. The host announced the opening of the 24th Games, after which parachutists descended from the plane, creating a sign of the event. Everyone watched the professionals maneuver attentively, and only Hyuk's mother covered her mouth, frightened by such a height and worrying out loud how these people weren't afraid. The father asked his son whether Card Lewis or Ben Johnson would win, and then Jean had to pretend for a bit that he was only guessing that it would be Carl since he had better records. Young thought on the contrary, reflecting on the fact that this time Johnson had a chance and offered his son a bet. The father suggested that he would bet on Johnson and Huck on Carl, and the loser would clean all the pots, which is why the little one turned a little green, remembering the last incident with the pot. The guy faced a difficult choice because on the one hand he was in the past and knew who would win, but on the other hand no one said that everything could change and he didn't want to clean the pots. Jean asked his dad if he would regret his choice later, and he jokingly said that if he asked him to have mercy on the boy he would not change his mind. Imagine the surprise of all the adults when the boy won simply because the result was the same as in his previous life. And so the son sat next to his father, who was forced to scrub all the pots but did not gloat about it. Hyuk even offered to help his dad, but he refused, saying that he could accept the consequences of his defeat. The son was amused by the fact that it was interesting with his dad and that he acted like a real man, although it was obvious that it was hard for him. Jean felt more and more that the loneliness and melancholy in his past life was being rewarded in this incarnation with joy and happiness. After another run, Hyuk stood at a huge house, and it seemed that the village had turned into a different place to live. The boy looked at the giant with his brain, understanding that this is what his house now looked like, but he was still surprised every time by how it had changed. Last winter, the Sun family transformed their modest farm into a 3-story giant, all thanks to their father's ability to anticipate demand for crops and sell the harvest door to door at good prices. Jan Gun collapsed tiredly into his kennel, while his owner climbed the steps to his new home. As always, taking off his shoes in the hallway, the boy informed his family that he had returned, as he always did. Hyuk clearly heard neither his mother's nor his father's voice, which stated that he thought he was lost because the walls were completely different. Jean looked at the floor and realized that the Hong family was home again, while his father explained that it was his son who suggested making the walls out of lus because it was healthier. The young man went further into the house, and in order to make sure that there were guests, asked his mother if he was imagining things. But the answer for him was Soo-young, who was literally stunning this time, and the guy couldn't do anything about it. Mom finally came out into the hallway looking at her son on the floor, saying that there was Hyuk, and Ra asked if the guy had really run again, but he couldn't speak. Sue covered her nose, saying funny that she didn't know about the boys' training, and the mother, laughing with both of them, realized that her son was probably hungry, so she would make rice cakes and asked the girl if she would have some, to which the little girl agreed, but Ra asked to add thank you. Hyuk barely recovered and stood up quietly, telling his mother that he was going to take a shower, and she smiled. This time the rice cakes were eaten by mothers and their children, and it finally went smoothly for Jean. The children ran out into the street holding hands, and Hyuk said that he was taking Sue for a walk, to which he heard the standard "don't be bored and be careful." Sue happily asked Appa to take her to the beach to talk to the crabs, and Hyuk was hit with a wave of deja vu again. Jean was surprised when he saw someone else on the beach, but Sue had already run forward, letting go of his hand. It turned out that there were friends of the boy on the beach who armed themselves with overalls and gloves to catch crabs, and one of the guys told everyone that Hyuk had arrived with the baby. Sue proudly put her hands on her hips and declared that she was not a baby, but Hong Soo-young, and the guy immediately asked for forgiveness. The new arrivals were given gloves, and the friends spent their time much more cheerfully because they had a person with them who was even more interested in searching for something than their older friends. Mi-kyung found a crab and showed everyone how it danced on her hand, which amused the guys. Hyuk found a crab for Sue, which she looked at as if there was treasure in front of her, and the guys behind her tried to separate their friend and the crab. The picture from the past life repeated itself exactly at the moment when Hyuk carried Sue on his back, and she incessantly told him how she would go to school next year and how much work there would be to do. The girl did not understand how it would be possible to keep a diary every day because it was boring, and she wanted to know if her opponent could do it, to which he admitted that he could not really because it was really not easy. For some reason, Sue decided to ask his opponent if he was worried about something because he looked exactly like that, but the guy said that he was only worried that he was slow when he accelerated. The next question reminded Hyuk of their last meeting at the bar because the girl had asked exactly the same question. Did he really like running so much? Jean answered briefly yes, but it sounded like there was something else behind it because he was very thoughtful due to the memories. To finish the guy off completely, the little girl asked if he liked her more than jogging, which made the poor guy even flinch and immediately ask who taught her this, to which his mother responded. Hyuk was tired, and hearing his name in his mother's voice was a salvation for him. The girl started screaming at the top of her lungs that her mother and aunt were standing in front of her, and the women smiled at her in response. Approaching his mother, the guy thought that what was happening to him was one of the joys of ordinary life. But despite all the pleasant moments, the young man did not forget that ordinary life has its disadvantages in addition to its advantages, and this happened after the guys at school talked about the fact that Eugene was already 2 years old and she could talk. Mi Kyung suggested that they gather at Hyuk's to do group homework and asked what Song Chan thought about it, but he was like a lost cause. The guy didn't respond to his friend's requests until the lunchbox with food opened, and then the poor guy jumped up from the table scaring the guys. Mi Kyung didn't understand what was happening, and Chan, without even explaining anything, simply turned his head showing that nothing was happening and at the same time asked Hyuk for a few words. The young man began to whisper something in his friend's ear, and this made me very angry because he thought that she was being ignored. The more Chan told Hyuk the situation, the more his eyes widened, revealing obvious fear. Now the two of them looked frightened, and Jin began to list absolutely all the gods he knew and pray to them that they did not test him so cruelly. The top secret and scary conversation was the scary story about the pork chop that only goes around among boys, so Mi Kyung couldn't listen to it. The gist of the story was that my father casually suggested going out for a pork chop with him, and how could I refuse? But in the end it turns out that you come not to a restaurant, but to a hospital where a scary doctor chains you to a couch, and that's it. Hyuk learned that Jin Soo was the first person in his class to undergo circumcision. Because of his experience, the boy received the attention of all his classmates who were curious to know everything about it. After the incident with Jin Soo, rumors spread like wildfire, and now even lunch in the cafeteria couldn't go smoothly, and naturally Hyuk wasn't going to go through such humiliation at his age. Mi Kyung didn't understand what was happening to the boys, so to her they looked like savages, and even Jin, who was now sitting next to her and thinking about how to protect himself, looked strange to her. Trouble came from where it was least expected, and one evening the boy heard his father suggest that he go with him to eat pork chops. Hyuk was playing with his little sister, and at first he didn't even understand whether he had misheard or not that his father had committed such a crime. Dad was telling me that they hadn't gone anywhere together for a long time, so he suggested eating hot chops, and also added that Eugene needed to buy clothes on the way home, but in the guy's head that same terrible combination sounded. The father smiled at the boy, thinking that everything would go smoothly now, but it was not so. Hyuk already saw himself on the couch and shouted that there was no way in hell they would treat him to cutlets. In order not to be too obvious, the boy stood up, although his sister was reaching out to him and calling her Appa, but he no longer responded to either his parents or the little girl, so the self-defense program was turned on. Jin gradually backed away, denying that he really didn't want it, and his father approached asking if he had really stopped liking chops, which looked very creepy knowing what was behind it. Mom kept telling her son to go and spend time with his dad, but as soon as he felt the opportunity to run away, he shouted that he hated chops and ran away at supersonic speed. It was already cold outside, and the guy ran out without a jacket, but as always he was accompanied by his faithful friend. Hyuk heard someone calling him and picked up speed, but he thought the voice wasn't his parents, so he risked turning around as he went. As it turned out, Yuk Sung Chan was running after him, equally horrified by what was happening, and on the way he told him that his father had also suddenly offered him some chops, after which he went on the run. The first thing Hyuk thought was that at this rate he needed to find a new shelter, and Chan suggested hiding at Jin Soo's. Hyuk understood why Chan suggested going to Jin Soo, because he already had this nightmare, and therefore there was a chance that he could hide them. The boys flinched when they heard the loud and angry voice of Chan's father calling the bastard home, and the guy immediately told him to run. Hyuk ran and thought that he could wash himself every day instead of experiencing this horror. The father ran after his son with a rope, frightening not only the boys but also everyone who could see them along the way. So under the evening sun, a line of father and two guys ran who really did not want to be humiliated, especially in winter. Poor Chan couldn't stand running for so long, so he tripped and fell, which allowed his father to catch up with him. Jin looked at this utter horror while Chan, like in the movie, shouted at him to run away from here as far as possible and save him and leave him. Hyuk now remembered his friend's words that a man should cry only 3 times in his entire life when he cuts onions and peels garlic. And the third time the man cried, Hyuk shouted that he wouldn't do it and ran away, although Chan's father told the boy to return home because his dad was looking for him. The man tied his son with a rope while shouting at Jin that he, such a bastard, should quickly go home, to which the boy mentally asked his uncle for forgiveness but did not return. Chan lay on the ground and cried for the 3rd time with a stingy man's tear, as he had bequeathed to his friend, knowing what awaited him tomorrow. The poor thing sat on the stone bank by the water and was shaking like an aspen leaf from the cold, and it was good that Zangan was nearby, although his teeth were chattering, and Hyuk even began to think that maybe it really was worth going home. The tired, frozen, and sleepy guy was already imagining the shame after the operation when the Hong family would arrive. For the young man, the chairman and his wife were not only now close but also management from the past, which was doubly shameful. The boy buried his face in the dog, not knowing what to do, because even if he hid with Jin Soo, his parents would call his parents. Jin heard his name being called in the distance, and his stomach suddenly became heavy with fear, because on the one hand it was salvation, and on the other hand it was a one-way ticket. The guy turned around at the sound of the voice and saw that his mother was looking for him and looked very bad, and he couldn't stand it anymore because he loved her very much. Mom took her clothes with her and called her son with all her might, and this reminded him of how he came to this same shore to save them. Hyuk stretched to his feet and decided that he would simply close his eyes and return to his family no matter what. The guy woke up and realized that he had done something disgusting by abandoning his family who truly cared about him. The father ran up to his mother and son while she was dressing him and said that he had seriously scared them, and they were very worried, but Jean had already come to terms with the fact that it wasn't so scary to go to the hospital as long as his parents didn't worry about him so much anymore. Dad continued to tell me that the night sea is dangerous, although my son already knew this, but Mom asked Appa to stop. Hyuk wrapped his nose in a scarf, remembering his friend's words about the 3 times a man should cry, and mentally asked Chan for forgiveness, because it turned out that they were crying together for the 3rd time. In the evening, the parents sat at the table with their son and laughed loudly at him while eating pork and saying that they still couldn't believe that he ran away precisely because of the doctor and that terrible story. The father got up and, in response to his son's suspicions about the cutlet, explained that the mother should have stayed home with the baby because it was very cold outside, so they would have gone together. Mom also picked up on it and said that if you take the chops with you, they will get cold, so Dad said that you should eat them in a restaurant, and now Hyuk started laughing, realizing that the Hong family would definitely laugh at him. Relaxed, Jean devoured the meat with gusto, and when he saw that his parents had gotten up from the table, he asked if they were already full, to which they replied that they had indeed already stuffed their bellies. The parents told their son that he could finish his portion if he wanted, and there was no need to ask him twice. Hyuk looked at the almost untouched plates of food and couldn't understand why Mom and Dad hadn't eaten. But the desire to eat more chops got the better of him, and even though they were already cold, the guy took both plates for himself. Jean ate without noticing that the room into which the parents entered together was not completely closed by the door. The parents watched their son very quietly, like a wild pig, from that same door that was not completely closed. Mom and Dad were discussing the fact that their son didn't seem to realize it because he was happily eating meat. Mom shared with Appa that usually in such situations Hyuk thinks quickly, and today he managed to get out of it, but how to deceive him next time. The boy licked his lips after emptying all the plates while his parents secretly came up with a new plan. On New Year's Eve, a neighbor came to the Song family's yard with a rooster and a chicken in his hands. Chan's father gave Yun a gift for the new one, and he, embarrassed, said that actually he was supposed to give them something. The man explained that the birds still seemed tiny, but if they were properly looked after they would grow to the size of a sea base, and Yong promised that he would take good care of the birds. Suddenly, the neighbor leaned over to Yun and asked how things were going with Hyuk, and he said that they were a little worried because the guy was such a neat freak. At that moment, Jean was sitting next to the porch but did not tell his father that he heard their entire supposedly quiet conversation. A week ago, the boy barely managed to convince his father at the last moment right before the hospital. Armed with his skills from his past life, Hyuk began to explain to his dad using diagrams and charts why he didn't need surgery, and he gave in from the overload of presentations, trainings, and group projects. The man announced the verdict that the boy could indeed do without surgery, and then Jin's skills as a regressor truly shone. Song Chan's father now loudly declared that the boy didn't have surgery only because they couldn't catch him, to which the Appa said that he wasn't that bad. Chairman Hong went outside in his pajamas after a shower, and with wet hair, admitting that it was so quiet in the village, and thinking about maybe moving here, to which Hyuk did not hesitate to ask if it seemed to the mister that they were already living here. Immediately after the guy's courage, he received a slap on the back of the head, and a reminder from Uncle Gi Jun that he was still the eldest here. Jean sat and wondered when Hong could have gotten the chairman's aura if he looked more like a loud guy from the neighborhood. The girls had already gotten so used to each other that they slept together and no one felt cramped or uncomfortable. The men were trying to build some kind of chicken coop, and Hyuk was hanging around with them but mostly watching the birds. The rooster seemed to the guy to be larger in size than the others he had seen, and its character was downright menacing. Jean decided to test his theory in the most courageous but stupid way, and taking a stick in his hands, reached for the bird with it. The way the feathered one turned around looked more like a ninja, who immediately rushed towards the guy and screamed at the top of his lungs. Hyuk fell to the ground from such an unexpected attack from the bird, but it didn't end there. The guy saw the famous sprinter in the bird and named him Louis the Rooster. Now Jean faced the rather risky task of finding out how fast the rooster was. The boy threw a small stone at the bird, but it quickly dodged, and for him this was a reason to think about the usefulness of the rooster. Hyuk was too early to rejoice that the bird could be quite suitable with its speed for sprint training, because the next moment this murderous machine could no longer be stopped, and the training began immediately. The rooster, without thinking twice, began to teach the boy a lesson on how to respect him, and did this by hardening him with pain at the softest point. Hong immediately began to shift so that he could barely stand on his feet, and Yun was still trying to stay on, although it was difficult. A sleepy Soo-young appeared at the door, immediately asking where her beloved Appa had gone, although she hadn't really opened her eyes yet. The girl couldn't understand what was happening because Jean froze in place, and next to him was a rooster, and her dad was hitting the ground with his fist and laughing so hard that tears were flowing, while Hyuk's father leaned on a stick and also laughed. But everything faded and faded into the background when Soo-young woke up a little and saw the bird calling it a chicken. Now it was the rooster's turn to run away from the slow but annoying sprinter. Hyuk looked vengefully at the unfortunate bird and asked his father if they could buy more roosters, to which he, no longer able to laugh, caught his breath and agreed with his son. When everyone woke up and ate, they got together and went to the ice, and the mothers immediately asked the men if ice fishing was done in the fall, and they heard about some species of fish that hibernate and can still be caught. Sue happily stepped onto the ice and started jumping, asking Appa to watch her as she tested the hardness of the ice, but Hyuk warned her that she should still be careful because in that case she could fall awkwardly and hurt her tailbone. Say-ra even took a camera to capture their vacation together and told the men loudly to catch a lot of fish because gobies are good for your health, and Eugene picked up on this by repeating the word a lot. The fathers were grateful to Jin Hyuk for being able to catch so many char, but the boy turned his attention to something else. Hyuk noticed a group of people on the ice in the distance, and they immediately alerted him. The boy began to take a closer look at the strangers, noticing that they did not look like locals, but the most incomprehensible thing was why they attracted his attention. The father noticed the way his son was looking at the men and explained that these people were working near his rice field. Jin still didn't understand why someone showed up uninvited, considering that the farming season was closed, to which Dad also found an answer and said that these people also wanted to have fun. Dad also added that as long as strangers don't harm them, they can share and coexist. The father put his hand on his son's shoulder, stating the most important thing. Even if they call him a wimp, he would like to live happily and not waste time on tactless people. This time it was Yun who got the slap on the back of the head, and at the same time Ji Jun told him to stop acting tough just because his son was nearby. Appa fell on the ice with his whole body and did not react to his son's appeal, while Hong continued to say that his father was right. Ji Jun added that everything in business is arranged the same way, so you need to think ahead. Han clarified that if you chase short-term profits, then the advantages will be the same, and from this it follows that in business, of course, the financial side is important, but you can't get anywhere without connections. When the other guy finally stood up holding his back, which was hurting the chairman, was just finishing up the conversation that without a good reputation it was impossible to get connections. Jean nodded, indicating that he understood what the men wanted to tell him and indicated that he would keep this information in mind. The fathers stood there pleased with how far and successfully this young man would go. Hyuk was also glad that the idea was the same, but with Hong's input it sounded different, and he even thought about taking back his words about being a guy from the neighborhood. The guys managed to get hold of 3 whole loaches and started calling them funny names, which made them laugh so hard they almost burst their stomachs. Jean realized that Hong was still a fool and that minute-long monologue about business was just an obsession. The father decided to share with his son that he had given names to the fish, which already sounded strange. But the guy still asked what the names of these unfortunate people were, and Dad started to straighten his fingers and name them one by one, and the first was McCanter. Hyuk was out of his mind from the nonsense that his father came up with, forgetting that today he called the rooster the sprinter Lubim, but Suyung was completely disappointed. Han, on the contrary, supported his friend, saying that the name suits fish perfectly, although the boy did not understand in what place. The Appas began to call the fish in turn McCanter, first, second, and youngest, and ended by saying that these warriors should unite, to which Su said that Dad was strange and Hyuk was still interested in strangers. Ji Jun was as happy as a child when he showed his daughter a whole bucket of bullheads that he had personally caught. Just in case, Su first asked Appa if these gobies were tasty at all, and Hyuk confirmed that everything was fine and they really could be eaten. Hong was a little upset that his daughter did not appreciate the amount of fish she caught, but Yun was there to support her. Su asked Appa if they dried fish like pollock, and he said that they simmered it for soup, but the girl didn't know what simmering meant, and Hyuk, while thinking about strangers, explained that simmering meant boiling something for a long time over low heat. The girl would have listened and listened to this mysterious boy, but noticing that he was thinking about something, she fell silent. Suddenly Su noticed that Appa was talking a lot more, although Hyuk didn't notice it in himself. The little girl once again confirmed her words and added that she liked the guy's talkativeness, but now she thought about the fact that someone might be jealous. Su thought about the last conversation between her mom and Dad, how they argued over pizza. The girl suddenly wet her finger on her tongue and wiped Hyoka's cheek, even though there was nothing there. Jean was already in the clouds or in his thoughts about those people on the ice, and then someone ran a wet finger across his cheek. The girl screamed quite loudly pizza and repeated it again, thus making it clear that she was hungry. While Say-ra was holding the camera, she heard Hyuk tell Dad that Su-young wanted pizza, and he agreed to take her for dinner. Uni was a little stunned by what she heard from her daughter because she also remembers the recent conversation with her Appa. In the evening, Yong was lying on the floor and his back was covered with warm compresses, and the sensations he experienced were not the most pleasant. Mom asked if Appa was okay because if everything was that bad it would be better to go to the hospital, and Uni had already arrived, claiming that she knew about such consequences as soon as the men started fooling around. It turned out that the guys had climbed their feet into the buckets and decided to walk around on the ice like that, and now Yong said that if the women knew that everything would end so sadly, then why didn't they stop them, to which he heard that no one thought that it would come to this. While Hyuk's mother burst into tears that Appa was feeling bad and Say-ra scolded him for bringing his wife to tears, Jean heard a knock on the door and ran to open it with Su. When Hyuk opened the door, the first person he saw was Mi Kyung, who in turn did not say hello but noticed the little girl next to the guy. Jean heard Mi Kyung ask if his dad was home, but he already had another question in his head. Who was that next to his friend? It turned out that Hyuk and the guy next to Mi Kyung stared at each other for a while, thereby prolonging the awkward silence. Song Guanyang, although he sat hunched over from the pain in his back, happily accepted the guests, noting how Taeyong had grown since their last meeting. Hyuk's father asked if the guy had come for the holidays, and he briefly confirmed, and from Jin's memories emerged who the stranger was, and it turned out that Choi Taeyong was Mi Kyung's older brother, and in addition a member of the wrestling section in high school. Although now Hyuk understood who this guy was, he still remembered well that in his past life they rarely saw each other because of wrestling training, and then Choi asked what happened to Sun's back, which made the man feel awkward. Appa briefly described that he had gotten into trouble with his back because of catching bullheads, and in order not to look awkward he immediately switched over and asked the boys what brought them to them and where their parents were, to which Choi told them about their departure to the head of the village. The next moment Taeyong tried to explain the reason for their visit, but he could only ask Hyuk's parents for a favor, and when they asked about something the young man hesitated. Choi barely squeezed out that their grandmother went to the hospital today, to which the adults immediately asked if everything was okay with her, and the poor guy mumbled the doctor's verdicts under his breath, and Mi-kyung couldn't stand it and shouted that grandma needed pureria juice, which was good for her health. The situation was complicated and tense, so Taeyong, after shouting to his sister that he was actually speaking now, sighed heavily and covered his face with his hand, but still confirmed Mi-kyung's words. Choi mentioned that according to rumors there is a lot of pureria growing on Mount Gubin, but he doesn't know how to look for it. And since his parents won't be home for another day, he and his sister came to Uncle Guan-yun for help. For a moment, the adults had not yet recovered from the sad news, so they did not respond to the brave children's statement. Hyuk's father miscalculated his strength and rushed forward with a shout up the mountain, also shouting loudly from the pain in his back, and at that moment not only his wife but also his son rushed to him. Jin's mom immediately asked if Appa was okay and asked him to sit back down, and Choi, also holding Uncle Guan, said that it would be better for him to rest and regain his strength, and Hyuk was watching all of this. The guy listened as his father, despite his sore back, argued and was ready to go up the mountain right now, but Choi tried to dissuade him. Jin didn't keep us waiting long and immediately got involved and volunteered to go up the mountain and get the medicine, which caught the attention of everyone who couldn't keep quiet. The parents didn't understand what they heard from their son the first time, so they asked again, but Mi-kyung immediately agreed that Hyuk really could go because he was good at it. The girl brought up as an argument that Jin had been to the mountain a lot before, so he knew his way around there very well, but the guy was a little stunned by such information about him, and what can we say about Soo-jong, who clung to him and did not want to let go. Mi-kyung continued to tell her parents that Jin was the strongest and most resilient in their class and also a good student, which meant he could handle the hike up the mountain. And then Choi intervened, asking if the boy knew about the strength of the plant's roots. Taeyong started to tell the boy how hard it would be to dig up the roots, especially for an elementary school student, but then Hyuk grabbed him by the clothes. Jin at that moment played the role of a child, perfectly twisting his cute face and asking the guy if he could go with Taeyong after all. And when Hyuk addressed Choi as Hyung, the guy's jaw dropped to the floor. While Jin was explaining to the young man that his grandmother had helped their family a lot more than once, and now he also wanted to help, the parents at that moment also opened their mouths, not believing what kind of son they had. Choi even blushed from the way Hyuk called him and said that since the kid insisted so much he couldn't refuse. A little proud, Taeyong allowed Jin to go with him, but clarified that it was only this time and only because Mi-kyung was trying to persuade him, and the guys were standing there wondering what the hell he was talking about. On the mountain, everyone was busy with their own business, namely the guys were digging and Mi-kyung was guarding the guys' jackets, and she and her jackets were guarded by Zangin, and there was talk about what the sister told her brother about her friend quite often. Poor Choi was already exhausted and breathing heavily, confessed to Jin that when he saw him yesterday, he thought he was a high school student, to which the boy smiled shyly. And right now the middle school student and wrestling club member was barely standing on his feet and looked at Jin, mentally wondering how a junior high school student could dig so well. Hyuk drew energy from the fact that he needed to help the person thanks to whom he and his sister were born, and in addition to everything he had a source from a past life because his endurance was truly developed beyond his years. Choi jokingly asked the guy if he had undergone military training, to which he received a rather strange reaction, and although Jin said that nothing like that happened in his past life, he really did serve in the special forces. The shovel hit something that looked like a treasure chest, and after Jin shouted for everyone to look, the kids came running and looked in shock at what really was a treasure. The root was really very large and strong, so Hyuk immediately assumed that it would most likely be impossible to figure it out without a saw. Taeyong rolled up his sleeves and asked everyone to step aside since he could handle it on his own now, but Jin tried to warn him that he would hardly be able to do anything with his bare hands because of the weight of the root, and Mi-kyung was already standing there with disappointment in her eyes. Choi told the guys that getting the root was easy and started dragging it with all his might. The young man decided that now was the time to show little Jin what Hyun was made of. Choi, putting in maximum effort, began to pull the root, and in his head, he frantically screamed that now the strength of a 17-year-old war veteran would manifest itself, and the guys even believed him. But the fighter's entire strength was limited to him grunting and puffing, and although it wasn't a turnip, he still couldn't pull out the root. And so time stood still for the 17-year-old veteran and two sane people much younger in age. Mi-kyung now confirmed her disappointment not only with her eyes, but also with her voice, warning her brother that it was better to give up than to overexert himself, which made Jin feel awkward, and he reminded her that she had just said that to her own brother. Taeyong fell to the ground drenched in sweat and confirmed that it was indeed impossible to pull out the root because it was too heavy. The brother asked Mi-kyung to go down and bring something that would help them get the root, but Hyuk immediately said that he wanted to try it too. Choi found it difficult to even imagine that this Polish kid from the junior classes could surpass him, so in a panic, he began to tell him that you can dislocate your shoulder if you perform the technique incorrectly, but it was already too late. The little boy calmly and carefully pulled out the root in one jerk, shocking his brother and sister. It's good that Taeyong was already sitting on the ground, because looking at the root in Jin's hands, he would have definitely fallen down. The guys were returning home closer to evening, and Mi Kyung happily reported that it turned out that Jin could go himself. Of course, both his sister's words and the strength of the little one drove Choi into confusion, which is why he thought about his shame the whole way. Looking at the boy's back, Taeyong analyzed that although he was older and was engaged in wrestling, he turned out to be weaker than his sister's peer. Hyuk was walking next to his friend discussing something, and his head was not filled with thoughts like Choi's. And even though the guy had already lost faith in himself, Jin still turned to him and, calling him Hyun, thanked him for his efforts, because if it weren't for him, the root would never have been pulled out. Choi was shocked by such a statement from the stronger guy, so he didn't even immediately find what to answer. Jin smiled, and just in case, he repeated to Hyun once again that he did an excellent job and tried very hard. Turning towards his house, Hyuk noted that Mi Kyung had also tried her best today, and asked him to say hello to his granny, to which she in turn asked him to be careful on the way home. Mi waved after her friend, while Taeyong scratched the back of his head and thought about whether this was really the feeling that his older brother was nearby, because it seemed as if his older brother from the section had praised him. Mentally telling himself that he had finally gotten the root, Choi began to smile embarrassedly, but did not risk asking his sister if he was really that cool, since he already knew her reaction in advance. After some time, Jin walked quite actively but angrily through the forest area, mentally scolding Zangan. Before going out for a walk, Hyuk went to call the dog, but he refused to come out of the kennel because his owner scolded him. Jin decided that he would not waste time on begging and turned around and went to the exit, telling Zangan that if he did not want to, then he did not have to go out, and just at that moment he looked out. Not only did Zangan jump out of the booth, he also started barking like never before, but Hyuk didn't understand this. When the owner disappeared behind the gate, Zangan ran his tail and began to whine as if he felt something but could not show it. As a result, when Jin returned, he had to clean up after the dog that he called for a walk in order to do all his business. So walking further into the forest, Hyuk thought that he had already gotten used to his furry friend and that it was lonely to walk like this without him. Jin began to feel guilty that he might have scolded his four-legged friend too much. The fog enveloped the guy faster than his conscience, and it distracted him because such a thick veil could not have appeared so quickly. Looking around, Jin remembered very well that at such a time it was still too early for fog, but now considering what had happened, going somewhere without any plan or reference point was a rather dangerous undertaking. Someone's footsteps were heard, which caused the guy to immediately turn in the direction from which they came. Jin froze in place, not believing his own eyes, and now the fog seemed like a trifle compared to what he saw now. As if from nowhere, a young girl in traditional attire approached the boy, and at the same time she still recognized Hyuk. The poor guy felt like he had even forgotten how to breathe. Fear had paralyzed him so much. The most terrible and incomprehensible moment was when this woman smiled and addressed the guy by name. Still, reason prevailed, and despite his fear, Hyuk was able to see in the stranger the grandmother of his friend Mi Kyung. After Jin realized that it was a granny in front of him, although he couldn't explain it to himself, he started talking to her, as if nothing had happened, asking where she was going, to which she said that she had gone out to pick wormwood. When Hyuk offered to take his granny wherever she went, she turned to the young man and agreed. The only thing that made the guy hesitate for a moment was the old woman's offer to listen to an old story on the way. Granny began her story by mentioning a village near Mount Matbari, where she was from, and Jin clearly imagined mighty cliffs with dense forests. The story did not promise to be either sad or funny, but it just flowed its course from the lips of an old woman who had already told about the period in her life when she moved to her husband at the age of 15. And that was in order to escape from the Japanese. At the crossing, under the pressure of flight, everything did not end, because a couple of years later in the village of Jaedong something like an accident or a riot occurred, and at that moment the protesters broke into the people, luring them to join, and began to take away men. To the great regret of the grandmother, her husband had to hide in order to avoid a terrible fate, and the woman herself had to take on enormous responsibility not only for her own life. The abandoned and defenseless woman was left without a choice of action, because there was nothing else to do except survive and feed her children. An important point was that the place where the old woman lived was called Sipon, which meant 10 peaks. But during the war, the area was often bombed, which led to the disappearance of one of the peaks, which caused a terrible feeling, because the mountain is the strongest thing there is, and they were able to destroy it, let alone people. There were other spouses and mothers standing next to the woman waiting for the main one to do something, but the unfortunate woman watched as people destroyed their own history, and in this case Sipon became Gubin. At the same time as one of the 10 peaks was wiped off the face of the earth, Jang Hwan, who was a rock and support for Grandma, also died. Here Jin could not stand it, and out of disbelief that the hero had really died, asked again, so much did he not want to accept the fact of the pain and bitterness that this and many other women had experienced. The old woman kindly explained to the boy that Jan joined the army to avenge the death of his friends, but ended up dying himself. The genie walked as if he was in a daze, not understanding where the granny's story was, and where the reality was, and while she was saying that it was lucky that at least the body was found, the young man noticed how the woman's face changed. The old woman stopped for a moment and asked if Hyuk knew the name of that mountain, and since there was no answer, she herself said that it was Mount Buckman. A chill ran down the boy's spine, although there was not even a hint of wind in the dense forest. Jin's heart not only started beating faster but also louder from the mere understanding that they were talking about Mount Buckman Sanchen, which was also called the Heavenly Mount Buckman, where people are buried, and then the granny smiled and asked if he wanted to go with her. Hyuk barely showed it and didn't back away, but the granny had a sense of humor, and to be on the safe side gave an extra creepy smile. The next moment the old woman saw how scared the boy was, but she couldn't do anything and laughed very loudly, mentioning again that Hyuk's face was exactly like his father's when he was afraid. Exhaling, Hyuk continued to follow his granny and asked if she had come to leave a will, to which he heard that she had nothing to leave, but was very glad that she had seen such a nice guy for the last time. Jin had not yet had time to ask anything, so the woman herself continued to talk about her experiences, that Yoon-gu's son had not received the will, and that she had wandered around these mountains. Considering how Hyuk was ready to help everyone, he immediately asked if grandma would like to pass on something to her family, and she thought about it. When the old woman asked the question point-blank whether the guy still wanted to listen to her crazy nonsense, he somehow even changed his mind. Granny again pointed out that she had nothing to convey to her family, even verbally, but she warned that she would come to the boy in a dream today, and asked if he minded, and even though Jin thought that no one would ask him, he still said that he didn't mind, causing the woman to smile. The granny took the young man's hand in hers, and as if blessing him, asked him to live well and happily, because there is nothing fun about growing up quickly. So the old woman and the boy stood there, and she continued to admonish him to take care of his parents and sister. Jin wanted to say something to his granny, but she mentioned something that resonated in his heart, namely that only he could protect his family. The sun's rays broke through the fog, and at that moment the granny seemed to melt, thanking the boy one last time for carrying such a burden. When the image of the old woman completely disappeared, Jin realized that he was standing in the middle of the forest holding his hand on a stone. On the sign next to the boulder, there was a sign indicating that the young man was located on Mount Gubin near the Sunyo or Fairy Rock. Smiling affectionately, Hyuk thought that he was not the only one who met a fairy in this place. Hyuk held his hand on the stone, feeling the warmth spreading through his body, and he was no longer afraid. The guy suggested that he could well have met the spirit of the tree that once lived in that very village. By the evening, there were so many people at Mi Kyung's house, it was as if some kind of celebration was taking place. But as it turned out, everyone came to respect the most valuable person they had met on their life's path. Poor Hyuk helped all day, and even in the evening, he ran from one part of the house to another at the request of the guests. Before he could even finish his first request, Hyuk heard him being asked to wipe the table after finishing, and all he could do was answer that everything would be done. Jin brought one of the guests what he was asked for, but the guy's gaze and thoughts were on the one for whom everyone had gathered today. On the table, among the candles and treats, stood a photograph of Grandma smiling as always. In front of Hyuk, Grandma came to life again, and that was the moment when she fried sweet potatoes and called him to try them too. The only thing the guy thought about when he looked at the granny's photo was that he was very lucky. The young man remembered how he felt the touch of his grandmother's hands on his own, and realized that it had cost him a lot to see her off on her final journey. The boy's thoughts were interrupted by Mi Kyung, who told her friend that his mother had asked them to rest and eat. The little girl had a tray of treats for two in her hands, which meant that they definitely wouldn't be sitting in the house. The guys settled behind the side wall of the house away from the guests and noise, and then Mi was finally able to exhale, and even complained that she was very tired today because people had been coming since early morning, but even in this Hyuk found a lot of good. The girl looked at the guests and her family and how they were smiling and not crying or just silent, and asked her friend again if he really thought that everything was fine. Jin confirmed that everyone who came today sincerely wanted to say goodbye to Grandma and thank her even just for being there for them. Mi Kyung smiled while looking somewhere in front of her and said that she really appreciated how everyone loved her grandmother. Hyuk only made an assumption that Grandma probably went to a good place, and to Mi's surprise she confirmed this, and to his silent question the old lady said that she saw her yesterday in a dream. The girl's dream was a little different from what Hyuk had dreamed of, but it was still beautiful. I confidently stated that I immediately realized that it was my grandmother in front of me, even though she looked like her incredibly beautiful sister. Remembering the touch of my granny's hands on my face, I understood even without words that she had come to say goodbye. As it turned out, Grandma came to Mom and Dad in a dream, and Mi found it amazing that the whole family had the same dream. The girl also thought that her grandmother was able to come to them in a dream because she became a fairy, and Hyuk agreed, smiling mysteriously. Mi remembered what Mom said about the ritual on Sunya Rock and asked if Jin would go with her. Jin agreed without hesitation, adding that he was more than sure that Grandma would have liked it. Looking somewhere into the distance after the words about the memorial service, Hyuk closed his eyes with the thought that he was ready to do anything for his grandmother. The words of his grandmother softly flew through the boy's head, asking him to live well and take care of his family, and at that moment he was holding his sister in his arms and felt the old woman stroking his head. I looked at the starry sky and took a deep breath, not because it was hard but because I wanted to catch that very moment. The girl managed to catch what her grandmother smelled like, and it was the whole world that now surrounded her. There were some tears on the part of his granddaughter, but Jean did not go anywhere and stayed to share the bitterness of loss with his friend. Now all that was left was to imagine how Grandma met her love, which she thought she had lost forever. Time flew by very quickly, but it felt completely different for Jean, and now he's in 6th grade, and in front of him and his classmates stands teacher Choi Young-mook getting to know everyone. Hyuk joined in the wave of joyful exclamations of his classmates, but unlike them, he simply smiled. While the boy was thinking about the fact that the school was not able to have several class teachers, the teacher announced the selection of the class president. Mr. Mook also warned that the class president would also be the student council president and asked who would like to participate in this, to which the students almost unanimously shouted for Jin Hyuk to become the class president. The young man himself didn't particularly like the idea, although it was obvious that everyone would want to choose him because of his academic performance at school. The teacher agreed with the candidate for headman and immediately announced who would like to become an assistant, and then a forest of hands appeared, among which were Mi Kyung and Sun Chan, which is why poor Jean even got scared. Hyuk's friends looked at each other as if they were ready to even fight for the assistant's position. The class teacher asked again if anyone else besides the boys wanted to be an assistant, but at that moment Mi Kyung made the others afraid of her, so Mr. Mook said that in the first semester Mi's assistant would be, and in the second Sun Chan. In the evening, the mother was a little shocked by such news, even though she already knew about her son's success. While sorting things out, the mother praised her son for being smart just like his father, but Hyuk brushed it off, saying that there was nothing wrong with him being the head boy and president at school. Mom still insisted that this was an incredible success that not everyone can achieve, and my sister picked up on this delight, asking if Appa was cool. Eugene heard that now her Appa is the class president, and in that case he should be congratulated, after which the little girl froze a little looking at her brother because she realized that he is cool but did not understand why. While handing the sock to Appa, Eugene still congratulated Hyuk, although she didn't understand why, but that was enough to knock her brother out cold. Jean couldn't stand it and pushed his sister to the floor, hugging her and saying how well she already speaks, which made Mom laugh out loud. But Eugene didn't really like this idea and she started calling for help. Hyuk's morning at school began with the fact that at the entrance he saw a poster with his name where he was congratulated on winning a prize in mathematics. The guy didn't go far because he heard someone calling him behind his back, and it sounded like Mi Kyung. The girlfriend was really catching up with her friend, and when she was already closer, Hyuk greeted her in return. Mi asked her friend if he had brought it, and then a bunch of objects appeared in Jin's head, and he tried to figure out if he had forgotten anything. After making sure that he hadn't forgotten anything, the guy said that he had taken everything he needed, but Mi asked again if he had taken what was needed. Jin was starting to dislike this kind of mystery, so he said directly how he could bring something he didn't even know about, after which Mi asked him to lean towards her. When Hyuk was close to Mi, she whispered in his ear whether the guy had brought that medical test. Jin smiled and replied that if we were talking about a bag for collecting biomaterial, then of course he brought everything. But when the young man asked his friend if she had forgotten to bring it, he saw a reaction that only confirmed his fears. Already at that moment, Jean felt something was wrong, looking at how Mi Kyung was embarrassed and clearly wanted to say something else. And when he heard the request, his eyes widened like never before in his life. Poor Mi stood there embarrassed and red as a lobster after asking Hyuk to share his material with her. Considering how impressed the young man was, he burst into a loud voice, and Mi had to hiss and cover his mouth with her finger just so that he would start speaking more quietly. Jean felt even more sick after his friend explained that she couldn't take the material from someone else because she would have to take a parasite test in front of everyone, but Hyuk was clean. Mi had to beg a friend to pull off such an adventure, and it already looked strange to others, but Hyuk himself at that moment thought that she had completely gone crazy. Jean, putting his hand to his face, nevertheless overcame himself, realizing that Mi was at just such an age that she was now clearly terribly ashamed to ask for such a thing. The guy simply extended his hand to Mi, asking her to give him an envelope, and she was happier than ever. Mi handed her friend an envelope, rejoicing like a child while saying that she would definitely repay the debt, but this did not calm Hyuk down, so he simply asked her to go first and he would go to the toilet, and after that he would also go to class. Entering the men's room, Jean prepared himself for the worst, but luckily, he heard that he was not alone. Judging by the sounds in the booth, someone else forgot to bring the material, so Hyuk knocked and asked if anyone was there. It was hard not to respond to the voice of the student council president, but the voice of the one in the booth was also familiar to Jean. The guy was grateful to heaven for his salvation and generally considered such a coincidence to be fate. The teacher collected envelopes in a bag while the children ran from class to class. When Mi Kyung happily entered the classroom, not suspecting anything, Hyuk on the contrary tensed up, and the rest of the guys along with him. Optimism was now Jin's only salvation, so he reassured himself, albeit questioningly, that everything would be fine. And so 2 weeks later, there was the day X when the teacher announced that those whom he would name would come and take the medicine, and one of them was the assistant to the headman and friend of Yuk Sun Chan. Sun Chan went to the table as if to hard labor, and Mi was surprised that Jin Soo was not invited this time, although he was always in the front row, and then Hyuk breathed a sigh of relief. The The teacher noticed how the children were whispering and looked carefully at his list. The next ones called to the table were Kang Jin-soo and Mi Kyung, who flinched, turned pale, and were horrified. The boys stood at the table while the teacher gave them medicine, and it was terribly embarrassing. Poor Mi was horrified by the fact that the jar contained a month's dose of the drug, but what was even more terrifying was that rumors immediately began to spread behind her back. The incinerating gaze of the evil Mi Kyung immediately turned to Hyuk, and in front of him, absolutely all the students bent down to their desks with their faces in order not to get caught in the crossfire. Jin started to mumble something under his breath, something like an explanation, but it was too late as Mi was already ready to devour him whole. The next moment, the students were treated to a funny sight of Mi Kyung chasing her friend under the school windows. The girlfriend shouted at Hyuk that he was an idiot and an asshole, but it didn't help because the guy ran on a regular basis and he wasn't afraid. Mi furiously shouted that she asked for Jin's sample and not Jin-soo's, but Hyuk had a mantra in his head that he had already apologized, and besides, if Mi had taken this responsibly from the very beginning, then nothing would have happened. The girl chased after her friend, calling him a bastard and begging him to stop, but at that moment Jin remembered from his past life also an evil but adult Mi, and he was overcome with pleasant nostalgia, and at that moment she was overcome so much that she threw up. Meanwhile, in the office of Myeong Junior High School, a conversation was taking place about where the regional qualifying tournament for the youth sports competitions would be held next year, and for now the choice fell on Taeyong Middle School. The principal asked the teacher if there were people in their school who could be sent to the marathon, and the teacher confirmed this. The headmaster suddenly screamed after looking at the lists, and his reaction was due to the name song Jin Hyuk. The teacher asked the principal if he knew the student, and he said directly that he was most likely his enemy because their school was not showing particularly good results precisely because of this guy. The teacher turned his attention to Hyuk's profile and heard that they tried to lure the guy away on behalf of the director, but he refused. Being shocked, the teacher asked again whether he had understood correctly that they were trying to lure away an elementary school student, and allegedly heard the argument that a school that shows good results gets more funding. The head of the school was confused and did not know how to tell the higher-ups about everything, to which the teacher calmly replied that Hyuk's mental abilities did not immediately mean that he was a good runner. Mi Kyung finally caught up with the scoundrel and almost shook the life out of him, but she had no intention of stopping. Jin just prayed for it to end quickly, continuing to quietly say that he had already apologized many times. After one good shake-up called Mi Kyung, Jin was stunned by another news that he will be taking part in the youth sports festival. At first, the teacher didn't even know how to find the words to explain, and he was able to tell how every May in Cheoncheonam-do they hold that very festival to which all schools must send athletes. The teacher felt awkward after the guy asked why he was hearing about his participation for the first time, so the teacher had to justify himself with a compliment that there was no one else to send except Heck. After asking Jin for forgiveness, the teacher again made excuses by saying that the deadline for submitting documents was approaching, so there was no time to ask the guy directly about his wishes. Immediately after being presented with the facts, the student was told that the coach from Taeyong Elementary School was already waiting on the field. The teacher said at the end that Hyuk's class teacher had been warned, so the young man didn't have to worry, but it didn't matter to him anymore. The invited guests looked around the school field and discussed the fact that it turned out to be much larger than they imagined, especially considering that there was only one class for each grade level. One of the teachers made his guess that the number of buses going to the city has increased, and so the school has developed, to which he heard in response another assumption that they want to make this area a center of tourism. Hyuk and the teacher were already heading towards the guests, and along the way they explained to the boy that after raising the flag and firing the shot, he had to immediately run as fast as he could. Before Jin could answer the teacher's question of whether everything was clear, the question of who that teacher was surfaced in his memory, and he still doubted whether it was really Kim Yong-tae. The boy remembered how it was his teacher Kim Yong-tae who played an important role in his life after his parents died. Hyuk remembered very well how after the loss of his loved ones he was forced to transfer to Taeyong Elementary School, where Yun taught physical education, and at that moment the teacher had already introduced the student council president to the guests. While the other teacher praised the student's growth, Mr. Yong couldn't believe that such an unusual child was doing in a village school. Mr. Yun felt a little uneasy because his expectations about the guy did not match reality, because the young man was definitely too good for this school. Teacher Yong got straight to the point and informed both the teacher and the student that the results would only be assessed after completing the 100-meter dash. Hyuk was reassured that other schools also use preliminary competitions, so he had no need to worry, but they didn't know that the guy had already lived his life and he was calmer now than ever. The teacher calmed Jin down with a shaking voice and asked him to breathe deeply, but he was already mentally asking the teacher himself to calm down. Mr. Yong prepared himself and turned his gaze towards the student to assess the overall situation. At the beginning of the line, Jin was adjusting his sneakers and the teacher was shaking like an aspen leaf next to him and not breathing deeply as he advised the guy to do. Hyuk smiled to himself as he repeated his teacher's words about not being nervous and prepared for the run. With thoughts that he had never been nervous, Jin took off at the signal and everything around him seemed to slow down and there was only him and the strip. To say that teacher Yong was shocked is to say nothing because at the very least he saw something that he had either never seen before or had seen rarely. At the very least, the teacher was amazed by the guy's ideal knee and elbow height, and the length of his steps and the crossing of his legs made him open his mouth in surprise. The physical education teacher looked at the unsurpassed ideal of someone who could truly boldly take part and not limit himself to just one marathon from the school. The adult man and the teacher could not understand how the young man could achieve such amazing results without being involved in professional sports. The most interesting part was behind him because teacher Yong had not yet seen what Hyuk had been working so hard on all this time. Looking at the stopwatch, Yong couldn't even believe his eyes because it showed a rather dubious result for a real elementary school student. Mr. Kim asked his colleague to help him check the result again, to which he was surprised but agreed. Jin Hyuk was asked to run again, but he was only too happy to try because he loved this business both in his past life and in this one. While the guy was running to the starting line, Yong looked after him and did not understand how what he had just said was even possible. The coach also noted for himself that Jin achieved such a good result despite the fact that he was not in athletic shape. The second time the signal and the second time the race, and Hyuk didn't care about the time. He liked how he felt his body and how the wind whistled in his ears, but the teachers were already both looking at the stopwatch and the jaws of two of them were already dropped. The second time Jin showed an even better result, and this was a completely new experience for the coaches who did not believe in the students' abilities at all at first. Hyuk stood calmly and evened out his breathing, thinking that he could have run like this a few more times, but this was just a warm-up. A week later, the teacher noticed Jin had new sneakers and asked if he had bought them specifically for the tryouts, and he proudly declared that it was all his dad's doing. Hyuk decided to skip the part about how his dad reacted violently to the news about the competition and how he was ready to buy any sneakers for his son because he was bursting with pride. Surprisingly, the guy's thoughts were not currently occupied with the competition, but rather he was thinking about the fact that he had not been to Taeyong High School for a long time, since he usually spent most of his time here. Also, two guys whom Jin met in his past life at Taeyong School have not disappeared from his memory, and if he manages to move forward next year, he will meet them again. The steps of the school were noisy as many teams had gathered, and everyone was discussing the likelihood of winning or losing. Hyuk heard his teacher tell him not to be nervous again, and at the same time he nervously tucked his shirt into his shorts. For obvious reasons, the coach had reminded Jin for the 100th time to run immediately after the shot, but he simply silently took in the information and stood like a statue waiting for his clothes to be tucked in sufficiently. How awkward it was for the boy that the school gave him a pink uniform for the selections, but there was nothing he could do. The embarrassment disappeared as if by magic after the coach sincerely shared with Jin that this would be the first participation in competitions since the founding of their school. The most important revelation was the teacher's admission that he was proud of his student, even though this was only a qualifying competition. The loudspeaker announced group number 4 and that it was time to get ready, and this was about Jin, but the most important thing had already been said. The participants stood at the starting line, and compared to the other guys, Jin really did look much bigger, which is why he saw people looking at him from time to time. There was also some whispering about who this mysterious young man was, and that he couldn't be from the younger classes because he was incredibly tall. The coach announced the start, and attention, and Hyuk, as if in excitement, prepared for a fun undertaking without thinking about winning. Closing his eyes, the guy concentrated simultaneously on everything that surrounded him and on nothing, which caused a ticklish feeling inside him, as if something new was about to be discovered. In his thoughts, Jin was already somewhere on the strip, so all that was left was to hear the cherished march, and when this happened his eyes opened and all that was left was to enjoy this run as well as all the others. A shot rang out and those same high knees rushed ahead of their owner, making it clear that he was fast and strong as always. Jin rushed forward without pride or on the contrary playing along with others, but ran simply as he liked and as he felt, and he felt freedom. Judging by the expressions on the faces of the other participants, they were acting out of frustration, unlike Hyuk, who clearly understood what he was doing and why. The teacher was rooting for his Jin with all his might, while others were discussing how the guy didn't look like a junior school student with his abilities. Jin had already run past the coach, and he recorded the time while the other guys were just running up to him. The curator was asked to record the time, but he had already fulfilled the request but stood there like a pillar, as if he could not see anything other than the result on the stopwatch. When the curator's gaze finally tore itself away from the stopwatch, he was asked just in case if everything was okay with him, and he still in shock confirmed that everything was fine with him. The coach couldn't keep silent and nevertheless told his colleague that the results were incredible for an ordinary boy. In addition to the usual information about the student, it was also indicated that he had never taken part in a competition before, but he passed it better than the other children who trained hard. Hyuk stood to the side because he didn't know any of the students here, but the guys found him themselves, and the first thing the guy heard was that he was very cool considering his speed. Park Ji-bum from Taeyong High School, with a funny but stylish hairstyle, extended his hand to Jin and introduced the guys, where on the left was Yeom Byung-taek with a rather shy face and a smiling Cho Sol-chan. The young man willingly greeted the guys and introduced himself in response, once again hearing along the way how tall he was. Chan noticed that Hyuk's sneakers, although quite good, clearly lacked spikes for such competitions, since running on a track is a completely different thing. The new friend was amazed that Jin was able to run so fast even in non-studded sneakers, and meanwhile the teacher was already calling the young man, which looked scary to the guys from the outside. Hyuk was already used to the way the teacher behaved, but for the kids the picture looked from the outside like he was being pressured and he was running so fast perhaps because his whole life depended on it. The announcer announced the finale, which would take place in 30 minutes, and they voiced Jin and those 3 guys, after which Pak said that in that case he would go get ready and said that they would see each other again, to which Hyuk waved back. The young man still thought that sneakers with spikes were the best idea from his dad. Looking at the sneakers his new friends were wearing and the spikes were clearly visible on the soles, Jin thought about asking his dad to buy him some too. There was no excitement as such in the final, but the teacher sitting in the establishment with Hyuk could not calm down that the boy had overtaken the best runner and set a new record for Chongnam Junior School. The happy coach told the young man that he would pay for everything and that he could eat as much as he wanted, and also added that from now on Fridays, he had to go to relay training at Taeyang School, and asked if the boy could get there on his own. Hyuk already had not only an answer to the question of whether he would be able to ride on his own, but also an idea of how the training would go, and he already saw in advance how the coach from the Taeyang School would pair him with one of the guys who had met him. The guys stood in front of the curator, who explained that, with the help of practice, it would be determined who would stand in what order in the relay race. Based on information from the teacher, Jin even had an idea of how the coach says that the prize for winning the competition is money. Unlike the guys who were already thinking about how best to hide the money from their mother, Jin was thinking maybe he should buy those same studded sneakers with his winnings. And so, enjoying the delicious food, the boy answered the teacher that given that there were 6 buses a day, he would be able to get to training without any problems. The coach asked the young man to be careful and treated him to pickled radish, which was as tasty as everything else. Jin licked his lips at the delicacies he was currently tasting, but even now he was wondering if his little sister could eat jajangmyeon yet. Because of his thoughts about his sister, Hyuk again imagined the situation that if he won that money he would definitely take his family out to dinner. And if it wasn't dinner, the guy imagined how they all went to the market with their families and he bought little Eugene that same delicious jajangmyeon. Hyuk was already looking forward to the moment when he too could make some contribution to the family, in particular take care of his sister. Even spending time with his family at the market stall selling fresh fruit seemed like fun to Jin. An important moment had arrived and the father was already seeing his son off to training, asking if he had forgotten anything, to which Hyuk said that he had checked everything before leaving. As it turned out, shortly before the independent trips the boss took care of it and, overjoyed by his son's success, bought him studded sneakers after all. Even now Dad asked Hyuk to wait a second and started to take out something to give to his son before leaving for training. Guan gave his son 4 10,001 bills so that his son would have money for the fare and so that he could treat his friends to tteokbokki. Jin stood a little confused because that kind of money would be enough to feed a company of soldiers with tteokbokki, but looking at how his father was glowing with happiness, he couldn't help but take the money. The son also happily waved to his dad, shouting that he was leaving and would soon return and tell him how everything went. Guan, under the influence of emotions, also stood and waved back to the boy, wishing him a good journey and fun at training. Appa watched his son go, seeing much more in his travels than Hyuk had, and had already done much more than buy sneakers with spikes. The other day Gwang talked to Hong Ki-jun and he immediately asked what the prize would be, but the Appa clarified that it was not about winning but about the fact that the young man got to the regional competitions and that was already a success. The father explained to his friend that he was worried about his son, and that he would not get hurt because during competition there are moments of collision with the wall. Appa asked a counter-question about the likelihood of Jin's disappointment, but Hong said that in life absolutely everyone encounters failures. A friend told Guan something like a meditation about how parents don't want their children to be burdened by difficult times, but no matter how hard they try, this is also an important experience. While Hong was talking about how he as a parent would like to help his child overcome difficulties, he finished drawing funny portraits of his relatives, and Guan agreed with what his friend said. Guan hesitated a bit and decided to point out another important point, namely the clarification from the coach that Hyuk runs on equal terms with the track and field athletes. Just when Appa wanted to add that he knew something else, Hong immediately interrupted him, saying that Mr. Gwang was still the same since he never said directly what was on his mind. At the moment when Hong asked if Gwang had called to find out how to support his son, if he wanted to become a professional in track and field, he was brought documents. The folder with the papers indicated a draft plan for the creation and maintenance of the Sikahan Sports Fund. He said that there was no reason to worry, and that he would take care of this matter, and finally suggested that they meet when the children had such an opportunity. Appa thanked his friend and asked him to get back to work, and Hong wanted to tell him to take care of himself, but he didn't have time because Guan had already passed out. And so, having a strong cover behind his back, the father stood happily watching his son grow up and how success goes hand in hand with him. The day before the Chongnam competition in Gongju, the smell of roast pork tickled the nose and the ears were filled with the coach's words about how hard the boys had worked in preparation. The coach asked the boys to try to make sure that their efforts were not in vain, and to do this they needed to eat well and rest, to which all 3 shouted thank you for the food. Jin was asked if he would like some soda to go with this variety of food. With his mouth full, the guy refused the soda, saying that he would drink regular water so as not to burden his body. Suddenly the guys heard Sol-chan making strange sounds and were very scared for him, thinking that he had already choked or had an allergy, and then he blurted out in a hoarse voice that he seemed to be dying. dying. But in order not to frighten everyone nearby even more, Chan immediately said that the food here was delicious to death, although even the waitress had already begun to panic. The guy was literally melting on the table from the delicious food while his friends and the trainer were almost stunned, and the waitress, nervously laughing, was shocked that it was so delicious and said that she would bring more meat now. Heaving a sigh of relief, Hyuk also finally smiled, thinking that his appetite had increased because they were all after hard training, and that his emotions had been given free rein because they were sharing food with the entire team. Jin caught himself thinking that he now liked all these training sessions, communication, and sitting in cafes more than running with Zangan. The guy realized that running with friends who have the same sporting spirit as he does is a completely different feeling. Such warming thoughts in a pile of food that tickled the receptors caused the young man to smile and feel calm inside, as if he was where he should be. Pak looked intently in one direction and asked his friends if they were ready for the most important competition of their lives. Chan and Byun had such focused and serious looks, and their bodies were frozen in readiness to break forward. And then Pak shouted attention and the sound of a shot, after which the guys rushed at each other with pillows, screaming and laughing, and at that moment Jean, who had just come out of the shower, froze right in the doorway. Considering that inside the young man there was also his past adult life, he stood and watched his friends, thinking of them as children who were told to go to bed and have a good rest, but they did not listen. All this adult nonsense was abruptly knocked out of his head by a pillow that flew straight into Jin's face. The guys were scared and froze, not knowing how their new friend would react, and Hyuk himself froze with a pillow in his hands, not yet understanding what to do. The calmness and slight smile of the young man only frightened him more than if he had answered something directly right away, and in the meantime Jin's nose had already turned red. Confused and scared but cheerful at the same time, the guys were afraid to even breathe because they didn't know what to expect from their friend. Jin rushed to his friends, shouting that they were now doomed, and the guys, not knowing this guy very well, were afraid that they were really in trouble now. And Hyuk, smiling, joined in the stupid but such a fun game, showing that no matter how serious he looked he would still be fooling around. The guy felt warmth and excitement inside from the fact that the sports camp is cool and there is meaning in spending time with people who share your interests. The young man also felt the difference between when he fooled around with his family and how they fooled around with the guys, which added a new spark of joy to life. The coach spotted all 4 violators and shouted at them to go to bed quickly, and this was something to be afraid of. The guys calmed down and agreed that it was indeed time to go to bed, and only Jin felt awkward. Now the young man's thoughts were occupied with the fact that he was eagerly awaiting tomorrow in order to taste its colors to the fullest. While his son was at the camp, Appa couldn't find a place for himself, which is why he woke up in the middle of the night and sat in the hall with a camera in his hands. The woman noticed that her beloved was missing and, going out into the hall, asked him what had happened, and he explained that all his thoughts were occupied with his son, and that he would really like to visit him. The wife reminded her husband that he himself told her that none of the parents would go, and if they came to support Hyuk it could hurt others. The father was upset but agreed with what his beloved said, so he decided that in that case it would be better not to go. Suddenly the woman clapped her hands, which meant that an idea had come to her mind and was supposed to work perfectly. On the day of the competition, the guys had already arrived at the Gongju Sports Complex, which shocked them both with its size and the fact that it had only opened last fall. The guys stopped communicating because the coaches behind them were very loudly complaining about something. The poor guy who was responsible for the schedule was surrounded by all the coaches, and they were shouting that the schedule with breaks was compiled terribly, and the conditions of the players were not taken into account at all, and everyone needed to know when the list of participants would be posted. No matter how the man explained that he and his colleagues were also organizing an event of such a scale for the first time, no one cared and everyone was on edge, and Jean also found it a little strange that both the qualifying round and the final were held on the same day. Hyuk was also not thrilled that, with so many participants, they would have to hang around here until the evening, but Chan thought that his friend was looking at a girl from another team and, patting him on the shoulder, asked if she was cute. Chan had already managed to notice how beautiful the girl's skin was, and even suggested that she was most likely from the city. Byun also paid attention to the girls' team and noted the height of the one everyone was looking at, and he added that she was like some kind of celebrity. Pak nudged Jin in a friendly manner, asking who he thought was prettier out of those girls. It was the first time that Hyuk was put in such an awkward position, because of which he couldn't even put a couple of words together, since in his past life he might have already found someone who he thought was pretty, but he couldn't say it. The guys asked again to clarify whether the girl from the team was pretty, and then Jin saw his mother and Sooyoung as one of the main women in the life of an adult Hyuk. But the young man should have thought now with his teenage brain about whether that girl was pretty compared to his mother and Sooyoung, and how it seemed to him that the athlete looked ordinary. Thank God the guy didn't have to answer anything, because the start of the 100-meter race among junior high girls was announced, and the kids rushed to the stands as spectators, and then the rest of the participants followed. Jin and his friends were rooting for the rest of the kids they knew and shouting words of encouragement at the top of their lungs for everyone. Byun was amazed at how fast the participants who just competed were, and asked if anyone knew who they were, to which Park said that they were Daesun Junior High and that they had already won last year. The participants were just passing the baton to each other, and the guys had already started talking about their trump card, thanks to which those guys are so fast. Suddenly, the stick fell out of the hands of one of the participants, and this was a very stressful incident for everyone. Byun said that he was very sorry for those guys, and Hyuk was surprised, but Chan had already asked Chi-bum not to take that stick during their run, and he drank some water and nodded. Jin asked Byun what was wrong with the stick that was dropped, and he explained that if the stick fell once, it would fall again in the next run. Byun was already clearly nervous, saying that this was not just stupid stories but a proven fact that had already happened in real life, but the coach said that it was time for them to go because it was their turn and Pak also needed to go to the toilet. Chi-bum ran to the curator almost last in order to take the baton, while the announcer announced to take the inventory and take a place on the starting line. Poor Pak was horrified when he saw that the stick that had fallen out of the hands of the previous team was left in the bucket, and Chan had asked him not to take it, but considering that the others knew about the superstition about bad luck, they left it. Chi-bum felt how behind his back everyone started whispering and discussing the fact that the participant was late to choose a stick and they got that unlucky one. Byun and Chan looked at each other with excitement after they found out what color they got, and Jean realized that right before the race the children's balance was shaken. But Hyuk was not one of those who give up, not only so early but also because of some stupid superstition, because what is much more important is what data they came here with, and the stick fell out of his hands only because of excitement and self-hypnosis. Jean could feel how nervous his friends were, and for the first time he had so little time to figure out how to help. The coach too, under the heat of passion, could not squeeze out a word because he himself had already begun to worry about his children. Suddenly someone loudly shouted from the stands the names of all the guys from Jean's team and added that they were all great and would cope. Hyuk began to look around the raging crowd of people for the voice that had leveled his mood and encouraged his friends. Hyuk's family was sitting in the stands, and even little Eugene was waving her hands at him, and his father continued to shout for his son to give it his all. The guy looked with his mouth open and couldn't believe that his family had come such a long way to support him and even his friends. Inside, Hyuk felt a little aching from how much his family loved him, and he wanted to hug them so much right now, and this was the very fuel that would help him and his team win. The guys heard cries of support in their direction, which surprised them because they didn't expect this, and the situation was critical. Jean turned to his team as if to show them that they were shouting such words at them for a reason, but because they really could do more than they thought. Chan nodded and smiled in response to his friend's gaze, and Byun also began to look more confident, and the team spirit finally returned and the fear retreated to the side. Now Jean knew for sure that victory was in their hands, because with such an attitude, handing over this stupid piece of wood would not be difficult. The blue stick landed on the starting line, and the curator called the team's attention. Chi-bum was the first to start the race and moved with dignity alongside other competitors who were also determined to win. The moment of passing the baton came, and Beg took it upon himself, confidently grabbing the piece of wood as if it were a victory that needed to be grabbed as tightly as possible. The parents shouted at the top of their lungs, not only to Jean but also to the members of his team, so that they would know throughout the entire runway that they were not alone and that people believed in them. Hyuk heard these cries and was filled with them like energy that would carry him forward, and in fact it didn't matter whether it was a victory or a defeat because he had already won one victory by saving his family. Chan ran with all his might, forgetting about the stupid superstition and putting all his faith in the fact that he would be able to pass the baton to his new cool friend. The guys stood in shock from their friend who jumped above his head today, and there was no trace left of the unfaithful Chan. The guy ran to his friend as if he was freeing himself from the shackles of some fictions and rumors, and around him, there was only him, the Tribune Jean, and victory in the hands of Blue. Victory in the form of a baton was passed from one strong hand to another and rushed towards the finish line. Hyuk ran like the wind with only one thought in his head, that there was nothing more valuable to him than family. Mom froze in anticipation, and Dad took pictures of his son without expecting him to win, but just to capture this next cool moment in his life, and even little Eugene reached out to her brother to congratulate him, and it didn't matter what. Jean surged forward without hesitation, but simply because he liked it and felt that way. By tearing the finishing tape, Hyuk took another big piece of this life simply because he knew he could do it. Mom and baby screamed so loudly that the poor dad was deafened, but he didn't mind because it was really worth it. The father was shocked that it turned out his beloved could scream so loudly, and she realized only later how happy she was, and immediately asked for forgiveness if she hurt her beloved's ears. While Jean stood and evened out his breathing, the announcer announced the places that the different groups occupied. Hyuk didn't even have to listen to what the host was saying because the guys knocked him down with their shout that they had won after all. Pak rejoiced and shouted that he knew that Jean could be trusted completely and entirely, and not only in competitions. When the adrenaline subsided a little, Pak shared with the guys the feeling that his parents were here, and perhaps even the other guys too. The guys confirmed that they also heard the voices of their relatives, and it helped them a lot, so they started turning their heads around to find them. The announcer asked the participants to return to their seats so that the tournament could proceed without a hitch, but Jean was already in the stands. All that was left was to end up there in body. Mom was ready to cry from happiness, but Dad continued to capture important moments with his camera, especially when the whole team was assembled and little Eugene still wanted to be in her brother's arms. Jean waved to his family with his hand in which victory in the form of a blue stick was still firmly held. Other spectators did not miss the fact that such a brilliant finish was achieved by a 13-year-old boy. In addition to the usual parents of friends and acquaintances, the tournament was watched by those who were even more interested in the results of the participants. One of the strangers told his boss that 10.5 seconds was a new record, and he agreed, adding that they had finally found that nugget. The men had their eyes on the talent they had been looking for all their time, and now all that was left was to establish contact. It would seem that Sun Jin-hyuk took part in the tournament and signed so many autographs at the school gates that he became a star of the country. The school children looked with delight at the signature that the athlete left them as a keepsake, while Mi-kyung's friend as always teased her friend about his status as a 4-time champion. The young man in his own way was not entirely comfortable with the way the school was publicizing his not-so-great achievement, and he was especially put under pressure by the fact that his name was hanging on a banner at the entrance to the school. Mi-kyung was the only one who became interested in how her friend became a 4-time champion at once, to which Hyuk explained that he took part in other competitions that day, including the 100 and 200-meter races as well as the long jump. Having made a smart face, Sun did not begin to explain to his already surprised friend that the tournament rules allowed participation in other competitions. But Mi still asked when the national competitions would be held now and whether they would be in Gongju again, to which she heard that they would take place in a month and would be in Daegu. Considering that the competition this time would be nearby, Kion asked if her friend wanted her to come and support him, but he immediately refused, using the argument that it would be a school day, plus there would be many children from other regions there. Mi froze like a statue and fell silent because her friend was a moron, and Hyuk also froze with his mouth open, but at that moment he began to understand what his girlfriend was trying to convey. A second later, the guy was already incredibly delighted that Mi had decided to also try athletics. Due to the fact that Jean thought not only like a boy but also like an adult, he realized that the girl in her own way envied her friend's popularity, so she decided to try herself in sports too. Hyuk very sharply and decisively pointed his finger in the direction of Mi, who was already clearly regretting her decision, and said that training was starting right now. The girl was horrified because she watched as the bus actually drove past, and now there was nowhere to go except to try to run home. It was quite obvious that for a newbie runner like me, such a first run home would be difficult, and the poor guy, barely keeping up with his friend, screamed that if they had gone by bus they would have died. Hyuk ran ahead lightly and still managed to tell the student Mi-kyung to stop whining and think about how long it would take them to run home at such a fast speed. The young man ran even easier and faster this time from the mere thought that now he and Mi-kyung would run together, and as soon as he mentally told Zangin that he now had a competitor, his girlfriend screamed that she was leaving because she was not interested in running. One day Jean was sitting in the yard with little Eugene and teaching her what everyone's name is, but so far she's managed to do something more funny than to correctly name her relatives. For example, the baby's father's song Guan Yun was Yung Yang Yun, and Han Yu Yun's mother was Eni Eon, but she tried her best. But the most interesting moment was when it came to her brother's name, and instead of Sun Jin Hyuk, the girl said Sun Kaka, to which even Jangun twitched his ear as if he had spoken and burst out laughing. Even the second time when Hyuk asked him to repeat his name, Eugene still said Yung Kaka. The guy even guessed that most likely Hong Soo-young taught her sister such a nasty thing, and only hoped that the little girl would outgrow this evil joke. The young man didn't struggle for long to get his sister to say the name correctly, but instead he relaxed and looked at the sky, thinking that when there is no one at home it becomes so quiet. The only thing that confused Jean a little was that his mother had already left a long time ago to buy his father a snack, and perhaps they decided to eat together, and so she hadn't come back yet. The parents actually had a joint snack, and Hyuk at that moment was on the verge of discovering something new for himself, because knowing that his parents lived together, he didn't understand whether they were really interested in continuing to spend time with each other. Scratching the back of his head, the guy repeated to himself this unknowing truth that if you like someone you want to be with them all the time. At that moment, Hyuk immediately had an image of Hong Soo-young in her beautiful yellow dress and how she was dragging him somewhere by the hand. Hyuk lowered his gaze and was tormented by the fact that the knowledge of something more was so close, but he still did not understand, and then little Eugene fell under his gaze, who was watching her brother with eyes full of pure love. Jean felt like he was struck by electricity from such a number of pleasant and incomprehensible sensations, especially after Eugene's smile. Hyuk couldn't resist and started tickling her sister, saying how cute she was, and her head was like a ripe apple that you just wanted to eat. And even Zangin liked this amount of joy because he also started wagging his tail. Hugging his little sister, Jean thought that although he doesn't understand romance, he knows for sure that the little girl is charming, and she wasn't against her older brother's attitude towards her. Zangin suddenly stuck his tail up and stared at the gate, but Hyuk was still fooling around with his sister, telling her that if someone says she's cute, then let her tell him that she has an older ugly brother. The boys only noticed the gate when they heard the rough voices of two strangers who entered someone else's territory without permission, discussing how nice the house was, and one of them was even smoking a cigarette. For now, there was a safe distance between the owners of the house and the uninvited guests, both physical and verbal, but Hyuk still didn't know who it was and why people interested in his father's land had come again. It was hard not to notice how recently the number of people from the city who came to see the land had increased significantly. Jin remembered very well how his father read the papers, which clearly indicated even the market value of the property. At that moment, both the guy and Uncle Hong were shouting at Song Guangyun not to think about selling the plot, even though it was his father's land and it was up to him to decide what to do with it. How shocked the young man was when Hong told his friend that even if he wanted to sell the land, he should sell it to him. Now Hyuk also protested against Uncle Hong, who brazenly asked to sell the land to him, but fortunately his father was also against selling the land just like his son, so all the vultures left empty-handed. A brazen spit from the mouth of another idiot distracted Jin from thoughts about the last uninvited guests. The camel didn't stop after he entered the yard and spat there, but even continued talking to the children, trying to find out if they were home alone and where their parents had gone. For now, Jin was calmly thinking about who this person was and trying to remember whether his father had made an appointment with him, but the huge carcass, without even waiting for an answer from Hyuk, continued to speak with impudence about the fact that if his father was here, then let him come out. Here the guy was already more aggressively disposed towards this pig, who had entered someone else's territory, and was also giving orders left and right. The bastard repeated his question again, asking if they had really heard him, and now even Zangin was ready to defend his master, but Hyuk answered sternly but calmly that his father was not there right now, so it was better for them to leave. Suddenly the huge idiot barked something like, "What the hell did the man leave the children alone, and where the hell was he?" And at that moment poor Eugene got scared and started crying. This was the starting point where both Zangin and Hyuk were shocked that the little one was brought to this, but the pig did not stop and, covering his ears, ordered the guy to close the little one's mouth again. The idiots continued to mumble something about how the children were left alone, and in general the parents had created a mess here, and against the background of the crying Eugene Hyuk, he said through clenched teeth that if there were no adults, then it would be better for the uninvited guests to get out of here. And quite unexpectedly, the guy got a slap on the back of the head with words about how he was such a brat and was already being rude to his elders, and poor Eugene went completely silent, but this was only because she was even more afraid for her brother. The little girl in tears pressed herself even closer to Jean, and with great fear and tears in her eyes looked at the monster that had offended her protector. Without thinking twice, Zangin immediately grabbed the freak's leg with his teeth as tightly as possible and didn't let go. But the pig was much bigger than the small dog, so the first thing the bastard did was kick Zangin, causing him to bark loudly in pain. Hyuk felt like someone had dipped him in an ice hole when he saw what had happened to his four-legged friend, who was lying on the ground and breathing heavily. Before the young man's eyes immediately appeared that terrible scene from his past life when his hated uncle beat Jan Gun to death and he lay covered in blood. In the blink of an eye, Jean was next to the freak and grabbed him by the clothes so tightly that he couldn't even move. It would seem that the boy could be capable of such a thing, but anger and adrenaline took their toll, so the huge pig, barely breathing, hung in the air in the strong arms of the one who was ready to tear to shreds for his family. The bastard was sweating and just groaning, unable to even move, and Hyuk continued to hold him and watch that nasty, impudent face. If it weren't for the second idiot who understood that things were bad and didn't start to dissuade the guy, everything would have ended in death. Only after Jean was addressed with politeness did he look away, mindful of the limits of reason. The young man also had enough strength to throw that huge carcass far away from himself onto the ground, which left his second partner in even greater shock. Hyuk briefly told the freaks that if they understood everything, then it would be better for them to leave right now, to which he eventually heard from the victim that the brat was a real monster, but his partner lifted the pig from the ground and said that that was enough and that they really had to leave. When the bastards got into the car and sped away with creaking wheels, only then did Hyuk turn around and shout to Zangin if he was okay. The guy examined his furry friend for injuries and found nothing serious, while Eugene sat there already exhausted from such intense stress. The girl was crying, and Hyuk, after Zangin, immediately went up to his sister and asked if she was very scared. When the defender was nearby and Eugene was able to hug him, she said Appa very bitterly, and at that moment calming the baby, the guy thought that perhaps he had gone too far, thereby scaring her. Jean glanced at his hand, replaying in his head everything that had happened a few minutes ago, and he himself could not even believe that he could so easily grab a grown man by the collar. Zangin looked at his master as if he understood all his feelings and experiences, and the young man looked back with the thought that for a moment he forgot himself, as if the lights had been turned off. One thing Hyuk was sure of was that it was that bastard who first crossed the line of what was permissible in relation to his family, and the way he behaved could not be allowed to go unpunished. From that situation, the guy made an important conclusion, looking at his sister, that he would never again show this side of himself to the little girl. Hyuk silently hugged the little girl, showing her that he was nearby, and that he was no longer scary and menacing, thereby asking her forgiveness, but without words, and Zangin also joined them, as if telling his friend that he did the right thing. At dinner, Jean decided not to hide anything and tell his parents everything as it was from beginning to end, knowing that they would take his side. Without a drop of lies or doubt, the young man spoke about today's unpleasant incident without even looking away. The parents were horrified by what their children had to go through today, and that at that moment they couldn't even help them. Most of all, the father felt terrible from the mixture of so many feelings because he was close by and could have protected the children, but at the same time his son took on this role, and if you think about it, he was also still a child and was not obliged to take on such responsibility. Anger at the bastards and worries about his children took over, and the head of the family, unable to bear it, slammed his hands on the table and declared that from now on he would deal with such people himself. While the father left the table to cool down and look at the situation soberly, the mother began to worry even more, asking if the children were okay and asking for forgiveness for not returning home for a long time. Guan left silently and without turning around to face the others in order to calm his own ardor away from his family. Jean watched his dad, and with every fiber of his being, he felt that he was furious, which led to the thought that perhaps he shouldn't have said anything at all. The door to the room closed carefully, just like the parents' conversations on such a painful topic. One ordinary day, Hyuk returned from school but found no one in the hall, and no one responded to his greeting, which was a little strange. Having gone a little further, the boy understood from his father's conversation with Uncle Gi-jun that the topic of the attack by buyers on him and little Eugene was closed only for them, but between the adults the issue was being decided quite seriously. Hyuk remained in the role of an observer, realizing that the tension from that terrible evening had not gone away and continued to hover in the air while his father tried to resolve it. The only good thing was that the boy's father approached the issue calmly and with a cool mind, which his son actually inherited, and which everyone was surprised about no matter what it concerned. Zangin was also fine after that dangerous incident with the stupid customers, so he was happy to join his owner on the run. For the first time, adults ran faster than the boy, but in the opposite direction, which is why both the boy and the dog were shocked by what they saw. While the loafers were running away and discussing what they should do now, Jean couldn't even find a mental explanation for what he was just observing. Finally returning home, Hyuk heard a response to his greeting from his father upstairs, and also an offer to play a game of Go, which had not happened for a long time. At first, the young man was a little taken aback by what he heard because he really hadn't played with his dad for a long time, but then he smiled and agreed without trying to find any catch in it. While making a move in the game, Jean also let slip the words about whether any customers had come to them again today. The boy explained to his father that he was asking this question because he saw two men running away from him with a gift set of juice. Appa was again worried that his son had crossed paths with these freaks and that they could do something again, but he assured that he simply saw them when he was returning home. Guan even felt a bit uneasy, but he told Hyuk that those customers came to apologize, and Appa felt awkward because he didn't want his son to meet the people who threatened him, so he asked them to leave him. While the father was terribly worried and asked if his son wanted to hear an apology from those people personally, Hyuk lowered his head and smiled and replied that he did not want to meet with them, thinking that he had taught those pigs a good lesson. Now it was Appa's turn, but Jean spoke again, clarifying the guests that it was for this reason that Dad had called Uncle Gi-jun, to which he heard Dad's proud statement that in such a matter he would not call a friend because he could figure it out himself. The young man became interested in how his father had figured out this issue, and if at first Guan was beaming with pride, the next moment he realized that he had been taken by surprise. Just in case, Jean clarified whether Dad had done anything illegal and introduced him as a stern mafioso, but he deliberately said that he had simply warned those people about the consequences. Appa was ready to sink into the ground from what he would have to confess to his son, but he insisted on telling because he was curious. The fortress collapsed, and the father began to explain that first he made a call to the police chief, which is quite normal in such situations. But even such a call already surprised the guy, realizing what an important person Dad was talking to, although nothing terrible seemed to have happened. Hyuk was shocked by the following news. Dad also called the congressman's main office, as well as the head of the district, and in addition the head of the agricultural cooperative. Appa, seeing his son's face and burning with awkwardness, shared that he was thinking of calling the army commander again because it was just a couple of calls like all the others, but Jean couldn't believe how far his father could go. Modestly and awkwardly scratching his nose, Appa had already calmed down that there would be no more questions, but in the eyes of his son, he was no longer an ordinary experienced farmer and landowner, because where would he have such contacts? Smiling at the possibilities of his simple father, Hyuk joked in his head that he would probably be able to get through to the president soon. And after finishing the game, the guy understood the important truth that if you want to live like an ordinary person, then you must have the strength to protect your peaceful life, and the strength has nothing to do with violence. The time had come for the trip to Daegu, and Hyuk was just calling his mother from a phone booth to inform her of his successful arrival. Mom sincerely sympathized with the fact that her son was most likely upset because he couldn't go with his school friends, and even though that was the case, he even turned around but still said that he was okay. While the mother was comforting her son, He was thinking that it was originally intended that Taeyong School would participate in the finals of the national competition. But doubts crept in when Sol-chan injured his leg during training. The guy understood that although he was not guilty of anything, he felt that he was letting the team down and even tried to convince them that he would feel better before the competition. But coach Kim Young-tae made the unfortunate decision to withdraw their team, and thus Dasong Elementary School, which had placed second in the relay in the preliminaries, was given the lead by default. During a personal conversation, Mr. Young-tae told Hyuk that he spoke with the coach, so the guy will be able to take part in the race, which shocked him that he would do it himself, but Young reminded him about hard training. Gina was tormented by a feeling of guilt that his partner was injured and he would have to compete alone when they could have competed together. But then the young man got a slap from the coach with a remark to stop acting so guilty because it was not his fault that Sol-chan was injured, and reminded that the guy is not a turtle after all, so he needs to pull himself together and move on. In order to completely put the pressure on the guy, the coach reminded him that if he refused to participate, his fans would not be happier, so he should give it his all. The magic kick seemed to work, and at least the sour expression definitely disappeared from Hyuk's face, and in general, he simply resigned himself to his fate again. Mom was still telling her son something on the phone, but Jean periodically glanced at the door in case someone called him. The guy was not mistaken because one of his partners was actually knocking and calling him because it was already time to go. The guys rushed to their team, but if Hyuk was simply in a hurry, the young man who called him ran as fast as he could, as if he was late for the train. The boy's reaction was not without reason because the coach called the team stupid, shouted, "Can't they move faster?" and also smoked a cigarette, which in general spoiled the picture of him as a leader. The young man who called Jean already regretted doing it and began to apologize to the idiot, while Hyuk began to take note of who was in front of him. And in front of the guy was Lee Ju Jaeyoung, the track and field coach at Daesan Elementary School, and he looked extremely disgusting. Having called the students useless brats, Lee moved forward further, smoking a cigarette, knowing that they would listen to him, but not because they respected him, but because they were afraid. The guy gently asked Hyuk to go to the others already because they had fallen behind, while he noticed from the student's face that the coach was not only humiliating his team, but also beating them. Jean had no doubt that all those bruises and hidden wounds on the students' bodies were the work of the coach, and although it hurt him, he was glad that that idiot never raised his hand against him because this was a different school. It just turned out that because of Hyuk's inviolability, or more precisely because of the coach's terrible behavior, the students considered the guy an outcast. The boy was still waiting for Hyuk while he stood to the side, thinking that perhaps that freak was filled with anger and envy at the success of a student from another elementary school. The classmate couldn't stand it and grabbed his friend by the hand, asking him not to stand there like a pillar of paper because he would be scolded for this again, and Jean realized that as soon as he started talking to one of the guys, that scoundrel would rush at them with insults or fists. Hyuk understood why the guys were avoiding making a promise with him, and the reason for that was the despotic coach who didn't respect them at all. But it was precisely this attitude of the trainer towards the students that was the problem, because violence became the norm and the young guys turned into bullies, thus protecting themselves from everyone. The most interesting and sad thing at the same time was that Jean was used to being an outcast from his past life because loneliness haunted him. However, even such a sad experience cannot suppress Jin's desire to think about the kids from Taeyong Elementary School. Hyuk was kept going by thoughts of spending time with his friends and how great it would be to be here together. After all, remembering the training with the guys and the fun in the camp, Jean was charged with the energy that fed him during all the preparation and then at the competitions. Then, no matter how hard it was to do things with friends, they were ready to overcome all obstacles in a cheerful company, and there was no such heaviness in the heart as now. Jean stood and thought how great it would be to now create another happy memory like that time in Gongju. As soon as the guy moved from his place, his desire seemed to take physical form, and placing a familiar and strong hand on his shoulder called him by name. Jin's mouth dropped open in surprise when he saw behind him the concentration of everything he was currently thinking about. Coach Kim Yong-tae along with Park Ji-bum and Yeon Byung-taek were as happy to see their friend as he was to see them, but for now there was more surprise on their faces. It had been a long time since Hyuk had experienced such shock, thinking that maybe he was imagining it, because it never happens that desires come true so quickly. In his head, Jean was shouting to himself what his friends and coach were doing here, but in reality he stood rooted to the spot and was about to lose his jaw, while Yeon Byun laughed at his friend, telling the coach that the young man was seriously shocked. The guys couldn't stand it any longer and asked their friend if he really saw a ghost, and they answered themselves that he was really scared because no one warned him about the arrival. When Jean finally woke up and started bombarding his friends with questions about how they ended up here, there were classes today. Pak told how he and Yom literally clung to the trainer's legs and begged him to come, but he gave in. The guys also mentioned that Sol-chan couldn't come because his leg still wasn't feeling well, and the coach added in a friendly way that the brats are stubborn anyway, so they used the cover that it was normal for athletes to attend such events. Hyuk was brought back to his frozen state by Mr. Yong-tae's usual question about how he was feeling now, and this really helped the guy feel at least some response in his body. The young man looked at his friends and quietly replied that he was fine, but that was still a rather shaky conclusion due to the previous coach's appeals. Having finally realized that such important support was really nearby and would not go anywhere, the guy finally smiled broadly and and said definitively that everything was very good with him. Yeon-byung mentioned to his friend that they met his father at the bus stop on the way to Daegu, and Hyuk was shocked again because he was waiting for his father too, so he immediately asked why he didn't come with his friends then. The young man told Jin what his father had said about him needing to fill up, so he asked them to go, and when he showed up he would let them know. Today Jin has already had many emotional roller coasters, and now he exhaled again because his dad was simply delayed. While the guys were discussing that the udon that Mr. Guan bought them was very tasty, Jin himself thought about how difficult it is to live without mobile phones. Coach Young-tae noticed his student's stiffness and just in case asked the guy if it was okay that he was in pain here all alone, and at first he didn't understand the question at all. Mr. Young asked if the guy and his team had an escort and if there wouldn't be any problems if he just walked around here away from everyone, to which he heard a completely truthful question about the coach not caring about the young man. Looking forward at the coach and the team, Yun at first did not understand why the student was speaking about the man like that, but Hyuk continued this unpleasant conversation by asking a counter question that perhaps he was being treated like that because he was from another school. The coach grabbed the boy's hand sharply but carefully, asking once again whether he was being ignored just because he was from another school. Jin shook his head and Young-tae asked again if the young man was hiding anything, to which he shook his head again and replied that everything was fine. Now Young felt guilty explaining to the guy that he only found out all the details after he sent him here, where it turned out there was a coach with a bad reputation. The man sincerely admitted that if he had known such terrible information, he would not have allowed the young man to take part in the race. Gathering together, Mr. Tae concluded that the guy was not the type to lie, so he would believe that everything was okay with the athlete. Tae ruffled Jin's hair in a fatherly way and asked him to tell him right away if something was wrong, and at that moment Yeon-byung said that it was a friends group right now. The guy who had already gotten his fill from the would-be Traeger was still waiting for the new participant so that he wouldn't get lost. The boy was so happy to see Jin Hyuk running up that he even started waving his hand at him with joy. But the guy himself was not happy when he saw another huge bruise on the body of the completely innocent boy, which was covered by a t-shirt until he raised his hand. The stadium was decorated and prepared modestly, but even this was enough for people to gather in the stands. The entire work area was occupied by young guys who, under the guidance of coaches, were preparing for the race, warming up and chatting. While the frightened and downtrodden guys were taking their equipment for the race, Jin stood to the side dreamily, although in fact he was looking out at the guys in the stands. Coach Young and the boys had already taken their places, and when they met each other's eyes they waved to him as if they had established contact. Jin was excited because his father wasn't there yet, but even the presence of friends and a coach were important energy for him for the run. For the coach, who was alien to the joy of another schoolboy, all these smiles and waving to family and friends were disgusting, which made his already disgusting face twist even more. While the disgruntled coach turned in the other direction, the boy who was reaching out to Jin ran up again to ask if it was his family in the stands who had come all this way to support him, to which he heard that his dad wasn't there yet and that those guys were athletes from the Taeyong school. With a smile, the guy remembered Hyuk's stories about the Taeyong qualifiers and happily noted that the guys were probably very close after training, but the coach's menacing voice did not let Kim Haenum finish speaking. Under the coach's shouts, Haenum almost threw the equipment into Hyuk's hands and ran towards the idiot who was calling the boy whatever he wanted. The poor guy ran away out of fear of being beaten again, and Jin looked at his back and listened as the trainer literally screamed that they were all useless idiots, but fortunately it didn't affect him because he knew his own worth. Hyuk remained standing to the side, not understanding why despite the coach's shouts and the guy's looks Haenum still reached out to him. It was painful for a young man raised in a healthy and strong family and in the same environment to watch the bullying of students who on the contrary needed security and support. And Haenum stood like a reed that was about to break and listened to the coach's shouts, not even having the desire to say anything in his defense. Jin noticed the looks of the other guys and could only guess that maybe he looked pathetic to them. Looking at Haenum again, Hyuk mentioned that most likely this attitude towards him is really because he is from a different school. Not only physically but also mentally, Jin retreated first from the group, realizing that the guys were getting it because of him. He was used to being alone, so it wouldn't be difficult for him to go into the shadows just so the guys would take less. It was the moment when an adult woke up in the child's body and putting all his strength into a fist accepted again this painful feeling of loneliness, but this time as a knight in the name of good. The members of his team stood aside and did not follow him, but at the same time they followed their hero with their eyes. Coach Young-tae was shocked by what he saw, and the gesture his student made meant a lot to him. The race began and Jin, as always, pulled ahead, but this competition was different from the previous one. The guy was running, but it was happening automatically and not by feeling, and as it turned out Haenum was also quite persistent in this matter since he was only slightly behind his friend. The crowd cheered for every participant no matter the result, but the loudest for Jin was his support group. As Hyuk crossed the finish line, his friends and coach seemed to become even louder and their voices reached him over the rest of the shouts. The boys ran to their groups while the presenter announced that a new record could be set in the 100-meter race today. Coach Young-tae was so proud of his student that he said out loud that nothing else was expected from him, which is why the grandfather perceived Jin as his son and praised that the guy was really very fast. While the embarrassed coach was explaining that he was not the boy's father, the friends noticed that something was wrong with Hyuk and agreed that they were not imagining things. The guys looked at their friend from the stands and felt that he didn't want to be in this place, but when he was with them he literally flew. Feelings did not fail his friends because at that moment Jean really felt that he did not feel himself, nor the strip, nor the wind, nor the speed. Taking step by step, the young man caught himself thinking that this was a completely different feeling from how fun and exciting it was for him at the qualifying rounds. Compared to Hyuk's temporary coach, the others praised their students for trying and giving it their all, encouraging them for the next race. And Jean had never been so precise and bored running, so he decided to look at the stands again. The coach and friends showed him thumbs up, shouting that he was the best, and this is true because even if he had not come first, he would still have been supported. His eyes sparkled and a light flared up inside him the moment Hyuk felt the support of his real team. The guy patted himself on the cheeks, bringing himself to his senses and asking himself to give it his all because they had come all this way to support him, so there was something to run for. It was as if all the spirit that Jean had collected for himself bit by bit shattered at that moment because the temporary coach called his charges as if they were shitheads. The fool screamed about how a brat was able to outdo those who spent their entire days doing nothing but eating, training, and running. Hanem sat on the ground listening to how useless he and the other students were, and that if that was all they were capable of, then it was better for them to leave right now. Everyone turned their attention to Hanem, who couldn't even raise his head, let alone stand on his feet, and the others behind Jin's back began to discuss whether something had happened to the guy since he had been running so confidently before. Nobody knew what to do or how to help the poor guy because if the coach didn't care about his own children, then what can we say about the rest? Hyuk stood in horror from how many emotions were immediately overwhelming him, and on top of everything he had to make some kind of decision because if no one knew what to do, then at least he had to come up with a way out. Behind Hyuk, a large number of both competitors and coaches and even spectators were in the same shock as he was and also did not know what to do. From most people, all that was heard was regret about what happened to the student of an incompetent coach, but nothing more than words. Jean was torn to pieces by the fact that he did not know whether he should intervene and stop that freak, who could not even be called a coach, and at the same time he understood that Kim Hanem was in trouble because of him. Hanem sat on the ground and was afraid to move, and the worst thing was that he couldn't even cry because the fear of the coach was stronger than his feelings. A double wave of anxiety washed over Jean when he remembered himself from a past life when his uncle beat him to the hilt, and he realized that even if he didn't intervene, someone else would definitely help. Other coaches and their students continued to discuss the fact that the bad coach had a terrible character and that allowing himself to treat students like that was already a gross violation. The scoundrel heard how everyone was talking about him and it started to irritate him, so he needed to leave the field as quickly as possible. Instead of leaving himself, the idiot again focused his attention on Hanem and this time grabbed the poor guy by the collar and told him to finally get up because this was not his home to lie around. In the end, everyone who was upset about the guy left and the host even apologized for what happened on the field, and only Hyuk stood rooted to the spot. The host announced that the afternoon competition would begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but Jin's friends were more worried about whether everything was okay with the students from Daesun and whether the coach was treating their friend in the same cruel manner. Considering how Jean stood in the middle of the field and continued looking towards Kim, the guys seriously wondered if their friend was okay. Everyone who came to support Hyuk went to lunch with him, and the first thing they wanted to know was the guy's opinion about his temporary coach. The father expressed his hopes that his son would meet good people at the competition and gain experience, and then one of the guys suddenly said that the coach was crazy because even if the participants had a bad result, who would beat someone in front of everyone? Sun Guangyun was horrified by such news, but Hyuk immediately warned his dad that everything was fine and the coach had never yelled at him or raised his hand. The father looked closely at his son, who was telling the purest truth, but the worry in his eyes remained, and this time coach Kim Yong-tae spoke up saying that the freak generally didn't pay attention to Jean, and it was unclear whether he should be happy about that or not. Hyuk asked everyone not to worry and began to talk about how the training had been disappointing and wanted to explain what the competition itself was like, but his father interrupted him. The boy looked at his dad, not quite understanding what he had said wrong, and froze, waiting for something important to happen since his father would never interrupt him just like that. Guan briefly said that nothing hurts feelings more than being ignored by someone, and then added that although Jean insists that he is fine, he is most likely in pain inside. Dad really hit an open and fresh wound, which is why Hyuk lowered his gaze, which went out again, and then his head. The young man remembered how Kim sat on the ground, and there were a lot of people around, but no one dared to protect the child. And when Hyuk tried on those feelings, even rice began to taste like sand. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Hyuk and the other boys lined up at the start line as the announcer announced the imminent start of the boys' 200-meter race. A hapless coach stood off to the side of the line, and nearby on the bench sat students who had suffered at the hands of an incompetent senior man. No matter how much Hanem got from the coach, he did not stop watching Jean, even knowing that he could get it for it. The young man closed his eyes and took a deep breath in and out, telling himself to focus on the competition, which was very important because heavy thoughts about Kim did not leave his head. Opening his eyes, Hyuk reminded himself that he had already accomplished a lot, and that the last race of this competition was now ahead of him, which meant he needed to give it his all and not regret anything. The participants took a low starting position on the coach's command, and Jean already felt the adrenaline rush into his blood. All that was left was to hear the gunshot. The long-awaited sound sounded, which like a spring immediately accelerated the guy, and as always he broke ahead of everyone else. Everyone who was rooting for Jean seemed to be shouting from the stands louder than the rest of the crowd of people, and this gave the guy even more strength. Hyuk tuned himself like a high-speed car, forcing himself to take such a breath that his lungs would hurt and he would feel the impact of the track with every cell of his body while his head was empty. Kim looked at Jin from the side as if he were a ray of light in the darkness and a piece of hope that in a chain reaction made the guy feel alive too. And Sun kept running, feeling only the furious beating of his heart like the engine of a roaring car, and this intensified the feeling of life. The lead coach recorded the time of the race and at first even hesitated when he glanced at his watch, which showed an unrealistic figure of 23 seconds. When the new record was announced, the stands roared, and among all the other voices, the father's praise for Hyuk was heard, but the unfortunate coach could not stand it and kicked the fence. The host informed the guests that in addition to the 100-meter dash, a new Korean national record had been set for the 200-meter distance, and the coaches had indeed said among themselves that it would not be broken for the next 30 years. Jin waved his hand to everyone accepting congratulations while the coaches realized that they still needed to check the guy in Seoul, but at the same time it turned out that he was their Korean Carl Lewis. Hyuk was glad that all his efforts were not in vain, and now he was waving and looking at where the support group was sitting, and in his eyes one could read gratitude for the faith in him. The coach who was recording overheard the outraged jerk who hit Kim saying that in their country there is no support for track and field, so all the kids are giving it up and going into football or volleyball. One of those who wanted to congratulate the winner was Heenam, who ran towards his role model as if on wings. Jin didn't move from his place and tried not to even really turn to the young man as he was worried about the consequences, but the latter was already showering him with compliments and congratulating his opponent. Kim's face changed when Jin mentioned that he shouldn't have run to him because the coach would yell again, and he didn't understand why the guy still came up to him and talked to him because they weren't even friends. Kim's back became a wheel again and his head dropped down, and he told Jin that he was right about the coach, but at the same time explained that the guy came alone from his school, which means he was most likely lonely. Hyuk was shocked by how big and kind Haenam's heart was, if despite the consequences he still came to congratulate the stranger. Kim continued to sincerely admire how freely Hyuk ran, which made him want to run again. Jin felt goosebumps from head to toe after hearing this, because if he could give the desire to live on to the fullest in a person who had lost hope, then it was a miracle. Kim couldn't resist and even touched Sun, after which he said that it was precisely this new feeling that made him want to congratulate the guy, and added that even though they wouldn't see each other again after the competition, he was still glad to meet him. Already in the distance, Kim glanced at Jin once more and, waving goodbye, asked him to take care of himself for even greater victories. It was so noisy around, but Hyuk didn't hear anything except the words about loneliness that Kim told him, and the guy realized that he noticed someone else's pain because he once felt it himself. Jin was thinking that perhaps violence could be defeated by small gestures of kindness like the one he had just had with Kim, and just at that moment the young man was interviewed in honor of his victory. The guy was asked how he felt after setting 2 records in one day, and he calmly explained that he achieved this result because he gave his all to the competition. While the presenter was surprised that the guy was so calm during his first interview, the father quickly took photos, and after some successful shots, the girl asked if there were any difficulties during preparation for the competition. Hyuk indicated that there were indeed difficulties in preparation, and that the behavior of some coaches was to blame for this. The presenter's expression changed when she heard that during training other athletes were often compared to Jin, which led to them being subjected to cruel treatment. Hyuk showed with his body that he was uncomfortable, but continued to talk about how he realized that he could have been treated just as cruelly, which means that future athletes would be treated the same way. The coach stood to the side but heard everything while the students quietly waited for further orders. The freak suddenly became nervous when he heard the guy's opinion that he did not consider it acceptable behavior to publicly corporally punish students under the guise of developing talents. Jin knew that the bastard could hear and still said that he felt disappointed with such coaches. And when the presenter asked how exactly the young man could describe these coaches, Hyuk explained that he doesn't respect those who don't show due attention to students at such a sensitive age. The sun was already setting and Gwon and Hyuk were already driving home by car, but before that the father asked his son if he would like to watch the closing ceremony, but the young man refused since everyone had left. The trip between the two men couldn't go quietly, especially when a loving father is always ready to listen to his child and take care of him, so Gwon asked if Jin liked running. Hyuk did something a little different and asked his dad a counter-question asking if he liked his son running, to which his father explained that if the boy liked running he would support him in everything, which is why he worked so hard. Both fell silent, allowing the conversation to hang in the air and allowing each other to be silent and think about what was said, so the father, smiling and calmly, continued driving. Taking on the responsibility and the weight of the conversation, Gwon spoke again, first telling his son that if running is what he wants to do, then go ahead, but if he doesn't want to, that's also great. The guy was a little nervous for his own reasons, but his dad added that he would support his son no matter what he chose. Hyuk finally decided to admit that he would happily continue running if he didn't have to travel to another region, but he heard from his father that he would look for something, and besides, Uncle Ji-Jun is knowledgeable in this area. Jin suddenly delved into his past life and was surprised that President Hong Ki-jun understood sports, since the Secret Sports Fund was managed by his wife Yu Seara. Ji-Jun really understood the industry the young man wanted to go into, and not only did he understand it, but he was happy to help. Uncle June carefully watched the interview Hyuk gave after the competition and simultaneously sorted out the necessary paperwork. The most important part of the interview that Gi Jun recorded for himself was where Jin talked about a coach who beat his athletes under the pretext of developing talent. Jun went to the phone smiling at how the reporters were unable to stop the young man from saying too much. Hong greeted his brother on the phone and asked if he was already in Japan, and on the other end of the phone, his arrival was confirmed, to which Jun said that was great. Jun asked his brother if he could help him one more time, but this time it was really quite important. Hong tapped his finger on the folder containing the plan for the creation and operation of the Sikh Sports Foundation, saying into the phone that he would like to write an article about the problem of physical violence in sports facilities. When Jun's brother asked about the interview, he replied that it could be left to the channel's consideration and promise payment for activity and advertising. When his brother agreed, Hong was happy that he could put his trust in a loved one. After hanging up, Hong was pleased not only with the success of the case but also with the fact that a person like Hyuk was brave enough to make a splash in the sports industry. In the evening, Mrs. Yusei R.A. was pleasantly surprised when she heard from her husband that Jin had received a gold medal. The woman recalled that the young man had spent the entire holiday running with his beloved dog and was probably trying to get into track and field, but Hong replied that he had no idea about the details, although that was not true. You thought that if Jin was able to win a gold medal, then this was already a good indicator that he was good at what he did. Gi Jun suddenly asked the woman how she felt about doing a little sports, but she didn't understand anything about it, and her husband assured her that he would help because that's what he was there for. Yusei Ra's look spoke for itself when her husband started by saying that the gallery was rather boring, but that the education and support of future athletes was much better. The proposal from her husband sounded strange but not bad to you, and she took the bait and asked what Jun was planning to do, and whether it would be something like creating a fund, to which he explained that if the sustainability of the business is taken into account, a good foundation is needed. The most striking phrase for the woman was that Gi Jun's business needed a star player, and when his wife asked what it was, she heard about someone like a celebrity with his own manager and all the rest. Before making her final decision, Yusei R.A. asked her husband if he really thought Jin Hyuk had a talent for athletics. Jun calmly and clearly explained that with a well-organized management and development strategy, it would be easy to promote the young man, and this would bring him great success. Yusei R.A. suddenly imagined the host thanking her for the future of national sports and for supporting athletes and developing their talents. Gi Jun only added that the woman would not only become famous, but would also be awarded the title of Mother of Major Sports in South Korea. The poor thing opened her mouth when she imagined herself in the role of that very mother, and blah blah blah, it didn't matter anymore. While the dreams continued, Gi Jun also masterfully noted that they did not have to make Jin Hyuk the star player but could choose anyone else, just like with sports. Yusei Ra's thought processes had already begun, and she returned to Earth, especially after her husband warned her that there was no need to rush and that he would support her. The woman jumped up, almost falling, and screamed that it was not the time to be lazy and that she urgently needed her phone and shirt, and then Gi Jun realized that he could no longer stop her. The Hong family visited the Song family once again, and in any season, there was something to see, and this time it was the lushly blooming begonias, which is why Hyuk's mother Han Yu-young suggested that Soo-young paint her nails with petals like in the old days. The girl proudly declared that her mother's manicure was too expensive to paint it with begonias, but then Yusei R.A. told her an old belief that if the color lasts until the first snow, then the first love will be mutual. Soo-young couldn't find a place for herself, and tugging at Jin's shirt, she shouted that she wanted to paint her nails, right away hinting at her feelings for the guy. The girl pestered the young man, begging him to paint his nails together, but Hyuk tried to refuse this idea as loyally as possible, and then the girl's mother created an awkward situation by asking her daughter if she really liked Jin that much. The poor guy wanted to disappear into thin air when he heard Yu ask him what he would do if Soo-young asked him to kiss her. Soo-young's eyes kept darting from her mother to Hyuk, and she listened as the boy denied the provocative questions as best he could. The most terrible moment came when the girl who had the most sincere feelings for her friend asked herself whether he really wouldn't kiss her and why. When Hyuk answered as is that he simply did not intend to kiss Soo-young, even from behind Yu could see how the girl's face darkened. Everyone froze in horror from the awkwardness of the situation, and did not even know how to help, since initially everything was intended to be nothing more than a joke, but turned into something more. They tried to appeal to Soo-young, but she broke down in tears and ran away, shouting to the appa that she hated him. Jin froze, still sitting on the ground, and although he hadn't done anything, his heart was pounding wildly from the adrenaline rush, at least because Soo-young had run off to who knows where. The guy turned to his mother's, not understanding what the hell was going on, but he knew that he would have to go after his friend. It's a good thing Soo-young couldn't run further than the coast, since that was the closest place she liked to go with Hyuk. Jin Hyuk didn't exactly jump for joy when he found his friend, but he also felt better knowing that she was okay and back in his sight. The young man sat down on a rock next to Soo-young and asked her to return home because it was getting cold and it was time for dinner, but the girl turned away. The little girl was sad without any pretense and was silent, and her gaze dimmed, although she usually shone when looking at Jin Hyuk. The guy realized that his girlfriend was crying because her eyes were red, but he didn't understand whether his refusal really hurt her that much. Jin Hyuk knew that the moment was not particularly appropriate, but the more he looked at little Soo-young, the more he saw the adult girl from his past life. The young man remembered how Soo-young sometimes sat alone in the office with exactly the same sad expression on her face as she did now on the beach. Jin-hyuk couldn't answer himself why, but he didn't want to see his friend so sad either in her past life or at the moment. In his past life, to make Soo-young feel better, Jin-hyuk initiated the conversation and has not regretted it to this day. When Jin-hyuk directly asked his friend if she was upset, because he didn't agree to kiss her, the poor thing turned around again, all in tears and angry. The girl asked point blank if the guy really hated her, but was told that he didn't because she was like a younger sister, and immediately received a counterargument that he didn't kiss his own sister Eugene. Jin-hyuk felt very awkward again, but he explained that Eugene was firstly a real sister and secondly she was small, and again like a slap in the face came the argument from Soo-young that she was also small. The guy agreed that his girlfriend was indeed small, but things like kissing were not for prying eyes but their shared little secret. Soo-young seemed to have been replaced, and she again shone brighter than the sun, asking what could happen if she asked him to kiss her, when she and Jin-hyuk were alone, but the guy broke it. Again tears and screams from the little girl, not understanding why Hyuk can't kiss her now if they are alone, and no one sees them. The girl mentioned once again that Hyuk was kissing Eugene, and again heard that she was her younger sister, so Soo-young shouted that she would be like that too, and then she refused because they wouldn't be able to get married, and Hyuk became scared. In his mind, Jin-hyuk thought that Soo-young was still as smart as ever while she sighed heavily after such a brainstorming session. Soo-young made another attempt to clear up her misunderstanding, so she asked why Jin-hyuk didn't kiss her if he still liked her. The guy with all his might managed to squeeze out that he liked his girlfriend but in a different way, and after that he simply asked her to forget about it and stroked the little girl's head. There was a cunning plan hidden in the young lady's eyes that made her cheeks flush, and she needed to pluck up her courage. To be on the safe side, Soo-young asked again that it turned out her friend didn't hate her, and he sighed both from fatigue and also from relief that the little girl had spoken to him without tears. The little one went further and asked if Jin-hyuk liked her, and he answered yes twice, but as soon as he started explaining again that he liked her as a sister, the girl suddenly grabbed the guy's face with both hands. Soo-young took matters into her own hands and kissed the guy first while Hyuk didn't have time to do or say anything. The girl removed her hands, but at the same time she even managed to linger her gaze on Hyuk, which is more typical of adults. Only after the implementation of her insidious plan did Soo-young smile and shine like the clear sun again. But Jin-hyuk was as if he had fallen into a daze after what had happened, and for the first time he didn't know how to speak, let alone breathe. The dragonfly had already rushed home screaming that she would brag to her mother about her first kiss, and no longer heard Jin-hyuk's request not to do it. The guy was most shocked by the fact that he couldn't even imagine that his first kiss would be stolen from him like that, but there was no time to suffer because now he understood that he would die young at the hands of President Hong Ki-jun. The most interesting thing was that Hyuk looked after the running girl in the yellow dress and thought that she was finally at least smiling. The guy was convinced once again that a smile suits a person like Soo-young best, and it was nice that he was able to give her a reason for it. Still in the evening, sitting at the table in the living room, those who wanted to painted their nails with begonia petals as they had done before for fun. Jin also painted his nails while Ji-jun was surprised by the news about the kiss and immediately said that often boys are not interested in this and now they will laugh at the guy, but Ra immediately explained that it was Soo-young who begged for a kiss. Hyuk looked at Soo-young and thought that in her past life around this time her friend had gone to study abroad. The girl was happy with her painted nails, as if she too were a flower, while the guy was thinking about how there wasn't much time left until they met on vacation. Jin-hyuk also smiled and decided for himself that it would be great to create a couple of memories during the time that he and Soo-young were next to each other. Ra suddenly mentioned Jin-hyuk's upcoming middle school transition and asked him directly if he had any plans for the holidays and what he wanted to do. Jin wondered if it was really true that one of Hong's family's hobbies was to meddle in other people's affairs, but fortunately this time his mother spoke up and explained that the young man dreamed of living with his family for as long as he could, and he was very surprised by this. Ra mentioned that guys at that age are usually interested in a lot of different things and that Hyuk had won 2 first places in competitions, after which she asked the guy if he had thought about taking up sports and offered her help. Jin-hyuk already roughly understood that last time Uncle Ji-jun also mentioned the sports sphere. The young man guessed that the Hong family wanted to organize a sports foundation, which meant that his uncle would be the founder and his aunt would become the manager. Jin smiled and confirmed his mother's words that she was right, and he really would like to live an ordinary life. From the large house, loud laughter and conversations reached the begonias, which the unusual young man admired during the day, finally living his ordinary life. The new day began with Eugene saying good morning, but not just any morning, but some kind of bad morning, and no one still knew who she got it from. The baby was sitting on her brother's arm, and he was also carrying a watermelon in his other hand, and also said hello, surprised that the person they had come to visit was at home. Choi Tae-yong continued to work hard, while simultaneously answering Jin Hyuk's questions about how he spent his time and other things. Taeyong took 5 minutes and asked the boys why they had come to visit and heard that his mother had asked him to give him a watermelon, and the boy liked this news. Eugene again said an incomprehensible combination of words about the morning, to which Taeyong happily reported that the girl had already become so talkative. Jin Hyuk was like a personal translator, sometimes not understanding where his sister picked up some words from, like, for example, Young Yang Young is the girl's dad Gwang and Young Pup is Hyuk, and the most interesting thing is that very morning, which as it turned out is good fucking morning. The young man became curious about what Taeyong was doing and learned that it was an improvised fighting ring as the training center was under renovation. Jin Hyuk was surprised by this news, and Taeyong explained that someone sponsored all the renovations using the latest technology, after which the young man remembered that when he graduated from high school in his past life, it was a rusty shack. Sun was curious about who the sponsor was, but Taeyong scratched his head doubtfully and said that the coach didn't know at all and that rumors said it was either a graduate or someone local. Taeyong also heard that the sponsor was some director from the university, and now Hyuk mentally summed up that an unknown but successful graduate of Taeyong School, and now the director of the university, donated money for the restoration of the educational center. While Choi put the shovel in the ground to rest and eat a watermelon, Hyuk knew firsthand that successful people often sponsored their hometowns or schools, and this time it could be a university with a wrestling team that invests in athletes. Amid all the talk about sponsorship, Jin Hyuk only now glanced at Choi and asked who he intended to train with. Taeyong looked at the young man and smiled, but at first remained silent because he was also thinking about how to get out of the situation, and then simply answered that he didn't know, but it was a good question. Eugene was happily devouring a watermelon in the shade under a tree, but no longer in her brother's arms, and she didn't have to look for the young man. Mi Kyung was just feeding the baby while the guys decided to try sparring to see if they were good for each other as training partners. The little sister clapped her hands because Young Pup was able to knock down the big guy, and Mi Kyung sighed in disappointment that her brother was defeated again. Choi shook the dirt from his face and hair while Jin Hyuk stood in front of him, patiently waiting for the boy to recover. The guys sat down to talk, and Hyuk explained that if the opponent can predict the moves, then you need to take it not with brute force but with cunning and technique, and this was Choi's mistake since he continued to apply force in an attempt to lift the opponent. Jin's conclusion was that when the enemy is ready to attack or is already confronting Taeyong, he finds himself captive to his own power. Choi agreed but wanted to add something, and then Sun continued that people with short legs and little strength usually do not specialize in throws with elevation, and the guy admitted that this remark was fair. While the big guy was worried that he should have taken rubber tubes instead of rubber ones, Jin Hyuk looked at him and understood that he would like to help if the guy himself asked. Sun asked his Hyung about the low number of losses in matches before this, and the guy perked up and boasted that he even made it to nationals and won in sparring with third-year players. Hyuk mentally agreed with the elder because from his techniques, throws with lifting or suspensions with legs were impeccable, although the distribution of his weight and strength was not entirely correct. Choi won because his natural weight and height compensated for his lack of calculation, and therefore even if his technique was not perfect he could still win. Jin Hyuk stood up and suggested trying again, since he had not only calculated Taeyang's movements before. Sun wanted to spend another sparring attempt on applying a technique based on an analysis of how Choi fights, and he warned him about this, and the guy agreed. Jin Hyuk had a blue headband and Choi had a red one, and everything happened for the guys more or less like in a dance with a countdown and only then a fight. Half the size of Taeyong, the guy lifted him off the ground, making the big guy look like a bear caught off guard. Choi only had time to realize that he was about to feel a powerful throw on himself, and Hyuk's leg was already under the inside of his knee. Taeyong seemed to be standing on his own leg, but one had already fallen into the enemy's trap, and his body began to lean backwards. Choi lay with his back on the ground, and on his face, instead of anger or disappointment, there was a childish surprise at what had happened. The guy looked at the sky and thought about the strange feeling of losing more than 5 times in a row and still not being upset. Jin Hyuk distracted his Hyung from contemplating the sky, asking his friend if everything was okay or if he needed help. Choi sat up and instead of answering about his condition, asked Jin if he could ask him for a favor. The girls froze and stopped eating the watermelon, listening with interest to what the older one would ask the younger one. The favor Taeyong asked for was for Jin Hyuk to become his coach and sparring partner while the training center was under renovation. And even though Choi lost time after time while sitting on the ground, he did not give up and was glad that Hyuk stayed close and continued to help him. It was hard for Jin to forget that in his past life Taeyong had even managed to grow to Baekdu Changsa, which meant a prestigious title in the world of Korean wrestling, but the path was not always easy. Hyuk remembered how already as an adult he saw Mi Kyung, and she sighed heavily when they talked about her brother. A childhood friend shared her concerns about Choi's frequent knee injuries, which could have resulted in disability. Jin Hyuk looked at the still young wrestler and realized that if he was given the opportunity to help fix the problem, he should take advantage of it. So Sun told the big guy not to gain too much weight, which was very surprising because he didn't mention gaining weight, so Hyuk attributed it to the fact that everyone knows that wrestlers gain weight. While Jin was pouring water for the animals, he continued to explain to his friend that it was better to focus on technique because heavy weight weights put stress on the ligaments. The elder patted his knee, assuring that his ligaments were fine, but Sun insisted that for now the ligaments were fine because the fighter was young and light. Choi suddenly remembered that he had heard about changes in the rules of wrestling competitions that would come into effect next year, and when Hyuk asked what they were talking about, the elder said that everyone could participate. Sun, pretending not to know this, asked the elder again that now he really didn't need to gain weight, and although these were rumors of sorts that had reached Choi, he still wasn't sure about it. Despite the positive changes in the rules, Choi still admitted that he was confused by the chapasi throw, and Hyuk immediately explained that it was the same as a throw with a lift, and the confusion was due to the fact that he was unable to catch the moment when the opponent changed his position. Taeyong felt awkward, but he asked Hyuk if he could practice the technique on him to see if it would work. In turn, Jin also felt awkward because he didn't mind having his technique tested on him, but he immediately apologized for not training half-heartedly, and Choi understood this perfectly well. Choi became curious about where the younger one got such skills when he asked his partner about it, but Hyuk didn't quite understand what they were talking about. Taeyong clarified that it was interesting where Hyuk learned to explain so well and clearly point out shortcomings, after which he admitted that sometimes the younger one is better than his wrestling coach. Jin needed to think carefully before answering, since a lot of things were connected to his past life, and he remembered how his friend's older brother was involved in wrestling, and he watched and remembered. To make it more realistic, Hyuk said that he listened carefully to the comments on TV, and this surprised Choi, since for him this method of learning was for smart people. Sun put his hands to the ground, and there were still marks from begonia petals on his nails, and the guy thought that even the masters of mixed martial arts who learned vodka from action movies meant that he too was one of them. Choi asked his friend if it was time for him to go for a run and why he was digging in the sand. Taeyong was a little puzzled at first and froze when he heard from his temporary coach that they could wrestle one more time. The elder one was not averse to trying his luck again and becoming more confident and stronger, so he agreed to the younger one's proposal. The children's classes were supposed to last until the completion of construction, and thus lasted until autumn. The sisters continued to watch their brothers and their achievements with delight while sitting under the tree, and this time there was really something to see. After many training sessions, it was not Choi but Jin Hyuk who ended up with his back on the ground, which was an incredible victory for the future athlete. For a few seconds, Choi couldn't even believe that he wasn't lying on the ground, so he stared at Hyuk to make sure he wasn't imagining things. The silence was broken by little Eugene, who joyfully shouted that Hyungwon in Chan pupped this time and ate his fill of earth. Sun offered his hand to his partner to congratulate him and to rise, and with a smile said that he was happy for his friend's victory, which he had worked so hard to achieve. Taeyong silently offered his hand to his temporary coach, helping him to stand up, but still couldn't find the right words. Jin froze sitting in front of the winner, and the video showed him shaking, which looked strange, and because of this it was unclear whether help was needed. But the next moment Choi jumped up like a spring, overjoyed that he had finally achieved such a good result. Hyuk had to play along with the big guy a little while he joyfully twirled his partner around like a ballerina in a dance. With the onset of winter, Taeyong shared his victory at the national competition and presented the younger one with a thank you gift. Jin Hyuk also had his own grand plans, and one day his dad came to ask if the boy had packed all his things. And when he asked how his mom and Eugene were, he said that they had already left and Soo-young's family would also go straight to school. The first thing Jin heard when he went outside was his sister's joyful cry that Appa was coming and his mother, and Zangin greeted the young man with the same smiles. Hyuk hurried to his family while his dad followed him, and looking at his now grown-up son, he also smiled and couldn't get enough of it. This day was memorable at least because it was Song Jin Hyuk's graduation from elementary school. Soo-young, like a beautiful begonia in her red coat, was already waiting for her friend at the school, and as soon as she saw him she waved and called him to her. Gwon asked his friend how they got there and whether they had gotten cold while waiting, to which Ji-jun said that they had indeed arrived faster than expected, but that everything was fine. While the adults were discussing their things, Soo-young happily rushed to show Jin Hyuk her nails, which still had color on them. Sun was surprised that the color was actually still quite bright, and the reaction was not so much due to belief as to physical and chemical properties. The little girl revealed the secret that her mother also covered her nails with clear polish to make the color last as long as possible, which sounded like cheating to the guy. Soo-young, as always with her bright smile, reminded Jin that since the color lasted until the first snow, her first love was mutual. Sun looked at his friend with eyes full of affection, remembering how he also spent the whole summer with painted nails. Jin Hyuk stroked the girl's head, agreeing with what she said, which made the little girl glow even more. The host announced the beginning of the elementary school graduation ceremony. It was necessary for children and parents to approach the stage, and Uncle Ji-jun was already ready to film everything on camera. The first and most important thing the children did was to salute the flag, and the children, just like adults, proudly placed their hand on their hearts. The next stage was the awards ceremony, and the host explained that those whose names would be announced would go on stage. Surprisingly, Jin Hyuk was still standing next to Mi Kyung and was not called out, so he simply watched as the other children ran onto the stage. But in the end, the young man was also called to receive his awards, and Sun confidently walked towards the stage, not knowing what he would receive. In the end, an elementary school coach stood next to the host holding a stack of trophies just for Hyuk. The student was awarded for perfect attendance, as he had not missed a single day of school in 6 years of study, and also for raising the school's reputation by participating in various competitions. On top of all this, Jin Hyuk was also awarded for his merits and contributions. Sun received award after award, and the coach's face showed relief that such a heavy stack had finally begun to melt, and now the boy would carry it himself. It turned out that the stack was still small because then the presenter began listing awards for success in all school subjects, and in connection with all of the above, the village council awarded the student a scholarship. While the mother was in shock with her son and the scholarship for him, among other things, the father was happy that they made the right choice by arriving in a car with so many awards. Jin Hyuk looked at the stack in his hands, remembering how his father said that they had a small album and now he would be happy, while the host asked a 5th grade student to give a speech. The girl was a little nervous, so she had to clear her throat and first introduced herself as Shin Young-ju and repeated that she was in the 5th grade. The student asked the graduates to study hard in high school and watch their diet so that they wouldn't have to undergo treatment again. And after these words, both Mi Kyung and Kang Jin-soo felt better. After the student asked the graduates to take care of themselves, the host called the graduate representative to come on stage, so Hyuk had to return the albums to the coach again. Just as he had been calm during the first interview at the competition, the student now behaved confidently on stage in front of the teachers, parents of other students, and the other students. Song Jin Hyuk introduced himself to everyone and announced that today, he had the honor of delivering his speech on behalf of all the graduates. For an elementary school graduate, Hyuk spoke quite maturely, but all the teachers took it as something normal, hearing that the world itself is huge, but the world in which children live is very small. The boys also listened attentively to the fact that just like the mountains and houses in which everyone lives, the school is also like a small world. While Jin Hyuk was talking about how school was like a small fence, he was going over in his head what he had already managed to do, and one of them was the choice to start running. Having also told everyone that children cannot remain behind the fence forever, Heck recalled his acquaintance with the children during preparations for the competition. The young man said that he needed to take a step forward and see the big world, but he was thinking about that night when he first had fun with his friends. And thinking about his school coach, Jin clarified that the fence also protected them, which is very important for future generations. And with the words about how children can grow up happily behind the fence because wonderful people help them at school, the guy remembered the coach from the Taeyong school, Kim Young-tae. And Sun didn't forget to mention his good friends from school either, because the surprise his classmates had prepared for him would forever remain in his memory. In turn, the kids will never forget the face of their classmate when he came in and saw their surprise without expecting it. The smile was not only for those whom Jin brought joy, but also for himself, so after the surprises he burst into laughter at how great his life was. So Sun came to the conclusion in his speech that it was time to go beyond the cozy fence and step into a bigger world, and after that he thanked everyone who taught the graduates with love up until this day. The children were finally able to go to their families, and Soo Young, ahead of everyone else, ran up and congratulated her opponent, while the adults laughed at how the boy was showered with flowers. Uncle Ji-jun laughed that if you take a picture of Hyuk, then in the frame you will really only see flowers and not his face. The adults started discussing what to eat for lunch, since it was a holiday after all, and Guan suggested getting jjajangmyeon, which Hyuk had once wanted to treat his sister with his own money. Ji-jun casually mentioned that in Seoul, by modern standards, they don't eat jjajangmyeon, so he offered pork cutlets, and Hyuk's face changed so much that even little Soo Young noticed. Guan Young asked the guys to look into the camera to take a photo of them as a souvenir, after which Soo Young grabbed Hyuk's hand even tighter, and on the contrary smiled so hard that her eyes closed. Mi Kyung and her brother were passing by behind her, and immediately noticed little Soo Young, who had also come to the graduation near Jin, and the poor thing shrank from the voice of Hyuk's friend. Mi Kyung was asked if she would like to take a photo too, and she replied that if possible she would be happy to, but Soo Young did not like it. Mi Kyung, without any thoughts, came up from the other side and took Hyuk's hand, sharing that it was quite cold to stand near the stage for so long, and asked her friend if he was cold. At that moment it was necessary to photograph only Soo Young because her reaction was priceless, while Jin once again explained to me that she needed to gain muscle mass, but she refused when he suggested running. Soo Young was already crying and forgot how to breathe, but there was a normal conversation between friends in which Mi Kyung once again repeated to the annoying and nauseating runner that she would not waste herself on sports. It got to the point that Hyuk finally turned his attention to the baby, not fully understanding what was happening, but was ready to help. Jin Hyuk immediately asked if Soo Young was already strong but cold, if she was shaking so much, but the girl did not answer and clung to his hand even more. Guan Young reminded the guys to look at the camera, while Mi Kyung looked at Soo Young's tears in bewilderment, and the girl was choosing a face, and between them Jin Hyuk was already completely confused. The countdown began for taking a photo as a souvenir, and the parents looked happily at their children. While Hyuk and me were still able to smile for the camera, Soo Young showed her serious intentions with her eyes until the very end. And when the three sounded, Jin smiled with all his might, because such a moment would happen once in his life, and he would like to remember it exactly like this, so that later he could talk about February 1992 when changes in the world affected the graduates. Hyuk sat in the bathroom and read a newspaper that wrote about the emergence of many political parties and the same number of candidates. While his mother was cutting his son's hair, he thought about whether people really were so obsessed with power that they could live peacefully. Han Yu-yun found it hard to believe that her son was already so grown up and would now go to high school, and this touched Hyuk, so he asked his mother not to worry. In his own way, the young man also felt sad, not so much because of high school but more because the time spent with his family was flying by inexorably quickly. Jean looked at his hands, remembering what high school was like, and nothing else came to mind except the conclusion that this is a place where children instinctively begin to assert their dominance and create a hierarchy, and that strength is synonymous with authority. While the young man was pouring out philosophical thoughts about life and how he should control his powers and graduate calmly, his mother had a moment of panic. Instead of his usual haircut, Jin Hyuk had the opportunity to try out a new look in middle school. The poor mother hesitantly asked if her son would like to wear a hat to school for a couple of weeks, and when the boy asked what had happened, she replied that it was nothing serious. Guan greeted his new son with a smile, wondering if he really wanted a new haircut just in time for his new school. Dad allowed himself to laugh a little, but at the same time said that the guy looked so cool, as if he was going to join the army. The father played a primitive melody on the guitar to give the absurd incident a special charm, and all that was left was to add the lyrics. And the lyrics of the song were about someone who was leaving home and getting on a train on the day when it was time to go to the army, and then subtitles appeared on the young man's face. The changes from the unfortunate haircut did not stop as Jin Hyuk turned his attention to his sister, who surprisingly stood to the side and did not approach. The little child looked with caution not at his own brother, but at a stranger, since all children at that age perceive sudden changes in their relatives as a threat. Jin Hyuk reached out to his sister for a hug, but the girl quietly said that this was not an appa but a stranger's uncle. The baby ran away, and now Hyuk not only had a bald spot on the back of his head, but also a hole in his heart. Dad wanted to say something about his son's hair to cheer him up, but Mom pointed with her finger that it would be better to remain silent this time. In middle school, Taeyong-ji needed to find his class nameplate, and that was no problem. In his new uniform and with a new haircut, the boy looked completely different, and when he entered the new class, he felt a little insecure for the first time. There was noise and hubbub in the classroom, as most of the students were already there and some already knew each other. Jin Hyuk sat at a desk by the window looking at everyone in the class, but he was thinking about the fact that someone hadn't come and was trying to figure out if it was because the wrestling team had morning practice on the first day of school. Some student kicked the door open, angrily asking who dared to hit him, and then run away. The first person the bully approached was Jin Hyuk, and he was immediately asked point-blank what his problem was and why the hell he was still sitting there. The boy concluded that he hadn't seen the new guy before and asked what neighborhood he was from, while Jin mentally wondered if the young man would really be so disgusting on their first meeting. As Song thought more and more, but remained silent, he heard a stern question about what he was staring at and why he wasn't answering, and a familiar voice was heard from behind asking the bully Oh Young-dae to leave the guy alone. So far, meeting the man who was standing at the door was the most pleasant moment for Jin Hyuk on his first day of middle school. At the threshold of the door stood Cho Sol-chan, the same young man from Hyuk's 3 friends from the competition with whom he once had a great time. The bully didn't get it the first time, so Sol-chan repeated it again to tell him to stop addressing people like that, especially those he was seeing for the first time. Having drawn the scoundrel's attention to himself, Sol-chan stood calmly even when he approached him like a bull and told him to repeat what the little bastard had mumbled. Oh Jong-dae grabbed the young man by his clothes and asked why the hell he was protecting the new guy, and then added, do the brats really know each other? A hand fell on the bully's shoulder when he began to teach the younger one in a raised voice how to communicate with him. Jin Hyuk simply asked the elder to let the student go and leave the classroom, but it took the creature with a meager amount of brains some time to understand what was said. The bull was not going to listen to some little brat and started telling him something, but Sun asked him to listen carefully again. The young man looked at the bully and told him to get out while he had the chance, after which fear flashed in the young man's eyes. Cho Sol-chan cleared his throat while Jong-dae hurried out of the classroom, and rumors had already spread among the students about Jin Hyuk that he had gotten rid of someone who was often ignored so easily. Sol-chan was finally able to greet his friend normally, noting that the guy had grown up again and now looked like a sunbae, and Jin in turn asked how the boy's leg was doing. Sol-chan shared that his leg was fine and that he didn't know about his friend's enrollment in Taeyong High School. Jin Hyuk then asked about the other kids, and it turned out that Park Ji-bum was on the soccer team in Suwon, while Yeom Byung-taek was in Chan's class. A friend wanted to know if Jin Hyuk would continue running in middle school, but he wasn't sure yet, and the bell just rang for class, so the friend left saying he'd be back during recess with Byung-taek. Sun looked out of the classroom when Sol-chan was leaving because he noticed 2 tall students who he also clearly remembered from his past life. Shin Woo-sung and Lee Sung-hoon were the guys in Hyuk's past life that he met at Taeyong High School, and they were like older brothers to him. Hyuk was so happy to see the guys that he greeted them, emotionally forgetting that the guys didn't know him. Woo-sung asked his friend if he knew this guy, but the guy replied that he was seeing him for the first time, and only at that moment did Jin realize what had happened. The young man's body went limp from awkwardness, and he pretended to wave to Sol-chan, who was behind the guys, and it worked. Sun sat down at his desk sighing heavily because of 2 problems at once, one of which he remembers everything but the others he doesn't, and from this flows the second where he feels awkward. The young man turned to look at the guys who had already changed their clothes and returned to class, and in Jin's head there were a bunch of thoughts about those same two friends from his past life who were those few valuable people for him. Jin remembered how the boys wrestled and protected him who was weak from all the problems that were plentiful at school. But Hyuk was only happy to be friends with the guys, and in exchange for his protection, he helped them with their studies, homework, and other things. The smile never left Sun's face as he remembered that even in high school guys would come visit the younger one from time to time and find out if everything was okay. At that moment Hyuk had such a face that those same friends from the back rows were only more afraid of the new guy, and Jin was simply flooded with memories from watching young and energetic faces. We had to stop floating around in the clouds because the teacher came in and said that she would be the class teacher this year and introduced herself as Kim Sang-yuk. Miss Kim immediately got down to business and announced the first task of choosing the class president, after which everyone immediately looked at Hyuk. The principal didn't immediately appoint the student president. She first found out the guy's name, but the poor guy was already shocked because he really didn't want to become president right away. The young man explained in the most cultured and polite manner that he did not want to be the class president and prayed silently that he would be heard. Jin Hyuk had a mantra in his head that he wanted to live a quiet and ordinary life since he was already a class monitor in elementary school, and the teacher was a little upset but asked the class if there were any volunteers among them. Sun understood from the looks on the boys' faces that they doubted their abilities, since being a class monitor in the first semester carries the risk that they might turn against you. Jin Hyuk tried to make his look full of confidence and convey to the guys that they can do anything and he believes in them. But in fact it turned out that Sun looked so good that his classmates realized that it would be better for one of them to become the class president, especially given that the guy had kicked out Oh Young-dae in the morning. Jin Hyuk looked at the unfortunate guys who were caught between two fires and read in their faces not the fear that he had inspired in them, but the fact that the guys were not thrilled with the leader's idea. Suddenly, one of the students volunteered to be president so enthusiastically that his cry was echoed by almost everyone. The teacher beamed with delight at the sight of such a forest of hands, and then came the shouts of those wanting to be vice president. The manager and Sun simultaneously breathed a sigh of relief as there were more than enough people willing to participate. In the end, the board still listed Song Jin Hyuk as president and Choi Kyu-hong as vice president, and after that the teacher asked everyone to applaud the candidates. While the vice president was very happy with his position, Hyuk could barely contain his emotions as he blushed and was deeply indignant that he did not want his status. And when the vice president told the class monitor that from now on he was counting on him, Hyuk almost cried from such a punishment, calling everyone in the class vengeful brats. The bell rang for recess and it was just time for lunch, so the teacher wished him a good appetite, but instead of eating, Hyuk was interested in where his two friends had gone before they had even eaten their lunch. It was obvious from the guys that they were puzzled by something, or maybe even upset, since they often walked with straight backs and smiles, but here Shin Woo-sung was holding his own hand as if he was worried about something. Hyuk couldn't help but follow his friends, and the first thing he heard when he looked around the corner was the rude treatment from other students who demanded money. Jin couldn't believe that these two kind, healthy guys were enduring such humiliating treatment because the bullies had warned him that if there was no money they would have to steal it. The guy was shocked by this turn of events because he didn't remember from his past life the moment when his friends were humiliated at school. Hyuk's hands clenched into fists with anger, and he didn't doubt for a second that right now, he would go and protect those who once gave him safety. The scoundrel first insolently asked what the hell the brat from the first year was doing here and added, will he really give money instead of these two weaklings? Jin Hyuk calmly approached, explaining that he was indeed a first-year student, and he was interested in why students were hanging around behind the school secretly from the teachers and tormenting the younger ones. Sun didn't stop at putting moral pressure on the bastards, but in addition he took out a wad of money and directly asked if this was what the scoundrel was looking for, shocking everyone. The freak seemed not to have heard what the first-year student was saying, as he was used to him putting people like him in their place, and even now he called Sun a crazy bastard. The idiot swung at Hyuk, shouting, how dare such a brat speak in such a tone to his elder. Sun watched as a hand approached his face, and behind it the question arose, was the little brat really tired of living on the first day of school? Meanwhile, the little sister was also training, building up muscle mass by carrying Zangin in her arms, who had simply already resigned himself to his fate. The mother sat in her son's room looking at his small school bag and feeling sad about how quickly time had flown by. Han Yu-yun took a break from cleaning and sat down to look around her son's room and wondered to herself that the school was in the city. Unfortunately, the location of the educational institution upset Hanyu, but she understood that she could not keep her son under her wing for long. The mother's anxiety for her child had its own reasons, one of which was that fortunately Jin Hyuk does not yet know who the uni is, which means that even if they meet, they will not recognize each other. Hanyu reassured herself that everything was fine and the horror she had once experienced would not happen again. The day when even her father passed away remained forever in the woman's memory, because those she trusted knew that the family's fortune was invested in supporting her father in prison. Back then, as a girl, Hanyu shed many tears and experienced animal fear from those who would never have treated her so cruelly, but but they proved the opposite to her with the help of physical force. And Han Yu's stepmother and stepsister's family behaved heartlessly and greedily until the very end. Unfortunately, young Han Yu experienced terrible publishing, both moral and physical, and there was no one to help. Even when the girl found out that the Uni family had opened a tea shop in the city, she did not dare to approach it, as it would have cost her a lot. Han Yu's salvation in life was her marriage to Song Guanyun, as it was the only way to escape from what she was going through. A woman will never forget how she begged her husband to live where no one would know them so that this would not reach their unfortunate relatives. Han Yu was so afraid of the past that she couldn't say a word about her family to anyone, but everything changed with the appearance of Guan, since he didn't ask anything, and she could finally live in peace, and this peace continues to this day. Another ray of light in the woman's life was her little girl, who even now calling her mother pulled her out of her bad thoughts. Han Yu was happy to see her daughter playing with Zangan and that she was having fun, and that is the most important thing for any mother. The woman thought about how her children had grown up so quickly, and that this gave her the feeling that her world was becoming increasingly small. Han Yu was brought back to reality even faster when she glanced at the time and realized that it was already past lunchtime. Eugene happily ran home shouting that she was about to have a delicious meal, and her mother followed her. Han Yu couldn't help but think that Hyuk was also having lunch, and she wondered if he had managed to make friends with anyone. The woman believed that her son was weak both physically and psychologically, which is why she was worried that no one would bully him, although Hyuk himself at that moment on the contrary showed that he was doing well. The one who swung at the freshman received a sound slap in the face, which was a double surprise because the first was that such a little brat couldn't hit. Not only did Jin Hyuk slap his elder brother, he also did it with his modest wad of cash. Sun himself was a little shocked that muscle memory worked faster than the brain could figure out, and it was all due to wrestling training. For the first time, Jin Hyuk was faced with the fact that everything went a little differently than planned, but not because he wanted it that way, but because circumstances forced him to. Anger washed over the man whom Sun was really going to give money to take his friends and go back to class. But plans changed dramatically when the older student wanted to immediately teach the younger student a physics lesson instead of words. Jin Hyuk had nipped this kind of behavior in the bud for as long as he could remember, and that's what happened this time. When the guy managed to intercept the hand that was attacking him, he realized that only he wanted to solve the problem with words, and for the others this was no longer relevant. So Jin Hyuk stood with the student supposedly older and stronger than him, but while the senior student was puffing and asking if the younger one would let him go, Song asked him to be careful with the answer to the question of whether there would be more bullying of friends. Everyone else stood in shock, afraid to talk to any of their guys or even move, while in the distance Jin could already hear an angry growl from his opponent. The elder was already starting to get annoyed that the brat was embarrassing him in front of everyone, but he still didn't answer the question, so Sun reminded him that he was waiting. Instead of an answer, there was a cry of "damn bastard," and the opponent swung his knee at Jin Hyuk, but the young man immediately intercepted this attack while continuing to hold his fist. As a result, the elder one lay on the ground for some time unconscious, having received a good blow to the bridge of the nose. At first, the henchmen of their leader were quite nervous that such a small boy could take out a student who was bigger than him with one blow. But the next moment they decided that if they both ran at the little one and screamed like they were sick, then maybe they would scare him off and at least take the older one. Sun's friends, who didn't even know the guy yet, instantly turned pale from how abruptly their classmate taught a lesson to the rest of the seniors. Jin Hyuk honestly offered to take the money at the very beginning, but the elders were more itching to get it, so now they would not only have to somehow bring themselves to their senses but also pick up the money from the floor. While the high school students were recovering, Sun warned them just in case that if they wanted to mess with his friends again, they would regret it very much. The young man glanced at the poor fellows, and in his mind, he hoped that he had not beaten them too badly, and that they would now be able to hear the information he had said, since otherwise he would have to beat them again, which he did not want. Jin turned to his friends, who were still standing in a stupor, and called them to go to class since there was nothing else for them to do here. The boys were glad to finally leave the yard and go to class and didn't even think about stopping and helping the scoundrels. Sun was also wondering if he had gone too far on the first day, since considering that they were high school students, he clearly had not calculated his strength. The guy's anxiety was understandable, since it would take some doing to get into such a situation on the first day of the new semester. The situation with the beating spread instantly and reached the Sun Bay through the screams of other students who tried to wake him up. One of the students rushed to the senior to inform him that Man Soo-hyun had gone to Taeyong High School to teach some boy a lesson, but the senior didn't understand why the gentle big guy needed such a showdown. The student, still in the same panic, told his Sunbae that some first year had beaten up a gang of guys from the club, and the senior thought it was funny. When a high school student tried to remember the name of a first-year student, he tried many options, but none of them were right, and the Sunbae listened attentively. The student went through the last two options for the name of the one who beat up the elders, and if the first time it was Sun Jin Gyak, then the second time it was named correctly, and after Sun Jin Hyuk's words, the Sunbae was in shock. The guy jumped up from his desk and ran so fast that he almost fell asleep, worried about his friend Mansu. The student shouted after him that the Sunbae was really running to Minsu because he could kill someone, but the guy was worried that the big guy would not be killed. The first year's lunch was interrupted by the threatening voice of the senior, who upon entering the classroom immediately asked where Song Jin-hyuk was sitting. Behind the big guy were hiding those cowards whose asses Hyuk kicked behind the school, and they decided to hide behind the Sunbi's back. Jin-hyuk calmly replied that it was him and began to get up from the table, asking the man he met who he was and what he was doing in high school. Instead of answering, Man-soo grabbed the younger man by the shoulder of his jacket and lifted him up sharply, which was not surprising since they had complained about the guy that he was bad. The Sunbae hovered over the boy and sternly asked how the brat dared beat up the wrestling team on the first day of school. One of the cowards called the elder, but he did not listen because Jin-hyuk directly asked if the would-be fighters had told the reason why they had to be taught a lesson. Man-soo was angry but still asked what the younger one meant and that it would be better for him to tell everything as it is now, otherwise he would get into trouble. A dream without repainting pointed a finger at his opponents and explained that his elders bullied his friends, forcing them to bring them money, and when there was no money they threatened him and told him to go steal from someone. Man-soo was indeed a gentle big guy, as with disappointment in his eyes, he turned to those he had originally come to protect and asked if everything he had just heard was really true. Naturally, the scoundrels looked down, realizing that if they started lying now, it would not do them any good. The silence from the suspects angered Man-soo, but he was no longer in a hurry to draw conclusions, as he had probably already made a mistake and now wanted to sort things out properly. Man-soo removed his hands from Sun and asked the boys if it was true that the elders who stood behind them were bullying them. The boys started mumbling because they were already scared, which is why the Sunbae couldn't stand it and asked if the boys' mouths were sewn shut so they couldn't talk about their problems. Jin-hyuk looked at Man-soo, realizing that he was not here to scold, but to find out the version of the incident from all sides. Sunbae was already uncomfortable with what was happening, or rather nothing was happening, so he scratched the back of his head and exhaled to start over. The elder calmly addressed both Woo-sung and Sung-hoon with a request to be honest now until the end, since this would help everyone. Jin-hyuk also did not leave the boys in a difficult situation and supported the elder in asking his friends to tell everything as it is. Poor Song-hoon couldn't take it anymore and even started crying, but his friend next to him still held on, feeling trust in Jin, which meant he could tell everything to his Sunbae. Woo-sung said for himself and his friend that from the first day of middle school those elders persecuted them and forced them to carry out various tasks against their will. Through his tears, Sung-hoon confirmed what Jin-hyuk had said about extorting money or stealing it from someone. At that moment, Man-soo felt so sad and ashamed that his elders had not only done terrible things but also dragged him into it. Sunbae put his hand on Woo-sung's shoulder and said that he was sincerely sorry that this had happened to the boys and that because of fear they couldn't even go to him, but he didn't notice anything and didn't act like a real senior protector. It was like a weight had been lifted from Jin-hyuk's shoulders when he saw that not only had his friends become his friends again, but they had also received protection from the elder. Sunbae didn't forget about Sun either, so she turned to him and addressed him so the guy listened attentively. Man-soo admitted his mistake and apologized for his rude and harsh treatment, but Jin-hyuk said that everything was fine and he also understood how the situation had developed. The scary Sunbae turned to the culprits of what had happened and muttered through clenched teeth that he would deal with them later. Before leaving, Man-soo once again apologized for today's incident and suggested meeting next time under different circumstances, but when Song wanted to tell the elder to take care of himself, shouts and loud footsteps were heard. The eldest one burst into the classroom shouting where Man-soo was, and he ran so fast that some thought an earthquake had started. Sun heard something familiar in the voice of the searching Man-soo, but he hadn't yet managed to see who had burst in on them, but the guy continued to shout for the elder not to touch the first year and vomit. Man-soo took his friend to the water on the street and suffered because he ran so fast that his stomach couldn't take it. Sunbae was finally able to explain that he heard the big guy go to middle school and thought that something serious had happened, after which he asked if his friend was injured anywhere, to which the friend said that it would be better if he thought about the first years. The elder wanted to say something about being worried about his friend, but he realized that Man-soo was also right in his own way about the kids and their protection. Man-soo asked his friend if he knew that there had been strange rumors about the wrestling club lately, and the guy asked why. Sunbae told everything about the bullying from the elders towards the younger ones and about the theft as well. Min-soo was only glad that now he had direct evidence to put the scoundrels in their place. Jin-hyuk walked home with his bicycle, thinking about how light his soul had become because he was afraid that wherever he asked for a part-time job he would be refused. But the employer, even after learning that the guy was from middle school, looked not at his age but at the guy's independence and the fact that he had a bicycle at hand. The elder asked Sun to take on 2 newspaper delivery routes and accordingly double the pay, but the boy said that he could only take one since he had a younger sister at home. The employer's emotion knew no bounds when he heard how caring the young man was, but Hyuk denied such a reaction as he simply wanted to treat his family to fried chicken, and his uncle would have been delighted with that too. Walking down the street, Jin-hyuk turned his attention to where the schoolgirls from his school were walking, but there was something wrong with them. The poor guy turned pale and felt an animal horror when he realized who one of the girls was, so he had to act quietly but quickly. Sun ran around the corner of the house, repeating one phrase in his head: what the hell was she doing here, and why exactly now they almost crossed paths. The young man had not experienced such fear since the time when he was with his uncle, because the girl who was walking down the street was Hwang Jia-yoon. The girl was the second daughter of Uncle Hyuk, who in his past life treated him harshly and killed his dog. His heart was pounding wildly because Song really hoped that in this life he would not meet anyone or anything connected with the tyrant, but it turned out that the girl was also a student at the same Taeyong school. Evening out his breathing, Jin Hyuk continued to tell himself that his uncle's cafe was in the city, so it was no surprise that he and Jae-yoon crossed paths like this. To some extent, Song tried to reassure himself that Hwang Jae-yoon most likely did not know him and did not know what their relationship was until he introduced himself first, of course. The guy decided for himself that it would be better for him to take the long way home today just in case, and he slowly headed in that direction. Jin Hyuk decided that he absolutely did not want to get involved with a girl in this life no matter whatever. There was just something that went beyond the young man's plan, and it concerned another side that he did not want to let into his life, but it was not a fact that people themselves would not be drawn to him. After meeting a familiar stranger, Hyuk was flooded with memories of how his aunt called him a communist bastard in his past life. The shadow of seemingly close people dragged behind the guy like terrible memories even in his current life. And the whole thing was just that the surnames of Hyuk's mother and aunt were different, since the latter was the daughter of another wife of the guy's grandfather, who was the biological father of Han Yu-young. During Han Yu-young's student years, her father went to prison for helping the enemy, and the same memory recently overwhelmed the woman herself, which is why she was afraid of the Uni meeting her son. Jin Hyuk still remembered how in his past life, he held the papers that he had passed the first stage of the National Judicial Examination, but his aunt's words about the boy's communist pedigree were louder than his academic success. Sun looked indifferently at the exam certificate, as he was sure that due to his family's past, he would be rejected in the future even after a successful interview, so he did not go to the second stage. The certificate went into the trash, and the guy realized that the desire to become a civil servant wasn't really his, and the root of the problem was something completely different. The problem was his uncle, who used the fact that Hyuk had passed the bar exam as collateral for borrowing large sums of money from various places. Jin Hyuk's refusal to pass the second stage of the exam led to the death of his uncle by a moneylender, and accordingly the disappearance of his aunt and her daughters. Sun was walking home with his bicycle when it was already dark, and was thinking that only because he refused to continue the tyranny in his life did he get into sake-heavy industries, and even though he later got into an accident and returned to the past, it was still the best outcome. The guy firmly decided for himself that he did not want to meet in this life any of those who brought him pain in the past. Luckily for Jin Hyuk, time flew by in June with his studies and part-time job, and when his boss gave the guy his last job, he said that it was very sad to part with him, but he gave him the money and said that he even added a little. Jin Hyuk enjoyed working part-time as a newspaper delivery boy in the evenings, which paid even better than the morning ones. Sun already knew that for morning shifts the manager either collects the payment himself or asks for it to be sent by mail, but for the evening shift the delivery man delivers the receipts and collects the payments himself. Some people even gave Sun pocket money, happy that the student, although young, was striving to earn money, which showed independence and development. Hyuk was walking between delivery points one day and caught sight of a bin full of shoes, including a pair of sneakers that he liked. It would seem that the guy simply glanced at the sneakers, and memories from his past life came flooding back, as at that time he didn't even have pocket money, so he was used to buying the necessary things with his salary as a delivery man. Hard times taught Sun to manage his money wisely, and so he put everything he had into a savings account to be prepared for independent living, since he had no one to rely on. But finally blind saving was left behind, and in his current life Jin Hyuk believed that he had done well for a single person in his previous life. The long-awaited moment arrived when Jin Hyuk walked into the establishment and asked for 5 servings of fried chicken, but immediately changed his mind and asked for 6. The saleswoman was delighted that someone was planning a large dinner and warned that everything would cost 30,000 won. The woman did her job, but she couldn't help but talk about her relative, who was also a student, but Hyuk was thinking about his own. The guy thought about how long it had been since he had been in the establishment, and turning around to look at the seats, he immediately remembered the last time he came with Woo-sung and Sung-hoon to celebrate how grown-up they had become. Hyuk's friends laughed at him when he tried fried chicken for the first time, washed down with cold beer. While Sun was enjoying his memories, the saleswoman had already called him and informed him that the order for 6 servings of chicken was ready. Any comments were unnecessary because the fried chicken looked divine, and now the hardest thing was to quickly bring it home. But thoughts still returned to the bright head of the young man, and the first thing he thought was how appetizing the food looked, and immediately after that his mother would definitely like it. Jin Hyuk was once sitting with his mother in front of the TV and remembered how delicious fried chicken looked to her, but it turned out that she had never tried it because she lived in the village. Hanyu liked the chicken that was sold at the market, but Song knew that real fried chicken couldn't compare to regular chicken because it was made from freshly cut chicken, and now the main thing was to get home as quickly as possible while the food was hot. The first thing Jin Hyuk saw in the yard was the car of the Soo-young family, but it was unclear what brought them there at such a late hour. Dad was glad to see his son even though he arrived quite early, and Uncle Ji-jun was also happy, but not so much for the boy as for the fact that he brought something so interesting there. For a moment Sun forgot about the dinner he had been dreaming about because he saw President Ji-jun's car, but looking at the bags he remembered again. The guy was glad of his resourcefulness, as if he felt that he really needed to take 6 portions and was not mistaken. The weather was beautiful, so the family and guests decided to eat outside, and they were pleasantly surprised to find G.I. June's chicken for dinner. President Hong suddenly said that one lifetime is enough to see everything and added that he would never have thought that he would eat the chicken that Jin Hyuk would buy and bring. The only one who understood his uncle's words was Hyuk, who was moved to the marrow of his bones because it was G.I. June who smiled at the guy before the car accident. And this was the moment when the young man spoke about his dream of an ordinary life. The Appas were talking about Sun's successes as he had already managed to take first place in the overall standings at the Spartakiad last month, and in other competitions and midterm exams, so G.I. June also wanted to personally ask the guy how he was doing at school. Jin Hyuk briefly replied that everyone gets along well with each other at school except for the moment with the older ones whom the guy beat with a wad of money. While Song was still looking at President Hong after those words about life, Kwon Young asked his friend if he would stay overnight, but he said that he didn't want to bother him with his presence, so he would eat and leave. Han Yu immediately told her friend that he would not be a burden and asked him to stay overnight since it was quite late and the road was not short. G.I. June knew that they would try to persuade him to stay, so he pretended to be uncomfortable but agreed to take advantage of the hospitality. Eugene grabbed a full bottle of soy sauce, but her mother took it from the baby, telling her that this was not allowed yet, and her father ran off somewhere. Hyuk noticed that the chairman was really enjoying spending time at their home, and it was obvious since he didn't do this every day and wouldn't miss the opportunity to relax. The men sat down at the table in the living room, and G.I. June asked the guy when the holidays start, to which he heard about the last Sunday in July, and this coincided with the day when the Olympic Games open, which Kwon Young confirmed, adding that they are in Barcelona this year. Jin Hyuk was busy pouring water over his drink and thinking about how much time had already flown by when G.I. June suddenly offered his friend a bet. Kwon Young asked what they were going to argue about, and Chairman Hong, instead of looking at his friend, looked at Jin Hyuk and offered to predict the results of the Olympic Games, and he himself immediately put him in 10th place. Kwon Young noted that this was quite unexpected to hear from a friend, since he usually does not argue about anything. G.I. June remembered how exciting it was to watch Kwon and Hyuk last time and suggested that this time they too should have some fun by gathering the children together and watching the games. The head of the Song family did not quite expect such a turn of events and tried not to react harshly. Kwon Young agreed with his friend, and G.I. June immediately asked Jin Hyuk if he would like to join in the fun, which the guy wasn't particularly sure about, but his dad encouraged his son and decided to clarify what he would bet on. The bastard G.I. June still couldn't calm down, so he offered to bet on Guan's land, but both the owner and his son were unanimously against it. Guan mentally grabbed his friend by the clothes and pulled him around, forcing him to bet money, but in fact he did it all calmly, and then G.I. June explained that betting money was unfair to Jin Hyuk. The guy calmly said that he had about 1,000,000 won, so he could also take part in the bet. Now that Guan was really gossiping around, Song told him about the savings he had saved in a savings account after graduating from high school, and the allowance he received from school, which left his father shocked, and G.I. June joyfully shouted that they were betting 1,000,000 won. Jin Hyuk felt a little uneasy about taking such a risky deal because it seemed like he could ask his mother for money if he lost, but this was already too much even though his mother was the richest in the house. G.I. June wrote down his number 10. Kwon Young chose 6th and Jin Hyuk 8th, and the chairman immediately criticized his friend's choice, but he asked a counter question about where he was confident in number 10. Hong mentioned that last time their country took 4th place, so 10 seemed completely logical to him this time, but Guan considered such a basis to be very flimsy. G.I. June smiled slyly at Hyuk, saying that there was something in everything they did, and the young man had better be prepared to lose his money. Frankly speaking, Jin did not understand his uncle's behavior, but he did not answer anything since it was too early to talk about anything. Hyuk could have been asleep long ago, but thoughts about the evening did not leave him and sleep seemed to pass him by. The guy kept trying to see some kind of clue or evidence that Chairman Hong hadn't just said about one life for no reason. The same could be said about my uncle's zealous desire to place bets, which he hated to do even in regular golf or baduk. Jin Hyuk recalled how the chairman responded to employees' suggestions for entertainment, and it didn't seem like someone who wanted to place bets himself. The poor guy was spinning from side to side, but even with his eyes closed, he kept thinking that given the overall ranking of the Olympic Games, betting is not so easy. Remembering G.I. June's look at dinner, Hyuk didn't understand how he had so confidently named the 10th place and said something about life while looking at the guy, and whether this could all mean that the chairman seemed to know the future. Hyuk couldn't stop yawning even when he was in class and needed to concentrate on his studies because for the first time the night was lousy. Vice President Choi Kyu-hong asked the headman if he was really that sleep-deprived, and the boy confirmed it. Jin mentally told himself that he couldn't sleep all night, wondering if Chairman Hong was a time traveler, and meanwhile Sun Dong-hyun called the vice president. Yu Hong asked the student why his name was given, but he didn't know and said that it was simply passed on through him, but Jin Hyuk was wary of the name Song Dong. The guy probably woke up only because of this sudden appearance, trying to figure out if this was the same Sun Dong. Yoon Sung Dong was one of the key figures from Hyuk's past life, but he was associated not with good memories. Looking at how the vice president walked towards the guy who was standing at the door, Song begged all the higher powers that this was not the same person who controlled others like puppets. Yoon Sung Dong's father was the head of a gang that even teachers were afraid to mess with, and the scoundrel was eventually arrested for cruelty. The question of why the student called Yu Hong to go out with him remained open for Jin, and it was too early to draw conclusions based only on past knowledge. But unfortunately, when Song asked Yu-hong to tell him directly what the student wanted from him, he found out that he was given money for free, and when he saw how much he was shocked. A large sum of money was handed over to the young man under the pretext that they were friends who could do this without any problems, and Jin only confirmed his thoughts about the criminal. Jin Hyuk grabbed his friend by the shoulders, which really scared him, and began asking if Song Dong had given him the money personally, but Yu-hong said that it was a student named Park Yong-suk. Yu-hong felt awkward and concluded from the class president's reaction that the money clearly needed to be returned, since the amount was not small. The vice president's expression changed when he heard the headman address him and saw his gaze. Sun was filled with anger about what was happening within the school walls, so he asked his friend to tell him what class Park Yong-suk was from. As soon as Jin Hyuk found out where he was going, he took the money and immediately ran to return what was not just a large sum, but a scam involving loans to school children. The scheme Hyuk remembered was that delinquent students would form gangs and give money to their classmates and younger students under the guise of a friendly gift without any strings attached. It was hard to forget how the elders beat and mocked those who trusted them and fell for it. The problem with such friendly gifts was that the bandits demanded interest payments, and if the students couldn't, they resorted to violence. Sun burst into the classroom loudly asking everyone who was Park Yong-suk, and behind him was a frightened vice president. It turned out that Yun-suk was the class president, and when he saw the same first year who had knocked out the guy from the wrestling team, he froze in horror. The poor guy didn't know what to do with himself and stuttered as he asked Jin what the hell he was doing there if nothing had happened. Hyuk came close and slammed the table, leaving a wad of money on it, which attracted the students' attention even more. Jin warned that he was not going to play with the guy because he knew that he was a petty extortionist of money from school children. The unfortunate man grew paler and paler, drenched in sweat and stammering that there was some kind of misunderstanding here. Jin directly asked if it was Song Dong's idea to give the student money, to which Park Yong-suk swore that the elder had nothing to do with it. Calmly but sternly, Hyuk explained that he was sure that Yoon Sung-dong was involved in the whole scheme and asked him to take the money back. Sun took the young man by the shoulder, and he was ready to cry and lose consciousness, but Jin would not cross the line of what was permitted, understanding that he was communicating only with a pawn. While Park Yong-suk begged him not to do anything to him and swore that he had nothing to do with it, Jin Hyuk leaned over and warned that if he heard the guy giving away money as a friend or talking about some kind of percentage again, trouble would be inevitable. The dream made it clear that he would not simply leave such behavior within the school walls, even if he had to confront the main bully directly. The poor guy got a lot of flack from the scoundrels, and they also told him that he was a small-time asshole who was afraid not of the boss but of some brat. The guy had to tell the first-year students' full name so that they wouldn't make things worse for him, and the leader was outraged that someone was more afraid of him. The bully beat and yelled at the student that the brat Hyuk was as small and pathetic as young Suk, but at the same time he was following the first year's orders, and after the leader started to go too far with corporal punishment, the henchman told him to go easy on the younger one. Holding his side, the poor guy shouted that Hyuk knew about the whole scheme and about Song Dong, but the leader didn't care about the infamous criminal. Suddenly, the rest of the gang members waved their hands from behind, indicating that the youngest had had enough. The scoundrels asked the younger one to tell them how everything happened and what Jin Hyuk said, but preferably honestly. Meanwhile, a crowd of people was crowding at the school gates wanting to talk to son Jin Hyuk, and the security was barely holding back the crowd. One of the men shouted that he had once graduated from school and would like to visit the teachers and see what the classrooms looked like. Teachers watched the pandemonium from the school windows, not knowing what to do with those rabid fans or who they were. Teacher Lee approached the principal and asked if they should at least convince the student to try communicating with people, but he heard that the boy had already said no. The man mentioned that such a crowd of people at the gates is not the first or only case since the sports festival, and now all those coaches dream of recruiting only one son, Jin Hyuk. The teacher grimaced after hearing from the principal that their job is to protect the students, so they just need to wait out the onslaught. The director also found it difficult to understand how the situation was developing, and that he would most likely have to listen to the guards' complaints later. Lee sat down opposite and asked if the recent human rights audit was the reason for all the fuss, as the curator and coach of the wrestling team were fired for bribery and beating students. The teacher flippantly told the principal that he was too picky about allowing several visitors onto the school grounds to interact with a successful student. Lee quickly shut up when he heard the director's argument about how the costs of equipment, uniforms, food, and everything else are covered, and this also applies to the track and field team. The teacher felt very awkward, and the director continued to put him in his place by mentioning the status of their school as a small rural state institution that is not rolling in money. In order to finally bring the teacher down to earth, the director handed him a folder of papers that contained what would not allow him to go against son Jin Hyuk's will. While Lee was looking at the papers and his eyes were getting wider, the headmaster mentioned that they could barely get help from the students' parents, so it was hard to even support the work of the sports team. The teacher was stunned when he saw the numbers on the paper, and heard from the director that the school was sponsored by Jin Hyuk's parents. Lee clarified that Hyuk wasn't even on the sports team and asked why his parents were still helping, to which the director couldn't answer because he didn't know, but at the same time it was confirmed on paper that all expenses for the wrestling team were covered. I was speechless when the director told me that Mr. Song had covered the cost of the new training equipment. A moment of discussion came, and the director, moving closer to his colleague, said that although this was a rumor, they say that Mr. Song owns more than 10% of the land in Taeyong County, and their family is regularly visited by the head of the county. On top of that, during the last local elections, candidates lined up to see Jin Hyuk's father, and when Lee said that it was just rumors, the principal still explained that this information should not reach the student. The director warned the teacher that if everything he found out somehow got to Hyuk, his father would immediately stop funding him, and Lee said that it would be like a grave, and he himself thought about how much he needed to love his child. While the director was hiding the papers, Lee looked out the window and thought that he also had a chance to talk to the young man. The crowd of fans finally dispersed, and only the most desperate remained, whom security had not let in anyway. Lee thought that as a teacher he could turn everything to his advantage and talk to the coaches waiting at the gate and then talk to the boy. The teacher was already imagining how Hyuk joined their running team and his parents started giving him even more money. Meanwhile, Jin Hyuk was on the school grounds, and although the weather was good, he did not stop sneezing. Knowing some superstitions, the guy looked around wondering if any of the students were discussing him while his friends were training on the playground. Yum Byung-taek, barely moving, admitted that he shouldn't have told Jin that he wanted to improve his running time, and Cho Solchan confirmed that although his friend was glad to meet them at the same school, which was mutual, such training was too much. Sun noticed that the guys had slowed down and, like a stern coach, asked what this stop in the middle of training was all about. The guys were horrified at how strict their friend could be, and they didn't have the strength to continue even though Hyuk said that it wasn't the end yet. Solchan broke loose and ran away, shouting at Byung-taek to run away too, and Jin Hyuk only shouted after them that they were brats and could do more than they thought. Solchan didn't get very far from a sprinter like Jin Hyuk, who broke records in the competition. Sun sat down on his friend, who was actually happy to lie on the ground rather than do anything, and he also complained to his coach that the lessons were too intense. Jin Hyuk had to distract himself from the lazy guys and turn to where he was called from, but he wasn't waiting for anyone else to come to training. An older-looking guy was walking towards the boys, asking Jin if he was a first-year student and if he would be willing to talk. The dream was looking at a person whom he had neither seen in his past life nor knew from his current one, which made it difficult to be prepared for the turns of events. The older one with a surprisingly large smile walked towards the young man, and it was difficult to say whether he really wanted to talk or was going to get into a more serious matter given the recent incidents at school that Hyuk had gotten involved in.